not suitable for work. In 2004, Marvel Comics brought Frank Castle, the Punisher, into their adult-only imprint, Max, and everything exploded. The series was worked upon by a plethora of legendary storytellers like Garth Ennis, Jason Aaron, Greg Hurwitz, Duane Swierczynski, and Victor Gischler, and artists like Luis LaRosa, Leandro Fernandez, Dougie Braithwaite, Goran Parlo, and many more. In today's video, we're going to delve into the complete lore of PunisherMAX, and I promise you, the video will be laden with blood, gore, and politics. There'll be guts flying and guns blazing. Viewers' discretion is highly recommended. Before we begin, we have a small request. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channel. It's a small click from you, but it means a lot to us. Thank you. Let's begin. Act 0. The Punisher, born. The devil in details. Private Steve Goodwin counted down the days. Just 39 left until he could leave Firebase Valley Forge in Vietnam and head home. He'd convinced himself that he'd make it out alive and start a fulfilling life back in America, far from the chaos of war. He thought he was different from his commanding officer, Captain Frank Castle, whom he viewed as a combat junkie. Goodwin was determined to leave Vietnam behind forever. Yet he admitted that it was Castle's endless dedication to his men that had kept him safe so far. Not a single soldier had died under Castle's command in the past 6 months. Castle's background was a murky sea of rumors, hinting at special forces training and covert missions filled with horrors beyond imagination. During a mission, the platoon, following Castle's orders, took hidden positions. They ambushed a Viet Cong supply run, wiping it out completely. In the aftermath, Goodwin reflected on his future, resolving never to burden his future sons with tales of these dark times. Back at the base, Castle reported to Colonel Ottman, expressing his fears about an impending North Vietnamese offensive. Ottman, showing little interest, passed the buck by assigning Castle to give the incoming General Patton a tour, feigning illness to avoid the duty himself. When General Patton arrived, he unleashed a torrent of criticism, pointing out the neglected bunkers, filthy artillery, rampant drug use, and the soldiers' blatant lack of respect for their superiors. When Patton demanded to know why these issues remained unaddressed, Castle explained that the last officer who tried to impose discipline was Frag. Patton dismissed this as a myth and pressed for a real answer. Castle bluntly stated that the base was undermanned and poorly equipped, leading the soldiers to believe that if the generals didn't care, why should they? Patton decided to recommend closing the base, but Castle questioned who would monitor the enemy in Cambodia if they did. Patton dismissed his concerns, declaring the war effectively over. Before Patton could leave, Castle took him to a ridge. Concealing a sniper warning sign, he instructed Patton to walk to the edge. Oblivious, Patton complied and was promptly shot dead by a sniper. Getting fragged was no myth. Later, Castle sat by a bunker, hearing a voice. It praised him for ensuring that his war continued but warned that its end was inevitable. The voice offered him a chance to keep the sense of purpose alive forever, hinting at a dark and ominous deal yet to be revealed. Castles in blood. In the shadows of Firebase Valley Forge, Private Angel was on the brink of a dark decision. Huddled in the bunker with Marine Coltrane, the local drug dealer, he was ready to shoot heroin. Just as he prepared the needle, Private Goodwin burst in and stopped him. He needed Angel clean, Goodwin urged, gripping Angel's arm. Outside, Coltrane and his right-hand man Garcia watched with anger. They weren't about to let Angel leave without paying for the heroin. But as they stepped forward, they froze. Captain Castle stood in the distance, his gaze a silent warning. Reluctantly, Coltrane and Garcia backed off. The platoon, 29 Marines strong, set out on patrol, hoping to utilize their strength. As they moved through the jungle, a sniper's bullet struck Private Tedrow in the throat. The corpsman rushed to help, only to be shot down. Panic spread as they realized there were at least 4 snipers. In the bloody chaos, Captain Castle remained calm. He took the .60 from Private McDonald and, despite taking a bullet to his arm, eliminated the snipers. The aftermath was grim. 6 Marines were lost. While confirming the kills, Private McDonald found a surviving female soldier. As the others crowded around, his immediate reaction was to sexually assault her. Private Goodwin was horrified. Captain Castle then shot the woman in the head, declaring, "No rape, we're here to kill the enemy, that's all." Goodwin, overwhelmed, hid behind a tree. From there, he saw McDonald wash the woman's brains off in a creek, only for Captain Castle to silently drown him and kick his body into the water. Back at base, Castle confronted Goodwin, asking why he kept quiet. Goodwin admitted he was scared and asked why Castle did it. Castle explained he wanted to punish him, and if he'd saved the girl, well, no one would have trusted him. The girl's fate was already sealed. Castle walked away, telling Goodwin he didn't have to be afraid. But Goodwin knew he still was. Third day's the charm. Standing alongside Private Angel, Private Goodwin found himself immersed in reflections on the war's brutality. Contemplating the ruthless tactics deployed in Vietnam, he speculated on their deterrent effect, pondering why the United States maintained global engagements when it appeared self-sufficient. Overhead, The thundering presence of American jets prompted his musings on the nation's strategic choices. Elsewhere on the base, Captain Frank Castle strolled alongside his superior, Colonel Ottman. Observing the low-flying jets, Castle raised concerns about the impending storm's impact on their air support. Ottman swiftly dismissed these apprehensions, citing artillery reserves. Castle persisted, highlighting the deficiencies in their artillery's range and maintenance, pressing for urgent resupply. However, Ottman remained resolute in his belief that the war neared its end. In a moment of solitude, as Ottman ventured to the latrine, Castle grappled with thoughts of fragging him, but ultimately refrained. A mysterious voice intruded, probing Castle's motivations and tempting him with promises of power and authority. Encountering Private Goodwin, Castle shared anxieties about his family's safety, subtly alluding to impending trouble. Observing Angel's departure for Coltrane's bunker, Castle dispatched Goodwin to retrieve him, all while fighting with the inner voice's unsettling provocations. Goodwin's intervention, knocking out Coltrane and safely guiding Angel, culminated in a rainy dawn argument on America's future and identity. Abruptly, the tranquility shattered as explosions heralded a Vietnamese assault. Amidst the chaos, Captain Castle's composed demeanor emerged, and he issued tactical commands and asked for the 60. The Devil's Hour. Goodwin thought about the great beast that went loose into the world of men. It was unleashed by men, with the purpose of subduing the enemy. But even after it was done, it didn't go back to sleep. It had to be fed. It was the devil. And that day at Valley Forge, Goodwin was certain that it was their turn to feed the beast. The battered soldiers braced against the relentless Viet Cong onslaught. Amid the chaos, a soldier dashed to Captain Frank Castle with grim news. Their efforts to contact the superiors had failed, but they briefly connected with an armored division to the east, which was now cut off. Despite the escalating crisis, Colonel Ottman stubbornly refused to allow radio use, clinging to his mantra of "don't rock the boat." With tensions mounting, Castle, in a desperate move, ordered the soldier to shoot Ottman. As the enemy breached their defenses, Castle made the call to retreat to the command post, directing artillery fire to cover their withdrawal. In the frantic scramble, Angel was shot down, leaving Private Goodwin reeling in shock. Just then, Coltrane, consumed by vengeance, seized Goodwin and tried to slice him with a straight razor. But Castle intervened. He struck Coltrane with a shovel and killed him. With the command post overrun and their comrades fallen, Castle and Goodwin fled together, narrowly escaping death's fiery grasp as napalm rained down. Castle screamed at Goodwin to pop smoke or else they'd be seen and napalmed. Just as Goodwin popped the smoke bomb, a Viet Cong soldier ran out of the fire, burning, and killed Goodwin with his bayonet. In his final moments, Goodwin dreamt of his happy flight home. Castle was left alone now. He didn't tire and kept pushing. Right then, the sinister voice inside him spoke and demanded that he made a decision. He was already shot thrice. His gun was about to give out. In order to live, Castle had to admit that he loved returning to this land of killing again and again. The voice told Castle that it was because Castle loved to kill. Killing, blood, massacre, death. All of these were a part of Castle's soul, and they could be his for the rest of his life. He just had to choose, yes or no. The voice told him that if Castle chose no, then he'd just be another soldier killed in action. But if he chose yes, well, he had to pay a small price. But after that, Frank would always get to do what he loved. The voice kept screaming in his head to say yes, and he did. He screamed yes as he mowed through the soldiers using the butt of his gun and his bare fists. Yes! Days later, helicopters arrived, rescuing Castle from the battlefield. The rescue officers couldn't believe their eyes. The man standing in front of them wasn't human anymore. Reunited with his family, Castle tried to push the horrors of war aside, but the voice, relentless in its hold, reminded him of the pact he'd struck. It was the voice of the devil, and it reminded him of the price Castle had to pay. The voice pointed at his family. The voice left after that, assuring Castle that he'd forget the conversation, and they would never talk again, and they would keep bringing death together, for they were in the same line of business. Castle embraced his family and told them to hold on tight. Act 1. In the beginning, enter the Punisher. It was the summer of 1976, a sunny afternoon in Central Park. The Castle family had laid out a blanket, filled it with picnic delights, and settled down to enjoy a day in the sun. But joy turned to horror in an instant when a mafia hit erupted around them. Bullets meant for a mafia don struck his daughter, the 9-year-old Lisa, his wife, the 28-year-old Maria Elizabeth, ending their lives in a flash. 5-year-old Frank David Jr. was caught in the return fire in his mouth from the Don soldiers. In the chaos and bloodshed, only Frank Castle, the husband and father, survived. His heart shattered. He vowed to bring sanity back to a world gone mad. Every night, in order to punish the guilty, he went out heavily armed and killed the sinners as the one and only Punisher. Fast forward to the current time in a car park near a cemetery. 2 agents, Roth and O'Brien, observed Castle's annual pilgrimage to his family's grave. Roth, anxious and uncertain, wondered aloud how they could possibly take down such a dangerous figure. O'Brien reminded him that Fat Boy had given direct orders to just recon and not to engage. That night, the local mafia family threw a grand celebration for Don Massimo Cesari's 100th birthday. Representatives from crime families across the nation gathered, leaving the event suspiciously unguarded. Castle walked into the party through the front door. He declared that he was there to kill Massimo, and then blew his brains out. Panic ensued and the gangsters ran through the front door chasing Castle, but he unleashed hellfire on them using his automatic chain gun. He mowed down everyone in his path, and those who tried to flank him met a grisly end stepping on hidden landmines he'd planted. Meanwhile, in a luxury penthouse, a group of individuals including Roth and O'Brien watched the massacre unfold via a NASA satellite feed. Among them was Bethel, who appeared to be in charge. Shaken by the violence they'd witnessed, Roth questioned how Fatboy could ever hope to stop Castle. Bethel stepped into another room where the one referred to as Fatboy waited. The rotund man dismissed the need for the video setup, confident in his ability to handle Frank Castle. He claimed he would deal with him soon, as Castle was the only friend he had left in the world. Not for the faint of heart. A mass funeral took place where Cesare and everyone who was killed were buried. Cesare's family was arguing fiercely about their next move, when their heated debate was cut short when an SUV exploded, hit by a bazooka fired by Castle himself. Castle had hit the funeral and did a massacre. His strategy was clear. Once you get the enemy on the ropes, you keep him there. You hit him however you can and bleed him dry. In a nearby penthouse, a group watched the news in stunned silence. Tension escalated as Roth and Fatboy began to argue. Roth accused Fatboy of being scared of his old friend and wasting precious time. In a sudden aggressive move, Fatboy grabbed Roth by the testicles and set the record straight. He wasn't as soft as he appeared. His name was Microchip, not Fatboy, and he'd worked with Frank Castle for a decade, helping him become the lethal force he was. Yeah, he was scared after witnessing the massacre Castle had orchestrated. With that, he ordered Bethel to ready their squad for a strike that night. Meanwhile, Castle spoke with Nadine, a prostitute. She mentioned that the streets were unusually quiet, with mafia higher-ups either dead or too scared to appear. Castle noticed a young girl nearby and asked about her age and where she was from. He then killed her pimp, handed his money clip to Nadine, and instructed her to send the girl home and warned the new pimp to watch himself. Elsewhere, mobster Larry Barucci met with Nicky Cavella and his soldiers Ink and Pitsy in a restaurant. Larry explained that Castle's rampage had left a power vacuum in the local family, with only one man, Big Jackie, ranking higher than Soldier, and he was in the hospital, with no one else to turn to. Larry sought help from Nicky, who had been exiled from New York for 15 years due to his ruthless methods. Nicky agreed to help with the Punisher problem, but made it clear he had no intention of leaving the city again once the job was done. That night, Castle prepared to go hunting lowlifes. In the shadows, Microchip, Roth, O'Brien, and Bethel watched as he stepped onto the street. Microchip warned the others not to deploy their men if things went wrong. They should send reinforcements only if things went right. Saying that, he jumped out of the van and called out to Castle. Castle turned and hesitated for a split second before reaching for his Uzi. Microchip raised his shotgun and fired, hitting Castle in the chest. As Castle fell, reaching for his Uzi, Microchip shot him in the hand, then fired a third shot, seemingly killing him. War strategies. Larry Barucci visited Big Jackie, the Cesare family's last remaining capo, in the hospital. He informed Jackie that he'd brought Nicky Cavella to town to handle their Castle problem. Enraged, Jackie ordered Larry to send Nicky and his crew away. After Larry left, Nicky's henchmen, Ink and Pitsy, entered and killed Jackie. In the hospital hallway, Nicky watched a news broadcast reporting that the Punisher had been captured by police. Eyewitness Walter Krause claimed he saw Castle being placed into a van by someone dressed as SWAT. Skeptical, Nicky instructed Larry to contact his police sources to verify the news. In a dark room of a penthouse, Castle was chained to a chair. Microchip explained that he had to take down Castle using 7 stun rounds when one should have sufficed. Outside the room, O'Brien listened to the conversation, while Bethel watched the same news report Nicky saw. Bethel ordered Roth to convince Krause to stop talking to the press. Microchip told Castle they needed to talk and that he must show quick results, laying out photos of Castle's family in front of him. Larry's police contact confirmed that they hadn't picked up Castle. Instead, the group holding him claimed to be acting under Homeland Security. Meanwhile, Microchip discussed his history with Castle, explaining he joined Castle because his own son was murdered, but he eventually walked away, realizing the cycle of crime would never end. He accused Castle of killing because he liked it, having developed a taste for it in Vietnam when a darkness reached out to him, and he embraced it. Castle told Microchip to put away the photos of his family, threatening to force him to kill him if he didn't. O'Brien, listening in, became rattled and poured herself a drink. Roth visited Krause in Sheepshead Bay, but before he could talk to him, Nicky, Ink, and Pitsy dragged him away. They decided to extract information from Roth, threatening to cut his balls off and put him in a paper cup if he didn't cooperate. O'Brien warned Bethel they were making a mistake with Castle, pointing out that zoo tigers can never really be tamed. Bethel sent her to check on Roth, who hadn't checked in, and she warned him that Castle was not to be screwed with. In the dark room, Microchip told Castle he didn't believe he was insane, which is why he thought Castle would listen to the deal he was offering, a deal that would allow Castle to leave the Punisher behind forever. Friends and foes, Micro offered Castle a new mission: to stop targeting local criminals and instead go after high-profile terrorists like Osama bin Laden. With the full backing of the US government, Castle remained silent. In Sheepshead Bay, Larry Barucci had to pull over the car he was driving with Nikki Cavella, Ink, and Pitsy. He was nauseous after witnessing what was done to Roth. Micro explained to Castle that Bethel and his team were CIA operatives in charge of assassinations, but they lacked the funding and legal clearance to recruit standard operatives. If Castle agreed to join them, a press release would declare he committed suicide in custody, and Micro would be his sole contact. He'd even be given a quartermaster. Castle declined the offer to Micro's face. Following the information from Roth, Cavella and his men arrived at the Hotel Claude. Nikki instructed Ink to sabotage the service elevator. They were there to assassinate Castle. Castle told Micro he refused to work for the people who ran the world because eventually they'd let him down and betray him. He wasn't willing to fight just so others could profit. O'Brien arrived at Walter Krause's apartment and showed him a picture of Roth. As Krause described how the mobsters had taken Roth away, Roth staggered up the hall, bleeding and holding a paper cup. They'd actually cut his testicles and put them in the cup. O'Brien called Bethel, who told her to get rid of Roth and return to the penthouse. He then ordered Alpha Team in the basement to move. Ink, hearing the soldiers loading into the elevator, managed to sabotage it, sending it 47 floors down and killing the team. Castle recounted a story about Bob Garrett, a neighbor who visited after the massacre and revealed he'd left his wife for someone else. Castle, enraged by Garrett's indifference, compared their situations. He told Garrett to run. When Garrett didn't react, Castle brutally assaulted him. Micro wondered why Castle had shared this story. Castle, in turn, kept asking Micro where Bethel's funding came from. Simultaneously, the mobsters knocked on the penthouse door, with Pitsy shooting the woman who answered. Despite the explosions, Castle demanded to know the source of the funding. Nikki shot Bethel in the knees, and Pitsy kicked open the door, pointing a shotgun at Micro. Aim, lock, fire. Cavella didn't waste time. He entered and shot Micro twice in the chest. Then he pointed his gun at Castle's head and pulled the trigger. With unbelievable speed, Castle dodged it and at the same time bit Cavella's fingers off. Just then, O'Brien also entered with an Uzi in her hands. She started shooting blindly and shot Ink in the chest and Pitsy in the arm. While Cavella was busy shooting at O'Brien, Micro gave Castle the keys to his chains. Ink, bleeding, carried a grenade towards O'Brien, but he was shot and the grenade fell from his hands. In this window, Cavella shot O'Brien. Also, the grenade went off. Barring the blast, Pitsy entered Castle's room, but he was already free. He lifted Cavella and thrust his head into Pitsy's face. Both Pitsy and Castle unleashed themselves upon each other like animals. Micro, injured, shot through Castle and incapacitated Pitsy. However, Cavella, Larry, and Pitsy escaped when Castle was picking up Micro. The paramedics were already on the way. While Castle left with Micro, O'Brien caught sight of him and was sexually aroused while lying bleeding on the floor. Castle drove to a safe house with the wounded Micro. He told Micro that he needed the information on Bethel's funding. Meanwhile, the paramedics arrived and tended to Bethel and O'Brien. O'Brien warned Bethel about Castle again, but Bethel was in denial and ordered to track Micro's cell phone to get Castle's latest location. Meanwhile, at the warehouse, Micro confided in Castle that Bethel had no finance to pull off this job. Bethel was attached to a Grey Fox team in Afghanistan, hunting terrorists, where he made a deal to smuggle heroin in the bodies of the dead GIs. He gathered men as well as Micro for his job. Micro got in touch with Castle with the hope of redeeming him. Castle listened to all this and called Bethel from Micro's phone. He called up Nikki Cavella and said that he'll give him a location where he would be waiting for him. Then Castle reminded Micro of Garrett's story and reminded him how he told Garrett to run. He said the same thing to Micro. Run. Micro had joined the enemy and he was about to be punished. Micro reminded Castle that he was going into a war with the CIA, but Castle was ready to punish him, to punish them all. All's well that bleeds well. The end was here. Castle stood on the roof of Micro's warehouse, eyes sharp and rifle ready. Inside, Micro was loading up guns, preparing for the storm of mafia gangs who were headed their way. 3 cars had already been turned into flaming wrecks by Castle, their passengers dead. But Cavella wasn't backing down. He turned to Larry and barked out the order to send in the next 2 cars. Above, a helicopter hovered. Bethel peered down, taking in the scene. He ordered the local cops to set up a perimeter and hold it tight. Down below, Pitts crawled out of the trunk of one of the ruined cars. Quiet as a shadow, he slipped into the warehouse. The blade in his hand glinted just before he plunged it into Micro's stomach. From the roof, Castle called out for Micro. He didn't get an answer. Instinct kicked in. He started firing down through the roof, bullets raining like deadly hail. Pitts fired back, forcing him to retreat. Castle's foot slipped and he crashed through a skylight, landing hard in front of Pitts. A brutal fight broke out. Pitts aimed his shotgun, blowing apart one of Castle's ribs. Castle fought back with everything he had, both men taking and giving punishment. Bethel's helicopter roared overhead, flying low over Cavella and Larry. Hearing the shotgun blasts inside, Cavella and Barucci began moving toward the warehouse. Bethel ordered the soldiers to fire, but they refused, not having the clearance. Furious, Bethel took the controls himself and started firing wildly at the warehouse. Inside, Castle and Pitts continued their savage bare-knuckle fight. Pitts grabbed a shard of broken glass. He He lunged at Castle, slashing his arm and face. Castle blocked it with his palm, letting the glass pierce through and break off. Fueled by pain and rage, he scooped Pitts up and charged towards a window. With a mighty heave, he threw Pitts out of the window, impaling him on the spear-topped fence below. Without pause, Castle jumped out after him, landing on Pitts' chest and driving the fence deeper into his body. Inside the helicopter, a command came through the soldiers' headsets. Green 7. They didn't hesitate. They threw Bethel from the helicopter, citing Homeland Security as they did. Castle pushed through the pain and made his way back into the warehouse. Micro was bleeding out, but there was no time to help him. Castle turned his focus to the Mafia men at the entrance, firing and making each one of his bullets count. Cavella pointed a gun at Larry and told him to run towards Castle. Castle shot Larry as he advanced and then pointed his shotgun at Cavella. But just then, Pitts appeared again, somehow still alive, the fence post jutting through him, half his face gone. Castle didn't hesitate. One final shot, and he blew Pitts' face off. Cavella scrambled to a police car at the perimeter. He shot one officer and forced the other to drive him away. As Castle walked past Bethel's crumpled body, Bethel offered him a job one last time. In his catatonic, mumbling state, Castle refused. Back in the warehouse, he found Micro, barely holding on. Micro suggested a different perspective on their shared story, pondering if Castle ever had a choice. He wondered aloud if Castle hesitated, but Castle dismissed it, saying it had been 8 years since they'd seen each other, and only Micro had a gun in his hand. Saying this, he pointed his shotgun at Micro's head and blew his brains out. Act 2. Kitchen Irish. Scums of same feather. Castle walked through Hell's Kitchen. Dissatisfied about its name change to Clinton after the neighborhood was cleaned up, he headed to the Kerry Castle bar for a meal. Just as he started eating, a massive explosion rocked the diner. By some miracle, he survived, though he was knocked out for a bit. When he came to, he saw that most of the other diners weren't as lucky. He watched a waitress die before springing into action to help a boy who was still breathing. Paramedics arrived quickly, taking over the rescue work, treating the injured and even stitching up the Punisher's wounds before letting him go. Cops at the scene quickly blamed the explosion on the IRA, figuring it out from the type of bomb used. Meanwhile, Peter Cooley was talking with his uncle, the faceless Finn Cooley, and Michael Morrison about the bombing. Morrison complained that if the bomb had gone off as planned, they'd have wiped out all their enemies at once, maybe even McGinty. Finn wasn't convinced McGinty would have been stupid enough to show up. He was also angry about the wireless detonator failing because of interference. Peter asked if their enemies, the River Rats, McGinty, and the Westies, would figure out who set the bomb. Finn said it didn't matter because they were never going to make peace anyway. When Peter asked more about McGinty, Finn brushed him off and sent him inside. Once alone, Finn and Michael talked about their plans for Nesbitt's millions. Back at Carey's, Castle kept an eye on Tommy Toner, leader of the new Westies. He planned to grab Tommy and find out what he knew about the bombing. But before he could move, a van pulled up and some guys snatched Tommy off the street. In a park, Napa French watched his grandson Billy play. A black man with an Irish accent sat next to him, asking about his past work chopping up bodies for Nesbitt. French yelled that he's been retired for 30 years, but the man said Nesbitt was dead. He pointed to a van across the park where Billy was being held at gunpoint. For his grandson's sake, French agreed to do whatever was asked. The man introduced himself as McGinty, the worst man ever out of Dublin town, and asked if French had ever chopped up a living person. Histories of violence. Yorkie Mitchell and his young partner Andy Lorimer were sitting at a diner near the exploded Kerry Castle bar when Castle walked in and met them. Meanwhile, Napa French was pleading with McGinty not to make him cut up a living person. He said it was hard enough when they were dead, speaking in code so his grandson Billy wouldn't understand. Eventually, French agreed, but only if Billy was kept away from the violence. After Billy was taken away, French was introduced to a tied-up Tommy Toner. French had to start his torture with Tommy's left hand. On the Hudson River, the River Rats sabotaged a yacht with 3 small boats. They boarded, guns and knives ready, and took the pilot hostage. They announced who they were and headed below deck, telling the people on board they'd been watching them go on trips every weekend. They robbed the yacht's occupants of their valuables and left, understanding the cops would now be watching the waters. They decided to take a pause and look into a current matter. In the diner, Mitchell said that he was on MI6 business, without US government approval, looking for Finn Cooley, the actual bomber. He explained Cooley's background, including a bomb that disfigured him. He connected Finn to Michael Morrison, who ran guns and narcotics for the Russian mob. Finn was now part of the Continuity Irish Republican Army, using Morrison as an American fundraiser. Mitchell was in America to stop Finn. Since the US government wouldn't sanction an assassination, he called in Castle for help. On the river, Danny celebrated the River Rat's latest score. Polly told her to calm down, but Eamon told Polly to relax. When another member suggested Polly was jealous of Eamon and Danny's relationship, Eamon pushed him out of the boat, saying Polly was his sister and had no reason to be jealous. Back at the diner, Mitchell told Castle that Lorimer wasn't officially part of the operation, but was there as a favor to his father. Lorimer showed Castle a picture of Peter Cooley, explaining that Cooley had shot his father in Ireland. Castle understood the need for revenge and told Mitchell to make sure this was a one-off as he left. Meanwhile, McGinty called a delivery company to schedule a package pickup for same-day delivery. After complaining about the price, his thugs called him cheap. McGinty reacted violently, saying the Westies knew him and the point was to scare them when they opened packages containing parts of Tommy Toner's body. At O'Malley's bar, Finn, Peter Cooley and Michael Morrison sat in a booth, discussing the Irish Americans and the IRA. Finn mentioned being irritated by the entire fiasco, which Peter questioned. The discussion was interrupted by a bar patron raising a toast to Finn. As people raised their glasses, Castle walked in with a shotgun, telling anyone who didn't want to die for Ireland to leave through the back. Chaos all over. Outside O'Malley's bar, people poured out through the back for their lives. Yorkie Mitchell and Andy Lorimer kept watch from behind nearby trash cans. Indoors, Castle clutched his shotgun, aiming it at Peter, Finn Cooley, and Michael Morrison. Yet, before he could initiate his interrogation, the entrance erupted with the arrival of the river rats, diverting his focus. Without even flinching, Castle ended Danny with a lethal shot to the head. Subsequently, Morrison and the Cooleys fled, exchanging gunfire with the advancing river rats. Reacting swiftly, Mitchell and Lorimer unleashed a barrage at the fleeing Cooley and Morrison, injuring Peter and driving them back into the bar's interior. Inside, they stumbled upon a captive. They used him as a human shield to escape, abandoning Peter in the process. Following Polly's lead, the river rats commenced their retreat, sustaining casualties from a grenade launched by the Punisher. As they regrouped near the docks, Polly astutely inferred Finn Cooley's presence implied he was there for Old Man Nesbitt's alleged wealth. Swiftly, she rallied reinforcements from her extended kin to bolster the river rat ranks in pursuit of the elusive fortune. Within the Punisher's lair, Mitchell informed the bound Peter Cooley of his full awareness of his identity and misdeeds. Despite Cooley's steadfast silence, Mitchell underscored the imminent threat posed by the Punisher and Lorimer's unresolved vendetta linked to his father's demise. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Finn obscured his scarred visage with tape as he conferred with Morrison regarding the recent skirmish. Disgruntled by Finn's wavering allegiance, Morrison contemplated abandoning their enterprise, inciting Finn's vehement outrage over the perceived betrayal of his nephew. Back at the Punisher's lair, Peter adamantly refused to betray Finn Cooley, despite Mitchell's derisive taunts. As Castle prepared to extract vital information, Mitchell and Lorimer departed, leaving Lorimer grappling with moral quandaries over leaving Cooley to the Castle's torment. Elsewhere, the Westies delivered a cryptic package to Brenda Toner, containing her husband Tommy's severed hand. Suspecting McGinty's involvement, she swiftly mobilized her allies to pursue Nesbitt's elusive fortune. In another district, McGinty prepared another parcel while Napa French questioned the extent of his actions. Unmoved, McGinty departed, casting a lingering gaze at French's grandson, who lay bound and asleep nearby. Within the confines of the Punisher's lair, Peter Cooley succumbed to pressure, divulging critical details about the $10 million fund. Castle threatened Peter further to spill more secrets, lest he wanted to go through more torture. Dark secrets. In the Punisher's lair, Peter Cooley anxiously recounted details about Nesbitt, the former Westie ruler of Hell's Kitchen. He shared how Nesbitt had many nicknames for people and was universally loathed yet unchallenged. Peter detailed his uncle Finn Cooley's vague partnership with Nesbitt before his accident and mentioned Tommy Toner, who idolized Nesbitt and maintained the Westie name in his honor. He also speculated that Nesbitt might be the great uncle of Polly and Damon, now leaders of the River Rats. Peter knew little about McGinty. After Nesbitt died a year ago, Finn received a letter from a lawyer about a share in Nesbitt's will. Finn, the River Rats, Tommy Toner, and McGinty each received part of a code leading to $10 million. Nesbitt wanted Hell's Kitchen restored as his legacy. Finn decided to bomb Kerry Castle to get the full coded message after Toner invited him to a meeting. Mitchell, Lorimer, and Castle discussed Peter's story in another room. Castle believed Peter was truthful but doubted Nesbitt's sudden change of heart before his death. At the Pot of Gold bar, Brenda Toner and the Westies inspected packages containing her husband Tommy's body parts. Brenda, now in charge, declared they wouldn't be intimidated by McGinty, urging them to work together for a significant payday or face seeing each other's faces forever. Lorimer wondered why the gangs hadn't called a truce for the $10 million. Castle dismissed this due to their lifelong hatred and planned to follow them until they converged in a suitable spot for a firefight. McGinty called the Pot of Gold, offering to trade Tommy alive for their part of the code. Brenda agreed to meet at the USS Intrepid but intended to retrieve McGinty's part of the code, but not her husband. Cooley and Morrison watched the Pot of Gold from a car, nursing wounds, and decided to follow the Westies when they left. Eamon of the River Rats got a tip about the Westies' departure from bartender Paddy Feeney. Elsewhere, Napa French sat with the mutilated Tommy Toner. McGinty entered, agreeing that Tommy was a fighter, then brought in French's grandson Billy, who fled in tears. French called McGinty a monster, but McGinty declared French the true monster for his recent actions. On the USS Intrepid, Mitchell and Lorimer positioned themselves with a machine gun. As the Westies spread out, Castle opened fire from a Huey helicopter. Mitchell explained that he was targeting leaders first. Cooley and Morrison arrived by car, hesitant to board while the River Rats arrived by boat. McGinty and his crew, hidden atop the Huey, got ready to ambush Castle. guns, and bazookas. The massive gunfight at the USS Intrepid was being reported by an NYPD chopper. The crew spotted Castle firing at Westie gang members from a parked helicopter and called for tactical support. Mitchell reminded Castle that he and Andy needed to leave. Castle instructed them to take off, promising to meet them on the water. Upon noticing the police, Cooley and Morrison decided to wait in the car. McGinty's crew, hiding atop the helicopter, moved towards Castle, but one fell through a ceiling panel. Castle turned and fired, hitting everyone except McGinty, who escaped by diving off. The remaining Westies continued shooting, prompting Castle to use a grenade for cover as he escaped. Jerry assisted the injured Brenda Toner, and they discovered Tommy's severed head. He panicked, and just then, McGinty struck him in the head with a machete, instantly killing him. Brenda fired a concealed pistol at McGinty, but he escaped via zip line. The river rats, observing the chaos from a boat below, decided to leave. Bunk spotted the Punisher leaving and aimed, revealing their position to Lorimer, who fired at them. As their inflatable boat began sinking, an injured Bunk urged Polly and Damon to jump to another boat while he acted as a decoy. Polly, lying about her love for Bunk, watched him die at Mitchell's hands. Brenda attempted to escape down McGinty's zip line, but fell. Climbing to shore, she encountered Cooley, who offered her a ride. McGinty returned home, only to be ambushed and knocked out by Napper French, who dragged him into a room filled with knives. At his lair, Castle and Mitchell explained to Lorimer that they pressured the gangs into considering a truce, making them easy targets. Mitchell then brought a sandwich to Peter Cooley, and they exchanged insults about their fighting styles. At the Pot of Gold, Cooley treated Brenda's wounds and suggested they collaborate due to their dwindling numbers. She agreed, but only as a one-off. As night fell, Eamon reminisced about Polly crossing a frozen Hudson River in their childhood. Polly, dismissed from the new River Rats, told Eamon to focus on their fight against McGinty. Mitchell and Peter had a long discussion. Mitchell accused Cooley of wanting Nesbitt's money and advised Peter to make peace with God, warning that Andy would kill him once Finn Cooley was dead. McGinty awoke, shackled to a bed, with Napper French sharpening knives above him. Meanwhile, Mitchell had a drink with Andy as Castle prepared for war. Apocalypse Now. Napper French, standing naked above the restrained McGinty, explained the proper setup for a Houdini, including the use of specific knives and plastic sheeting on the walls. Soon after French severed the fingers on McGinty's left hand, a group of thugs burst in and shot French with a shotgun. After gathering himself, McGinty decided to ice his fingers and head straight for Nesbitt's money. Finn Cooley, Brenda Toner, and McGinty meet up at the Pot of Gold's bar. Cooley was the one to keep the cool between Brenda and McGinty. The River Rats joined too. They all discussed about how Old Man Nesbitt used to torture them when they were younger, and how he made everyone's life a hell. Realizing that none of the gangs needed to fear Nesbitt from the grave, they pooled their codes and pinpointed a location on the map. With the site revealed, tensions rose, and all four reached for their guns. At that moment, Michael Morrison, desperate to prevent further violence, smashed a bottle on the bar and shouted at them. He reminded everyone that they were on the verge of peace and freedom from their past, urging them not to regress into old conflicts. The gangs decided to go for the money together and share it amongst themselves. Castle, Mitchell, and Andy kept watch from outside and followed them to the secret location. It was an abandoned old freighter. All of the gang members went inside as McGinty's boys kept watch. Castle and Mitchell stealthily followed them, but they were spotted through a hole in the freighter wall. Inside, everyone became combat ready because they knew Castle was ready to kill them all. Castle and Mitchell sliced the throats of the guards outside and threw a stun grenade through the hatch. The grenade blinded Brenda and Eamon, and Brenda started shooting. Some of her bullets hit Eamon, while Andy fired from outside to keep Mitchell from harm's way. Castle was climbing down when Cooley threw a hand grenade at him. The blast injured Castle badly, and Cooley found the window to attack him. In a desperate bid to get free, Castle bit off Cooley's face. Meanwhile, Polly took Eamon's bullets and left him for dead. While Mitchell helped Castle out, Cooley and the others went to the location of Nesbitt's money. They came upon a box and opened it, only to find that it was a booby-trapped box having a bomb with a 3-second timer. As Mitchell and Castle escaped, the freighter was blown to pieces, killing everyone inside. The next day unfolded with Andy extracting Peter Cooley from the trunk of a car. Holding a pistol to Cooley's side, Andy guided him into a small building. Inside, Cooley pleaded for a moment to pray, but Andy callously dismissed his request. Meanwhile, in the car, Castle declared he didn't need a ride back. Stepping out, he warned Mitchell not to show up anytime soon. Andy returned, handing the gun to Mitchell. Expressing his unchanged demeanor, Andy told Mitchell that he didn't feel any different. Mitchell asked him back, did he think Castle felt any different after 30 long years? Act 3. Mother Russia. Oh mother, where have you been? In a Russian bar, Frank Castle sat alongside Alexander Baranovich Formichenko, who drowned his thoughts in vodka, reminiscing about Russia's past glory. Formichenko lamented the country's descent into a caricature of itself, epitomized by Leon Rastovich's impending release from prison, branding him as the face of Russian gangsters. As tension brewed, the bartender clashed with Formichenko over his outspokenness, culminating in Formichenko's stormy exit. Just after that, Castle banged the bartender's head on the counter and said that Formichenko was pretending undetected. Outside, 3 men accosted Formichenko, only to face Castle's wrath at gunpoint. Castle got Restovich's location. He was at his mother's home. Having done what he came for, he killed all 3 of them. Meanwhile, aboard a plane, Nick Fury, unfazed by the smoke-free policy, disregarded protocol as he puffed away. Fury's nonchalance contrasted with the gravity of the classified file revealing Castle's recruitment by the CIA, a plan Fury now aimed to hijack. Under the cloak of night, Castle descended upon Restovich's mother's abode. A swift shotgun blast sealed Restovich's fate, but it still aroused the ire of armed locals, prompting a lethal showdown. Inside, Castle shot Restovich's mother, triggering chaos as armed men converged on the scene. In the mayhem, Castle set the house ablaze by turning on the gas. He shot all the burning thugs who jumped outside to save themselves from the fire. He confronted Fury upon his exit. Their rendezvous led them to a restaurant, where Fury relinquished access to vital government databases. Fury, representing a clandestine faction within the military, outlined his plan to Castle. It was one job, in and out for him. If Castle failed, no one would take any responsibility. In Riyadh, William Rawlins sought an exit strategy, while military leaders debated the unfolding mission orchestrated by Fury and Castle. War songs. Castle embarked on a mission to apprehend a dangerous biological weapon in Sudak. Meanwhile, high above Siberia, Castle and his companion Martin Van Him quietly prepared for a clandestine jump from a passenger jet flying between Anchorage and Moscow. Flashes of his meeting with Nick Fury came to his mind. Nick Fury had briefed Castle on the assignment involving a mysterious virus wreaking havoc in Russia. He'd shown Castle a video of how the virus had reduced Chechen rebels into bones in real time. Landing on the spot, Castle and Van Him leaped from the aircraft, hurtling toward the Gory Bedanga mountains in northern Siberia. Fury had briefed him about Evgeny Stenkov, the scientist who grew the flesh-eating virus, Barbarossa. During his attempt to escape, Stenkov had injected the virus into Galina, his daughter, and was killed during interrogation. Stenkov also injected Galina with an antidote, which would kill the virus inside her in 48 hours. Castle's objective was to get Galina from a missile silo in Laptev and go to the Laptev Sea to meet the SEAL team. Meanwhile, Fury navigated diplomatic tensions with military brass, justifying his decision to divulge classified information to Castle. In Sudak, Castle and Van Him assumed cover in a local bar, awaiting their target. Their plan to draw out the enemy involved a staged bar fight, culminating in a violent fistfight with Russian soldiers. They took the dresses and IDs of 2 guards. Their infiltration of a nuclear missile base proved surprisingly smooth, as they exploited security loopholes to gain access. Inside the facility, they eliminated guards without hesitation, swiftly advancing toward their objective. As Castle and Van Him descended into the belly of the base, their mission teetered on the edge of success or catastrophe. Meanwhile, in Riyadh, William Rawlins shed his traditional attire, assuming a guise of authority as he departed for Newark, his intentions unclear. Mission impossible. Castle, relentless and determined, moved stealthily through the missile silo, leaving a trail of dead soldiers in his wake as he hunted for Galina Stenkov. Bursting into a room, he killed a woman who had just entered before stepping inside to find Galina. He got in and told Galina not to be afraid. In a different part of the base, the generals kept a close eye on the unfolding mission. Meanwhile, in Russia, Galina recounted her suffering to Castle, describing how her father and others had cruelly jabbed her with needles and drawn her blood. Castle reassured her with a cold promise: anyone who would hurt her would face his wrath. With Galina in his arms, Castle made his way to rendezvous with Van Him. They headed toward the exit via an elevator, only to encounter a tank waiting outside. Without hesitation, Castle and Van Him opened fire, dodging the tank's machine gun before quickly retreating downstairs. Elsewhere in Russia, Major Grigory Yeremin of the Russian Armed Forces was engrossed in a newspaper, chatting with Colonel Semyon Lugansky about the ongoing attempts to extract a virus from Galina's blood. Their discussion was interrupted by General Nikolai Zakharov and his Mongolian subordinate. Zakharov brought up an American helicopter that had evaded destruction the previous night, a failure that angered him. Yeremin then mentioned a brawl involving guards at a nuclear silo, prompting Zakharov to order him and Lugansky to locate the fight survivors. The briefing was cut short when a soldier reported a firefight at the silo. Back at the base, Van Him scoured terminals for an escape route while Castle raided the armory, stocking up on weapons and an RPG. Outside, Russian soldiers surrounded the entrance. Castle met them head-on, unleashing the RPG and mowing down soldiers before seizing the tank's machine gun and decimating the enemy forces. As more soldiers arrived, Castle infiltrated the tank, rigged it with explosives, and narrowly escaped before it exploded, sending a soldier's mangled body crashing into Major Yeremin's truck. In a war room, Zakharov grilled his officers about the bar fight in Sudak, much to Yeremin's irritation. Meanwhile, Nick Fury, lounging in bed with 3 women, made a call to a general, instructing him to keep NORAD out of their operation before drifting back to sleep. "Kill 'em all, Frankie." Russian soldiers swarmed the base, climbing down to the lower levels. As they descended, they triggered explosives that had been planted in advance by Castle, resulting in a deadly blast. In a nearby room, Castle and Vanhim stood with Galina, their conversation interrupted by the sound of explosions. Galina asked Castle if she could go to the room with the refrigerator to get some ice cream, but he insisted she stay put while he fetched it for her. Stepping into the hallway, Castle encountered a gruesome scene: the dismembered corpses of Russian soldiers, their blood spattered on the walls and floors. In another part of the base, Colonel Lugansky, General Zakharov, Major Yeremin, and other officers discussed the infiltration. Zakharov mentioned that the Mongolian would join the next assault on Castle. Meanwhile, 2 men hijacked a plane en route to Moscow, killing anyone who resisted. Back at the base, Castle continued his endless assault, shooting down more Russian soldiers attempting to rappel into the base. Outside the elevator shaft leading to the lower levels, a captain ordered more men to descend, but Castle gunned them down as well. At the general's headquarters, Nick Fury arrived to address complaints about Castle's killing spree at the silo. He assured them that the Russians wouldn't be able to trace Castle and Vanhim back to them and would assume they were merely mercenaries. At the silo, Vanhim searched for an exit when Zakharov's Mongolian associate arrived and attacked, knocking him to the ground as Galina watched in terror. The generals monitored a plane filled with people posing as jihadists heading towards Moscow. Castle spotted the Mongolian, who had subdued Vanhim and seized Galina. A fierce fight ensued between Castle and the Mongolian, but Castle was eventually knocked unconscious. Zakharov, noticing the elapsed time, assumed the Mongolian had completed his task and ordered Lugansky to send in his men to capture the intruders. As chaos continued to unfold, the intertwined fates of Castle, Galina, and Vanhim swayed on the edge, with each move bringing them closer to a deadly confrontation. The base, now a battlefield, echoed with the cries of the wounded and the endless roar of combat. I saw the devil. Russian soldiers continued to storm the silo as Lugansky and Yeremin received news of a Saudi airliner being shot down, allegedly by Al-Qaeda. However, they quickly deduced that it was actually Americans posing as the terrorist group. This was done by Rawlins to keep the Russia business out of the media. Meanwhile, back at the silo, Castle had been knocked to the floor by a fierce Mongolian who was trying to capture Galina. This moment triggered painful memories of Castle's failure to save his daughter, spurring him to his feet. Fueled by rage, Castle beat the Mongolian to death. The generals were watching the action unfold on a screen when Nick Fury entered the room. In the US, Fury confronted the generals about the downed Saudi airliner, accusing them and physically attacked one of them. At the missile base, Castle handed Galina a gun and steeled himself to confront the remaining soldiers storming the silo. Meanwhile, Vanhim was preparing to inject Galina with a syringe. Castle stopped Vanhim from injecting Galina. Vanhim claimed he was under orders to inject Galina with a stabilizer to stop the antidote from destroying the virus. Then he had to draw her blood out and kill her and leave. He said that Fury was unaware of this secondary protocol. Unmoved, Castle handed a bunch of go codes to Vanhim. He told them to point the 30 SS-18 missiles to major cities in Russia and then get the nukes ready for launch. Simultaneously, Zakharov and Lugansky were contemplating launching nuclear weapons at the United States. Suddenly, Zakharov, Lugansky, and Yeremin received a message from Castle and Vanhim. They demanded safe passage from the silo in the Gory-Beranga Mountains, threatening to burn Russia and its people from off the face of the earth if their demands were not met. The stakes had never been higher, and the intertwined fates of Castle, Galina, and Vanhim hung in the balance. Elsewhere, Fury faced the generals for enabling Rawlins to bring down the plane. Everything was about to go down to hell. Endgame. The fueling was complete. All the warheads were active. While Fury was taking flack from the US generals about the stunt that Castle just pulled, Castle carried Galina and told her to hang tight and left with Vanhim. Zakharov, Lugansky, and others were counting down on their time left. They still contemplated on whether to give in to Castle's demands. But just then, the launch sequence started and final ignition completed, and a nuclear missile was fired at Moscow. Zakharov still didn't give in to Castle's demands and ordered Moscow to take no actions as he believed that the Americans wouldn't bring forth a nuclear war. Lugansky shouted and condemned Zakharov's adamant behavior and took up the phone himself to give an order, but Zakharov shot and killed him. Just then, the unthinkable happened. The ignition of the warhead turned off. It was just a hunk of metal in the sky. The hatch of the missile opened up, and Castle, Galina, and Vanhim jumped out with parachutes and landed in the midst of a snowfall. Zakharov was right all along. He gave orders for a pursuit. He realized that it was no Arab terrorist who had attacked them. It was the devil himself, a Russian who was born on the soil of the US. Meanwhile, Vanhim told Castle that he'd lost his backpack. There was only one backpack. Castle took out 2 twigs and asked Vanhim to draw. Castle won. He took Galina and the backpack and the cold gear and left for the rendezvous point while Vanhim was left behind in the cold. Later, Castle returned with Galina and landed in the US. There, Fury learned that during the silverfish extraction, Castle didn't let any doctor come near Galina and retrieve retrieve her blood. He guarded it the whole way from Alaska. As a result, the entire operation to extract Barbarossa was a complete failure and waste of time and resources. The general ordered his soldiers to escort Fury out and chain Castle. He wanted to get the residuals of the virus from Galena's blood. Castle stood in front of Galena, ready to take on anyone who approached her, and Fury stood in front of Castle, telling the soldiers that they could start any time they liked. The soldiers backed off, afraid. Castle was leaving, and Galena started crying. She wanted Castle to look after her, always. Castle told her that he was incapable of taking care of anyone. He reminded her not to play with guns while he left. The generals bury every detail about Barbarossa. Russia kept the missile silo event under wraps. Castle returned to the bar where he found Formichenko drinking. He was happy to find the old man relieved that there was still hope for Russia. Act 4, up is down and black is white, stirring up the dead. Nicky Cavella had returned, and he knew just how to rattle the cage of the Punisher. He went to the graveyard where Castle's family was buried and desecrated their grave, filming it while it was done. Meanwhile, O'Brien fought a group of female inmates in the penitentiary where she was locked up due to the stunt with Bethel. She stood her ground and warned the inmates that she'd seen scary, and they were not scary at all. Meanwhile, Rawlins met up and had an argument with the generals about his life getting screwed due to his latest stunt of crashing the flight. In the other part of the city, Castle was back to business as usual. He'd sabotaged the meeting of Horace Spoony Moore and Big Joe McCluskey and killed all the gang members one by one in a bloody shootout. It was homeboys, Nazis, a biker joint and a coke business, an all-you-can-eat buffet for Castle. While the gang members were shooting with their pistols bent sideways, they missed most of their shots. That gave Castle the window to take them all out. He told the last gang member that the sight was kept on the top of the gun for a reason, and then blew his brains out. In the other part of the city, Cavella continued his groundwork. He gathered the rest of the 5 surviving mafia capos and told them that there was no point in rebuilding with the Punisher out there. He introduced Teresa, Pitsy's sister, an equally feral specimen like his brother. He asked the bosses to loan him soldiers, and he would bring down Castle. The price was simple. They had to declare him as the boss. Cavella, smiling easily, told them that he got in the way of Castle and got out. That meant he knew what to do. He told the bosses to think over the plan and watch the 6 o'clock news. At the penitentiary, O'Brien was stabbed and she discovered that there was a breakout in progress. In the evening, the 6 o'clock news featured Cavella's video, where he dug out the skeletons of Castle's family and urinated on them. Castle watched it from a bar in silence. There was a storm coming. Incoming. Nicky Cavella smiled while remembering how his father cursed him when he killed his mother and sister. He remembered as he laughingly blew his father's brains out. Teresa broke his happy trance and informed him that the capos were discussing about him by listening from outside. Cavella got back to his daydream when he accused his Uncle Jimmy of the murders and got him killed. It was all a plan that was etched by his Auntie Mo in order to get Nicky a chair in the mafioso. Cavella remembered how Auntie Mo used to force him into sexual encounters and gift him people to torture kill on his birthdays. Just then, Picardi got out. He'd voted against Cavella. He then walked to the washroom, but Teresa stabbed and killed him and disposed of his body. Teresa returned and Cavella went out for some air. Outside, Cavella reminisced about how he ruthlessly killed Auntie Mo while having sex with her. During his rise to power, every one of the capos warned him not to assassinate the mob boss, Kai the Chinaman. However, Cavella, being he, got out of line and attacked Kai head-on, killing Kai's 3 sons and feeding one of them to him. Later, he had to go into hiding to avoid the war that he'd started. Cavella smiled as he remembered everything. The remaining capos wanted to talk to him, but Cavella made them wait while he raised a finger to everyone he'd killed and was going to kill. Run down. Getting her chance, O'Brien broke out of prison and came straight to Roth, tracking his address. She wanted to get out of town before the government sent out their company men to take her out. But then she saw a newspaper where the defiling of the Castle grave was mentioned. That night, Castle geared up in the search for Cavella. He attacked a strip club in search of Kaganovich. He went in, stabbing and shooting, and ordered the strippers to run. Then he mowed down all the gangsters with his machine gun. O'Brien watched Cavella's video while Roth tried to get her a new identity. But then he found out that O'Brien's ex-husband Rawlins was in town. O'Brien asked if Roth had a gun. As the detectives cleared up the massacre at the strip club, they found only one man alive. He said that the Punisher had left him alive with a message to be delivered. They had to bury his family. The news burst out with the news of the 3rd attack of the Punisher. His body count had reached 68. The police had kept the Castle family remains as evidence, but they now rethinked about burying them again as they were scared witless of the Punisher. As they watched the news, Cavella told Tony that Castle was still following his methodical way, even while causing massacres. But they would see him soon. And just then, Rawlins entered Cavella's hideout. He'd returned to town, and he wanted his will done. And at the other end of the city, Castle had hit another criminal joint. He took out his automatic gun and mowed through every gang member of the hood, while repeating to himself, "It's just a dream." Mass massacres. Two thugs tried to break into a restricted area to pull off a theft, and one of them reminded the other about their chances of meeting the Punisher. The other thug responded that the Punisher always targeted the bigger fish and had no interest in lowlies like them. The other one asked, "What if it isn't true anymore?" They ran away, scared. Elsewhere, Castle was having a shut-eye while running a recon in his vehicle. He dreamt of a New York City where he'd killed everyone, streets running red with blood. Someone called him amidst the deadly silence. It was his wife and kids. They whispered to him that they were still dead. Castle's eyes opened as the nightmare faded. He was ready, bleeding but ready. Inside Cavella's base, Rawlins demanded that he wanted in on the Punisher. Cavella had to set him up, and Rawlins would take him out. Cavella gave in to Rawlins' demand when Rawlins sexually forced himself on Cavella. Meanwhile, O'Brien and Roth kept watch from outside. O'Brien told Roth about the time when Rawlins pushed her out of the helicopter to save his drugs, which resulted in her abduction by Mujahideen. O'Brien looked through the binoculars and was surprised when she saw how many people Cavella had gathered to take out Castle. Meanwhile, the mayor warned the police that if the Punisher wasn't taken down, it was going to look bad for all of them, with the body count rising. They planned to do a press conference. At Cavella's base, Rawlins had already imposed himself on Cavella, who couldn't do or say anything in his presence, and submitted. In the evening, the press conference took place, where the mayor's decision was declared: the Castle family will be reburied with respect. Knowing that it was a suicide mission, Castle marched to Tony Pizzo's place to kill Cavella and everyone. Rawlins waited to take him out with a sniper gun, but O'Brien interfered. She shot Cavella from above. The gunfight started below. O'Brien prayed for Castle to run. Die another day. Teresa shot Castle with a sawn-off 12-gauge double barrel, and he went down. He was in his senses but could barely breathe and was soaked in blood. The only thing saving him was O'Brien from above, who was shooting at the mafioso to keep them away from Castle. Finding a window, O'Brien jumped down. She took Rawlins and dumped him into the car trunk. She ordered Roth to drive the car in front of Castle. Teresa ordered the mafioso to shoot down Castle while she took Cavella to the hospital. Castle climbed up into Roth's car and they drove off. In the car, she introduced herself and Roth to Castle. Meanwhile, Cavella gathered himself up. The bullet was stopped by the vest he was wearing. They followed O'Brien's car and kept watch outside her apartment and waited for Tony's men. Inside, O'Brien wasn't successful in getting answers from Rawlins, so she left him to Castle. Castle came to know everything from Rawlins: how he was in the military and he'd arranged the flight crash a year back. Roth advised to get Rawlins on tape and left, while O'Brien saw Castle's bullet wound. Outside in the car, Teresa made a sexual advance at Cavella and he pushed her aside, calling her a fat pig. Teresa was scarred emotionally. Embarrassed, Cavella requested her to stay put while he contacted Tony and brought his army back to kill Castle. He ordered Teresa not to go inside before he was back. But as Castle and O'Brien were sleeping after a stress-relieving sexual encounter, Teresa entered the room with a blade, ready to kill both of them. Curtain. Teresa jumped and stabbed Castle in the shoulder. O'Brien came to her senses and jumped on her, but she shoved and broke O'Brien's nose. O'Brien tried to take out her pistol to shoot, but Teresa hit her again. She was going to claw O'Brien's eyes out. Roth entered with a gun, but just caught one side of the feral Teresa and ran away from there. O'Brien found a window and bit Teresa's nose off. Unfazed, Teresa shoved her aside and focused her attack on Castle. She would have inserted her fingers inside Castle's eyes if O'Brien hadn't emptied her entire clip in her head. Bloodied and covered in Teresa's brains, both Castle and O'Brien tried to gather on what had just happened. Elsewhere, Cavella tried to convince Tony and the rest of the surviving capos to help him finish off Castle, but to his surprise, they denied. Cavella tried to scare them into cooperation, but they didn't budge. They said that even if they wanted to help, they had no men left, as the Punisher had killed them all. Frustrated, Cavella left. At the apartment, O'Brien, Castle, and Roth managed to record Rawlins' confessions on the Russian event on tape. She wanted to record his previous history too that would get her off the Pentagon's list. She warned Roth that even in his injured state, Rawlins was lethal. Castle and O'Brien got out to get the recorded message copied into a DVD. There were children playing outside, and in the street, Cavella had parked his car with the minimal idea that Teresa was dead. O'Brien and Castle went after him, but instead of running, Cavella took a kid and held his gun to his head. Castle talked to Cavella calmly. He said Cavella wouldn't kill the kid as he was a coward. His reputation of being a psycho was just a reputation. He wouldn't stand in the line of fire. Castle further said that if Cavella killed the kid, he would die badly, and if not, then he might let him go off easy. Cavella, being the coward he always was, relinquished the gun. O'Brien and Castle went into the apartment and discovered that Rawlins had killed Roth and escaped. Castle told O'Brien to get out of town and never come back. Castle took Cavella to the woods. In the end, Cavella showed his true self. He pleaded and cried and went hysterical and requested Castle not to kill him. Castle had already found his own resolve. The smoke of revenge had cleared from his mind. He knew his family was in a better place. He shot Cavella low in the stomach, leaving him to die from an infection, slowly, in pain. After that, Castle left. In his mind, he headed home. Act 5. The Slavers. Castle had set up his sniper rifle on a roof to kill the coke dealer Anthony Pavler and his gang. It should have been a simple job. However, on that stormy evening, he saw a girl shooting at Pavla below and then running for her life towards a dead-end alley as the gang members followed her. Castle took out some of the gang members from up top, but not all of them. Meanwhile, officers Russ Parker and Marcy Miller were working their shift when gunshots were reported over the comm. They started their car and rushed toward the location. In the dead-end alley, the girl had nowhere to run. Pavla's thugs closed in on her. However, Castle walked up behind them. As they turned, Castle shot all of them except for one. He let him pray to his God, and just before the line of forgiveness, he shot and killed him. Castle understood from the girl's accent that she was from Moldova, an illegal immigrant. He told her to run as the police were coming. However, she asked for his help, the Punisher's help. She screamed that Pavla's men and others murdered her baby. That got Castle's attention. Officers Russ and Marcy arrived and turned their guns on Castle and told him to turn slowly. Castle lifted Russ with his gun and threw him at Marcy, and then left coldly with the girl. Vera Constantin and Christu Bulat discussed the recent happenings. Christu said that they were businessmen and not warlords, so it'd be better to stay out of the Punisher's way. He won't be happy to learn that their business was sex and human trafficking. However, he also wanted the Punisher out of the scene, so he connected with his rat, Detective Stu Weston, and told him to keep the Punisher busy. Meanwhile, Castle brought the girl to his base. She'd passed out and was catatonic about losing her daughter, Anna. Castle caught a faint idea of what was going on. At the police station, Weston met Captain Tommy Price and gave him a proposal to do a press conference to proclaim zero tolerance on the Punisher. He wanted Price to hound the Punisher and kill him, and that would give Price a career hike. Even being a fan of the Punisher, Price contemplated the proposal. At Castle's base, the girl told Castle that her name was Viorica. She told Castle her whole story about the old man, Christu, and Vera, and her daughter. When she was done, Castle had already made up his mind to kill a lot of people. Backgrounds. Viorica told Castle her story. When she was 15, she was taken forcefully and held in an apartment at Chisinau. There, she was constantly raped and beaten by men and then sent to work. During that time, she became pregnant, and all she ever wanted was to save her baby. Then came the old man from America, who chose and took girls as he pleased. Saying that, Viorica broke down. She had to take a pause. Meanwhile, the old man, Tiberiu Bulat, was wiping off his rival gangs. He loved to play it dirty. He got hold of an African-American gang member, got him tied to a chair, brutally shoved his fingers into his eyes, and broke his neck. Then he took an Uzi and shot down the rest of the gang members. Christu watched everything, disappointed, thinking about killing his mad father. Viorica continued her story. Tiberiu brought her to America, where she had her baby, Anna. She was allowed to be with her baby outside her hours as a sex worker. The business was run by Christu, and Vera governed the girls, and Viorica worked at Pavla's club. However, Viorica planned meticulously and ran away with Anna with the help of a social worker. One day, Viorica and the social worker kept Anna with the social worker's boyfriend and went out. Upon returning, they found Anna gone. A few days later, the social worker got an email with the picture of Anna's dead body. Meanwhile, at a press conference, Price and Weston presented Russ and Marcy as injured victims from Punisher's assault. Later, Castle put Viorica into a motel and went to Pavla's club and killed everyone who had a gun. But he managed to get the location of Vera's brothel. He picked up 2 customers from that brothel and held them at gunpoint. Castle wanted to go back with them and use them to enter the brothel. However, to his bad luck, police arrived at the spot. Castle barely made it out. A police officer named Ernie Mosto followed him and fell down at Castle's feet. He thought Castle would beat him, but he left. With his only lead gone, Castle looked for others. The other way. Castle killed and maimed pimps all over, just to get a lead on Vera and Christu's new hideout. He'd concocted a plan B in his mind. In his apartment, Tiberiu and Christu watched the news about how Officer Mosto was assaulted by the Punisher. Tiberiu decided to take on the Punisher himself, as Christu didn't have the balls to do it. Frustrated, Christu ordered Vera to go ahead and kill his father. At a local bar, Russ and Marcy met Ernie and learned that Winston had set him up as a victim, again to blame the Punisher. Marcy tried to coerce Ernie to tell the truth to everyone, but Ernie denied. At the police station, Captain Price told Winston that he was under pressure and needed to see results. Right then, Ernie called up Winston to rat about Russ and Marcy. At the motel, Castle met Viorica and found out that the social worker's name was Jen Cook. He met Jen at one of her speeches and asked her for some info. At the police station locker room, Russ and Marcy were provoked and attacked by 7 other police officers and were beaten to a pulp. This was done under the orders of Winston. Jen gave Castle a file which mentioned a place upstate. That was where VIP clients went for private parties. From her files, Castle learned how Romanians Tiberiu and Christu had razed 24 villages and killed 1,800 people in a matter of 2 years. The women they didn't kill, they took as slaves for trafficking, and then they moved out west. While Castle planned on how to break the hardest of brutes, Jen cried over her actions. strategic warfare. To put his plans forward, Castle started off with a book on human anatomy from the library. Vera had tipped off the location of Tiberiu to the African-American gang whose leader Tiberiu had killed. As they set foot on his porch, Tiberiu, a warhound, got a whiff of the danger. He ambushed them and killed all of them by shooting them in the head. One he shot in the leg and tortured him and got out the information on the tipper. In a bar, Russ and Marcy sat and discussed, all bandaged up. There was no news of the locker room brawl. It was mentioned that they fell off the stairs, both of them. They decided that they needed to do something about it. Deducting info from Jen's file, Castle located the VIP destination. He reflected on the innocent people who would be there, mixed up with the scum. He chalked out a new strategy that was highly unlikely of the Punisher. Meanwhile, Tiberiu had called Vera to let her know he was all right and he would be out of the house. Vera immediately called Christou and gave him the news. Tiberiu knew who had given the tip-off for the hit. Christou cancelled all the customers that day and brought heavy security to his house. Castle waited outside, hid from all of them. During the evening, he sneaked into the kitchen and drugged the food, enough to make all of them unconscious. During the dinner, everyone fainted after eating the food. Those who didn't met Castle's shotgun. He went up to a room where he found 4 captive girls, all unconscious. He cleaned them up and called Jen to bring her car. Jen came and Castle carefully loaded up the car. She told him that she was going to take the girls up to a shelter nearby. After that, their exit was Castle's duty. Castle carried Christou into the woods. Jen drove the girls to her house. There, she met Russ and Marcy, waiting for her. In the woods, Castle woke up Christou and told him to give every detail of his business. Christou, a hardened criminal, said that he won't. Then Castle opened his blindfold, and Christou saw that Castle had taken his intestines and hung it up over the trees. Christou could still live, but he had to give whatever Castle wanted. Gathering. Christou bled out at dawn. Castle was about to leave with all the information he had when Tiberiu arrived with his men. He yelled Christou's name, and he was pissed. Armed with minimal firepower, he hid under a pier. However, given his nature, he couldn't hold back. He took a shot at Tiberiu and his men, killed a few too, but they were hardened soldiers. They fought back with might and injured Castle. Castle barely fled with his life. He then connected with Jen. On the other side of the phone, Russ and Marcy coerced Jen into fixing an appointment with Castle. When the call was over, Russ told Jen to get the girls to safety. Meanwhile, Tiberiu visited Vera. He couldn't completely prove that Vera was guilty. That's why he let her live. He stationed 2 of his men there in case Christou visited him. Castle later met Jen, Russ, and Marcy at the diner. They shared their not-so-happy story and everything was revealed to everyone. Westin worked for the Bullets. He got Ernie to tail Jen as she'd been a witness to Castle's previous murders. That was how Russ and Marcy got her name. From there, they went straight for Castle. Russ agreed to turn a blind eye on whatever Castle had planned for the Bullets next. But they had one condition. No police should be killed. And Westin was theirs. Castle agreed. Vera called Westin and told him to hurry up on the search for Christou. But right then, Castle appeared, killing all of Tiberiu's men. Castle kept throwing her on the shatterproof glass wall of a building. She was all bloodied up. Castle wanted to know about Tiberiu. He also reminded her what Christou told him. Back when Vera and Christou started, Vera always advised to sexually assault the girls without mercy, an action which would break them and make them submissive. Saying that he was stronger and that made him capable of doing whatever he pleased, Castle reminded Vera how the world worked. He then threw her with the glass from the apartment floor. Castle's mind cleared up. He realized that he was full of hate, and that would help him on what was going to unfold. Fighting the wolves. It was fight night. Castle went to the motel and assured Viorica that it will all be over soon. Russ and Marcy had a heated discussion on what they were doing assisting a mass murderer. However, when Russ told Marcy that she could leave whenever she liked, Marcy stayed back. She was annoyed, but her main priority was to look out for her partner. From Jen's file, Castle had already got the location of the house where Christou had moved the girls after the Brooklyn incident. He kept watch on the house till the henchman called Tiberiu. Tiberiu came out of the car and shouted orders at his men. Castle had already wired 30 pounds of TNT inside the drain cover where the cars were parked. He hit the switch. There was a devastating blast that killed most of Tiberiu's men. Bodies went flying every way. He shot at Tiberiu, but he used one of his henchmen as a shield and climbed upstairs where he kept the girls. Castle went up and entered the room and found that Tiberiu had taken a hostage. Castle played it differently. He threw his gun away and called Tiberiu a coward. Enraged, Tiberiu jumped at him, screaming, but Castle held him by the neck and put his knee into Tiberiu's teeth. With Tiberiu unconscious, Castle gave the girls a number to call. Jen discussed her previous cases with Marcy when the girls called her up and asked for shelter. Castle called Westin to his location. He tied Tiberiu to a chair. He told Westin that he had a file on him, and he would give it back to him He had to do two things. One, he had to deliver a package to Bulat's contacts in Moldova. And two, he had to get visas fixed for the girls who needed out of the business. Then he doused Tiberiu in gasoline, put him on fire, and burned him alive, all the while filming it. Weston witnessed the whole thing, scared witless, shaken to the core. Castle gave the camcorder disc to him. 2 days later, under the watchful eyes of Castle, Weston left for Moldova, and he never came back, seemingly killed by Bulat's team. Castle got back to hitting trafficking rings here and there. Marcy left being a cop and joined Jen on her social crusade. The girls went back to their native places. One of them went back to prostitution. One just gone, 2 were dead, and the other 3 were doing well. Fiorica became a waitress, but whenever she saw a kid, she was reminded of Anna. So some days were okay for her, but some were deep and dark. Act 6. Barracuda. Call for a kill. Castle stood on a boat named the Barracuda, surrounded by an ocean filled with blood, bodies, and severed limbs. But this particular story didn't start here. Earlier, Castle had traced a recent surge of high-grade cocaine to a specific group of dealers. In his typical brutal fashion, he stormed their den and killed them all. After the last dealer fell, he discovered a man, naked and tied up in the bathroom. The terrified man revealed the hiding place of the cocaine and begged Castle for protection, claiming he couldn't go to the police. Despite his pleas, Castle left him behind. Meanwhile, at an office party, Dermot Leary nervously told his boss, Harry Ebbing, that his plans to eliminate company whistleblower Cy Stevens had gone awry. Ebbing scolded him for not informing him as soon as Stevens became a problem. In Ebbing's office, where Harry's wife Alice flirted openly with Leary, Harry revealed that he'd had his coke dealer kidnap Stevens to silence him. However, a district attorney friend had just informed him that Stevens was now in police custody as the lone survivor of one of Castle's massacres. The mention of Castle's name unsettled Ebbing, who emphasized again that Leary should have consulted him first. Now in deeper trouble, he pulled out his Rolodex, determined to fix the situation, and asked which precinct Stevens was in. As Castle ate a hamburger in a restaurant, he saw a news broadcast identifying him as the one responsible for taking down the drug gang. A reporter questioned the local police captain about the anti-Punisher initiative, supposedly launched after Castle dismantled a slaving ring with departmental ties. The captain refused to comment, but Castle hadn't noticed much of a change in police activity. While watching the news, he spotted former mobbed-up Sergeant Billy Licata entering the precinct house. Remembering the naked man's claim that he couldn't talk to the cops and connecting it with Licata's sudden appearance, Castle decided to investigate further. Using a fake ID that identified him as NYPD Lieutenant Joseph D. Carson, Castle infiltrated the police station. There, he found Licata trying to get Stevens out of the holding cell, only to be blocked by the officer on duty who demanded the captain's signature. When the officer refused a bribe, Licata pulled his gun. Acting quickly, Castle set off the fire alarm, knocked Licata out, and demanded the officer swap places with Stevens. To escalate the chaos, Castle threw a white phosphorus grenade into an empty room, making it look like a fire to cover their escape. Later, in his office, Ebbing received a call informing him that Licata had been arrested and Stevens had escaped police custody. Although he believed Licata was paid enough to keep quiet, he was furious that such a valuable asset was wasted due to Dermot's blunder. With Stevens now with Castle, Ebbing had no choice but to call in a heavy hitter to deal with the situation. He picked up the phone and called Barracuda. Enter Barracuda. A sex worker aboard Barracuda's boat ran outside feeling sick from smoking opium. She rushed off the boat to vomit and was bitten by a rattlesnake. Barracuda killed the snake with his bare hands, but seeing the woman lifeless, he kicked her body into the water and piloted away. Meanwhile, Castle urged Stevens to share his story. Stevens revealed that he worked for Dynaco, a booming energy company. He recounted how Harry Ebbing had propelled Dynaco to success by firing most of the staff and forming a tight-knit team with 2 rules. Always stick together and bring any issues to Ebbing first. Within 6 months, the company's stock soared thanks to Ebbing's legal but aggressive accounting practices that projected future profits. When Castle questioned the legality, Stevens hinted at a darker plan in motion. Stevens then connected the dots for the Punisher. Referring to recent power blackouts in Florida, he explained that these blackouts spiked the value of Dynaco stock as power was in high demand. Leary proposed intentionally blacking out parts of Florida to further inflate the stock's value. Stevens had opposed the illegal plan, arguing that real financials would eventually surface. His dissent led to his kidnapping. Elsewhere, Leary and Alice had just had sex in the kitchen, leaving Alice bored and Leary anxious. When she taunted him about his relationship with Harry, he angrily initiated another more passionate round of sex. Back in Miami, Barracuda's convertible cut off an SUV blaring rap music. He opened fire, killing everyone inside except the man he sought, Horace. After extracting money owed for a hit, Barracuda stuffed Horace in his trunk, ready to hunt his next target. Castle left Stevens alone in the New York restaurant when Stevens refused to go to the feds. Castle decided to confront Ebbing. scare him into a confession, and send it to the media to avert a potential body count in Florida. He flew to Florida, planning to buy weapons locally instead of bringing his own, but both these actions were mistakes. Love at first fight. Harry Ebbing, soaring in his private jet, called Barracuda just as he left the airport. Ebbing informed him that the Punisher was on his way to Miami. Castle hopped into a taxi while his mind wandered to how he'd handle Ebbing, unaware that Barracuda was tailing him. Suddenly, Barracuda rammed the taxi off the road, and the unbelted Castle was knocked out cold. On the beach, Leary nervously chatted with Alice Ebbing over the phone. Alice steered the conversation toward their sexual encounter from the previous night. Waking up in darkness, Castle began slicing through his binds with a Swiss Army knife he'd hidden in his coat. As the trunk opened, he kicked his captor, but Barracuda countered with a powerful punch. The two brawled, each gaining the upper hand at times, until Barracuda hurled Castle through a shack wall. Entering after him, Barracuda found Castle armed with a hatchet, which he used to sever 4 fingers from Barracuda's right hand. Back on the beach, Alice seduced Leary by telling him that Harry never had sex with her and that she only married him for money. When she pressed Leary for his true feelings, he admitted he was tired of Harry's mood swings. She then hinted at knowing the combination to Harry's safe. Castle and Barracuda continued their brutal fight. Castle knocked out his teeth. However, Barracuda gained the upper hand, battering Castle with a plank of wood and telling him he had nowhere else to be. In a beachfront penthouse, Ebbing and Leary discussed the upcoming shareholders' meeting. Ebbing planned to announce a top-secret project. When Leary inquired about the Punisher, Cy Stevens entered. He'd informed Ebbing about Castle's arrival. Barracuda had Castle and Horace tied up in his boat, recounting ghastly stories from his past. Barracuda joked about Americans' cowardice, concluding that he ate the enemy because he was Barracuda. He then threw Horace into the water as chum. Seeing his fingers bleeding again, he mentioned they were on ice. Castle sarcastically asked if they were bagged to avoid nerve damage. As Barracuda tossed Castle into the water, he laughed that the joke was on him. Underwater, Castle struggled to keep consciousness despite his injuries, suspecting brain damage. His blood in the water attracted a shark almost immediately. Survivor type. Barracuda hummed as he watched sharks circle Frank Castle and Horace. Castle began to free himself and swam upward. A shark bit off Horace's legs. When Castle surfaced, Barracuda fired a shotgun at him. Diving underwater, Castle saw Horace still alive with one eye and decided to pull him up, which entertained Barracuda. At the penthouse, Leary was stunned that Harry Ebbing had allowed Cy Stevens back into Dynaco. Ebbing argued that the assault by Leary's drug dealer was punishment enough. Stevens cried and apologized, admitting that he should have gone to Ebbing first. Satisfied, Ebbing agreed to arrange a room and clothes for Stevens, which infuriated Leary further. He argued with Ebbing. Leary lost his temper, leading Ebbing to slap him and warn him to watch his tongue. In the water, Castle tried to calm Horace, advising him to stay still as sharks respond to movement. As a shark approached, Castle introduced himself as the Punisher, then shoved Horace's legless body into the shark's mouth and swam away, making it appear to Barracuda that they were both eaten. Stevens and Leary met Ebbing at an outdoor cafe, where Ebbing shared how he met Barracuda. 20 years ago, while in a California prison for insider trading, Ebbing had hired Barracuda for protection. Barracuda had gruesomely dealt with Ebbing's enemies, and they'd stayed in touch ever since. Castle clung to a tire on Barracuda's boat as it headed to shore. Castle, battered and exhausted, dragged himself onto the dock. Spitting up blood and with a stomach full of seawater, he passed out. Leary and Alice had sex in a bathtub. He confided that he didn't know Barracuda's next assignment. They discussed their plans to run away. As they left the bathroom, Barracuda was revealed to be hiding behind the door. Plans. Barracuda, brandishing a machete, burst into the room, threatening Alice and Leary. They said they'd do anything if Barracuda didn't kill them. Meanwhile, Castle regained consciousness at the dock. During their discussion, Alice outlined Dynaco's scheme to black out Florida to manipulate stock prices. She detailed their intention to incriminate Harry by leaking documents in his handwriting, allowing Leary to usurp his position. The plan was to execute this during the shareholders' pleasure cruise that night, coinciding with Harry's grand entrance by helicopter. Castle made his way to Barracuda's shack, resembling his own hideout with its arsenal and equipment. After tending to his wounds, he gathered provisions and discarded Barracuda's severed fingers to the seagulls found in the freezer. At the cafe, Barracuda met Harry, but told only good things about Alice. Harry invited Barracuda aboard the shareholders' pleasure cruise to monitor Alice. The boat's name was Evelyn, and departure time was 4 o'clock. Castle, listening from a nearby table, settled his bill and left. Elsewhere, Cy Stevens stumbled upon Alice and Leary's tryst in a public restroom. Panicked, he attempted to flee and contact Harry, but Alice attacked, leaving scratches on his face. Leary, struggling with his clothing, eventually rose and assaulted Stevens, ultimately strangling him while lamenting how everyone had wronged him. Unsure of their next move, Alice suggested calling Barracuda. Barracuda came and disposed of Stevens' body. Later, aboard the pleasure cruise, Leary delivered an impassioned address to the shareholders, explaining Harry's absence. On deck, Barracuda and Alice discussed Leary's adeptness and Harry's shrewdness in retaining loyal associates. After Barracuda departed, Alice insisted that they needed to eliminate him. Meanwhile, Castle, battered and sore, covertly dove from the Evelyn to Barracuda's boat, prepared to trail him. In his office, Harry decided to speak with the press. With 35 minutes until his helicopter's departure, he opted to meet them to speak for Dinoco. Bare-knuckle action. When the media stormed Harry with the question of all the allegations on him and Dinoco, he fled towards Evelyn in a helicopter. Meanwhile, on Evelyn, Alice decided to seduce Barracuda, while Castle drove the boat towards Evelyn. Meanwhile, in the engine room, Leary sneaked behind Barracuda to bash his brains in with a big wrench. Barracuda saw him, but couldn't stop him in time. Leary hit Barracuda on the head a number of times and blooded him up. Barracuda lost his senses, and Leary and Alice threw him into the water. Alice taunted Leary's male ego, and Leary hurled Alice by her hair and took her inside. At the same instant, Barracuda regained his senses underwater. From the helicopter, Harry called Leary's cell phone. At that time, Leary was having sex with Alice in the engine room. Alice took the cell phone out of Leary's pocket and shouted over the phone and let Harry know what she and Leary were doing. Harry was shocked and heartbroken. Leary suddenly turned and spotted wired C4s attached to the engine. That was the handiwork of Castle. Harry had lost his will to live and jumped into the water from his helicopter. On Evelyn, the captain called his men, who disarmed the bomb. Leary tried to negotiate with the stakeholders and decide their next course of action. And right then, the second bomb exploded. Castle had planted two. Castle called the Evelyn in search of Harry Ebbing, unaware that Harry never made it out on board. Instead, he encountered Leary. When Castle threatened to blow them up, Leary informed him that they'd already located and disarmed the C4. Leary lectured Castle about Dinoco being a corporate entity, not a conventional adversary one could combat with bullets. He derogatorily suggested he target drug dealers instead. Meanwhile, Barracuda had climbed up the boat and reset the charges. He shouted at Castle to blow the ship up. Castle detonated the bomb, blowing Evelyn up. He steered his boat away from the colossal blast, his gaze fixed on the horrific scene unfolding below as people were consumed by sharks. Leary abandoned Alice to her fate, swiftly swimming away as a shark viciously claimed her. But this escape was short-lived as Castle shot him. He was then torn apart by shark. Meanwhile, Barracuda attempted to climb aboard his own vessel, only to find himself staring down the barrel of a shotgun. Despite his pleas for mercy, Castle pulled the trigger, hurling Barracuda into the water. A menacing shark glided alongside the boat, seemingly looking for Barracuda's body to eat him. The battle was over. His war was not. Act 7. Man of Stone. Old Enemies. Rawlins, the man who staged the flight crash during the Russian Barbarossa fiasco, went to see General Nikolai Alexandrovich Zakharov, the general in charge of the Barbarossa fiasco. He had some intel he wanted to sell, but he had a big mouth. Their meeting was not smooth. Meanwhile, Castle blackmailed a low-level street thug named Dingo and let himself be staged as a captive in front of John James Toomey. Toomey was a big shot in the drug business. Even the FBI wouldn't go near him. Understanding that whoever killed the Punisher would earn rep in the whole business, he pointed his gun at Castle. But Castle was ready. He snatched Toomey's gun and shot everyone, and in the end, shot Dingo too, just in case he returned to crime. At Zakharov's hideout, Rawlins was hung upside down, tortured, and interrogated. They cut him down when he told them that the Barbarossa operation in Russia was done by the US and he was part of it. Rawlins said that he could deliver to Zakharov the man who did the groundwork in Sudeck, Frank Castle. Zakharov's henchman Dolonovich also ascertained the killings that Castle had been doing for 30 years. Rawlins said that Castle would come out of his hole for someone. He also pointed out that O'Brien was out there to kill the 6 Afghans Zakharov was keeping tabs on. Meanwhile, O'Brien assassinated Mohammed Sahar and another 3 before him. Only 2 more hits were left. At New York, Castle was about to kill the last person in Toomey's drug business, Alex Rastovich. However, before killing him, he learned that O'Brien was out there for blood, killing high-profile Afghans who had wronged her in life. After hearing the tip, Castle killed him. O'Brien was out to waste another Afghan big shot when she was spotted and apprehended by a group of US soldiers. She struggled, but was beaten and rendered unconscious. They were Yorkie Mitchell's men, the British soldier helping Castle during the Irish fiasco. Old wounds. Going frantically through his old contacts, Castle kept making calls. His mission, to somehow get O'Brien out of the mess he was in. Finally, he was able to reach Mitchell, just when he was about to blow her brains out. What transpired before was like this. Mitchell's men apprehended O'Brien because the Afghan whom O'Brien wanted to kill was protected by the British. Just then, they were attacked by Dolonovich and his soldiers. They were guided by Rawlins under the orders of Zakharov. Dolonovich and his men got the initial upper hand, but then British soldiers poured in from all directions. They took heavy fire, and most of his men were killed. Somehow, Dolonovich managed to escape with Rawlins. They came back and met Zakharov. Zakharov ordered Dolonovich to kill Rawlins unless he came up with a new idea. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, Mitchell took out O'Brien to dispatch her in silence as per his directives. At Zakharov's base, Dolonovich was about to throw Rawlins from the roof when Rawlins screamed that he had a plan. He suggested that where their plan to lure the Punisher out with O'Brien failed, another man's appearance could draw him out. Zakharov, the Man of Stone. Zakharov didn't think much about it. He was ready to use himself to draw out the Punisher. He thought he was worth it, given his history, and how the US has always treated his country. After all this happened, Castle made the call to Mitchell that stopped him from shooting O'Brien. He dropped her to a secure location and planned to hurt himself and tell his teammates that O'Brien fled. Meanwhile, the media covered Zakharov's arrival in Kabul. Castle watched it on TV. He knew it was a trap, but he took it as an invitation. Old flames. Castle traveled from New York to Paris to Delhi to Kabul. The last leg of his journey was on a dilapidated plane with reporters and writers where he learnt about what wrath Zakharov wrought upon the world. Meanwhile, Mitchell dropped O'Brien and gave him a note to give to Castle. At his base, Zakharov gathered heavy artillery and men in order to face Castle. There, Rawlins walked up to Zakharov and asked him to give him a job, as he had Black Ops experience, and he also specialized in making people work off charts. Dolonovich kept watch from afar. Meanwhile, on the plane, the writer Robert Varick told Zakharov's story to Castle. There were 7 small villages up in the northern mountains of Kandahar. Mujahideen fighters from the resistance rested there with families when they were not disrupting Russian business. Zakharov once went there with a full army, and seeing them, the Mujahideen fighters ran and hid. Zakharov's men rounded up a full 107 women, children, and old men. Then he made them jump from the cliffs, one by one. Those who resisted were shot and thrown. Zakharov himself threw a newborn with his own hands, but let the mother live. That was when the fighters attacked, but Zakharov didn't move from his position. None of the bullets touched him that day. That day, he earned the name Man of Stone. His helicopters bombed the fighters. Then Zakharov went and did the same to the other 6 villages. That day, he took 763 lives. At his base, Zakharov refused to put Rawlins on payroll as he was a betrayer by nature. Castle later met O'Brien. With Mitchell's help, they got codes to a US Army munitions depot in Kabul. They armed themselves to the teeth and then climbed 20 clicks together. New strategies. Zakharov and his men had already caught the writer Robert Varick. Upon his order, Dolonovich beheaded him. Meanwhile, O'Brien and Castle planted mines throughout the clicks. On the way, O'Brien told Castle how he got entangled with Rawlins, and how Rawlins took him on a covert mission and then pushed her off a chopper to protect the shipment of heroin. She said how she was abducted by Mujahideen and tortured, physically and sexually. Castle coldly said that their mission was not about human contact and kept planting the mines. Zakharov and his army went out on their helicopters in search of Castle. Before Zakharov killed Castle, he wanted to have his confession on the Sudeck job. He wanted Russia to open up the investigation and hold the US responsible. Suddenly, they spotted the vehicle that Castle and O'Brien had ditched. Zakharov had his men rocket the vehicle into oblivion. Castle heard the rotors and ordered O'Brien to get ready. Zakharov and his men spotted Castle too. They swiftly got down from the chopper and focused on Castle. But inside, Rawlins shouted and asked where O'Brien was. Just then, O'Brien shot a bazooka missile at one of the helicopters and blew it to bits. Then Castle and O'Brien focused their fire on the soldiers and mowed them down like grass. The soldiers ran into the rocks to get out of the hot zone. Rawlins screamed at them not to go there. The soldiers were blown to pieces by the mines that Castle and O'Brien had planted. Zakharov got Punisher on the comm and told him that there was a village 9 kilometers southwest of the mountain named Har. It housed roughly under 400 people. He told Castle to meet him there at sundown, unarmed, or he'd drop a mob payload and kill everyone in the village. With no other alternative, Castle went down to the village and surrendered. New war. The helicarrier landed and Rawlins came out and searched Castle. Zakharov ordered Rawlins to search Castle thoroughly, but he hurried. He spotted a wound in Castle's hands, but he didn't check it thoroughly. They tied his hands and lifted off. O'Brien jumped and tied herself stealthily to one of the wheels of the helicarrier. Rawlins was the first to hold a knife to Castle's eye. He screamed at him and demanded to know where O'Brien was. He'd have stuck the knife in Castle if Dolonovich hadn't intervened. He pulled Rawlins by the face and threw him aside. Zakharov sat by Castle's side and tried to have a conversation. Meanwhile, O'Brien cut the wires to the payload and sealed it so that it couldn't be dropped. Before anyone could say anything, Castle took out a broken blade from the wound in his hand and cut through the ties. He headbutted Dolonovich and took his gun. Zakharov shot at Castle, but Castle dodged the bullets and shot down the pilots. Zakharov ordered the wounded pilots to drop the mob on the village, but it was stuck thanks to O'Brien. Everyone hurried and jumped from the helicarrier. First was O'Brien, then Castle. Zakharov came near the door when Rawlins went completely feral and took Zakharov and jumped down, with Dolonovich jumping behind him. Rawlins landed with Zakharov as cushion. Zakharov's back was completely crushed. O'Brien had landed far and broken all her fingers while trying to land. Castle landed and ran toward her. He jumped and covered her as the helicarrier struck a mountain with the payload. There was a blinding explosion, but thankfully no lives were lost, except for the unlucky Russian pilots. Zakharov lay on the desert, unable to move. He demanded that Rawlins finish him, but Rawlins said that he'd leave Zakharov be. When the sun rose, Zakharov would get the slowest of death with no water or shade. Right then, Dolonovich spotted them and ran at Rawlins with his machete. Rawlins pleaded with him to stop and told him that he had a new offer. But as Dolonovich came near, Rawlins sliced his throat with his knife. On the other side, Castle fixed O'Brien's fingers. He and O'Brien then set forth to finish off Zakharov and the others. But unfortunately, O'Brien stepped on a sand mine and was critically injured. She asked 2 things from Castle. 1, he must take revenge from Rawlins. And 2, she wanted Castle to hold her till she died. Meanwhile, Rawlins took out Dilonovich's wallet and saw the photo of his kid. He made a promise to the bleeding Dilonovich. Rawlins would go to Moscow to meet his business associates, and there he was going to sexually assault Dilonovich's son to death. Castle held O'Brien till she passed away. All he saw was red. Cold vengeance. At sunrise, Castle came for the dying Zakharov and Dilonovich. Zakharov told Dilonovich not to be afraid. It was only death. Meanwhile, Rawlins ran away, singing. After finishing off Dilonovich, Castle stood in front of Zakharov. Zakharov told Castle that Rawlins took Dilonovich's papers. He'd get to Kabul in a week, and then board the flight to Moscow. He told Castle to kill Rawlins, for he wasn't a soldier like them. He was a parasite. Then Castle took a big stone and bashed Zakharov's head in. It took Castle 4 days to walk to Kabul without food and a bullet in his shoulder. He crossed the ruins of the villages that were massacred by Zakharov. On the 5th day, Mitchell's men found him. Mitchell took Castle to his camp and had a drink in front of him and talked about his life. He gave Castle a file on the remaining 2 Afghans that O'Brien was hunting and promised to give the Afghan security a night off. Castle appreciated the gesture. Castle killed one of the Afghans that night and the last one the next morning. Then he went to the Kabul airport. Rawlins was there. He had a smile on his face, ready to go to Moscow and do whatever sick stuff he'd planned for Dilonovich's son. Castle followed him to the men's washroom. Castle called out his name. Rawlins! Rawlins turned around and saw Castle standing with a machete. He tried to plead with him that he was a victim, as he tried to draw his knife behind his back. He lifted his hand to cut Castle, but instead, Castle chopped off his hand holding the knife. Rawlins cried and requested him to stop. He told Castle to let him talk to O'Brien, so he can write off his fortune to her. Castle told him that O'Brien was dead, right when he was starting to like her. Understanding that all was lost and he was going to die, Rawlins wriggled in the pool of his own blood as Castle moved forward with his machete. It would be a bad, grisly death. Act 8. Widowmaker. The jury. Castle walked a man outside from a bar at gunpoint. In his fear, he divulged the secrets about a child pornography ring and who filmed them. Then he shot him in the head and left, all the while thinking how easy it would have been to torture him gruesomely. Meanwhile, the widows of 5 mob bosses who were killed by the Punisher had a meeting. They were Annabella Guarini, widow of Dominic Guarini; Shauna Toomey, widow of James John Toomey; Bonnie D'Angelo, widow of Artie D'Angelo; Barbara Barbie Borucci, widow of Larry Borucci; and Lorraine Zucker, the widow of Paulie Zucker. They discussed what the Punisher had done to them and their families, and that internal strife boiled up between Barbie and Shauna. Meanwhile, Jennifer Cesari, the widow of Tim Bucato, went to a bar looking for a sexual encounter. She picked up a man and went to his place. At Annabella's place, Barbie made derogatory comments regarding Shauna's ethnicity. Shauna, a hard case, took out a blade from her mouth and attacked Barbie. She warned her not to mess with her again. Then Annabella proposed that they get together and work on how to kill the Punisher. She had gathered useful intel on the Punisher, and her plan was to read it and strategize and hit him where everyone had failed before. Meanwhile, Jennifer had sex with the man who she picked from the bar, but when the man tried to touch her, she broke his nose and beat him like a wild animal. Meanwhile, the 4 wives discussed how the Punisher had ruthlessly killed their husbands. They couldn't go to the police, so they decided that they'd hire someone who could do the job for them. Meanwhile, in her room, Jennifer sat alone using makeup to cover up her scars. She'd stuck photos of the people she was going to kill. They were the 5 widows. The judge. Castle showed up right at the doorstep of Carl and Ann Larson, the parents who shot child pornography. He asked them to invite him in. When Carl asked for a warrant, Castle told them he had all the proof he needed from the man he'd killed. He instructed them to call the kids to the living room. Then he took the Larsons to the basement where the movies were shot. Then he blew Ann's brains out and shot Carl through his mouth, then put a bullet in his head too. He came up and called the social services to pick up the kids. He looked at their faces and the damage they'd taken. These were times when Castle wanted to get his hands on God. Detective Paul Budiansky discussed with his shrink how he'd taken down an underage shooter who took guns to school and shot down children. He was disciplined by his superiors for that. At Annabella's mansion, all the widows went through all the previous cases of the Punisher, chalking out who almost got him and when. They discovered that Barbie couldn't read, so they sent her for a job that Shauna had to attend to satisfy the client sexually. At the shrink's office, Paul argued with the shrink and dismissed all reservations she could have involving a black detective in the NYPD. Jenny Cesare was sitting peacefully in a bar when an old friend approached her. He was a nice guy, and that's why Jenny told him to stay away from her. Paul came home and discussed with his wife how the Punisher took out the child pornography ring. He thought that somehow his actions made him similar to the Punisher. His wife assured him that it did not. The 5 widows met at a bar. From the files, they'd learned of the girl trafficking ring that the Punisher took out a year ago. So they figured that if they find a damsel in distress, they can lure out the Punisher and then kill him. Jenny sat on a table right behind them and listened to everything. The ensnarement. It was now a night in the woods. An entire convoy of mob bosses were hit by Castle. He blew most of them sky high with his RPG, then he came out with his guns. Earlier, the widows had decided to go with their plan. They planned to set up Bonnie as the damsel in distress. To get into the current affairs of the crime families, Barbie was to seduce Tony Pizzo and get all the information from him. All the while, Jenny listened to every plan from outside by bugging their place. Castle walked out into the open and put a bullet in Tony Pizzo's eye. He shot at the henchman with his machine gun. A man kept shouting as his face was covered in glass shards and blood. When they shot back, Castle took cover behind a burning car. Then he jumped out and started raining down bullets on them. Earlier, Barbie had seduced Tony Pizzo and had learned from him that Castle kept killing anyone who was made boss. The families decided on bringing a new boss from Reno, Pat Migliorato. They were going to pick him up from Newark the next day and bring him to Tony's place. In the gunfight, the man who was screaming his lungs out due to the glass shards in his eyes was in fact Tony Migliorato. While his associates tried to help him, Castle came out of the woods and launched an RPG, blowing all of them to hell. As Pat died a gruesome death, cursing Castle, the trunk of a car opened and Bonnie came out of it, dressed like a sex worker. Earlier, just before the massacre had happened, Barbie took Tony alone to an alley to give him pleasure. Right at that time, Shauna put Bonnie in her car trunk with a bag full of bulletproof vests so that she could save herself if the Punisher attacked. Castle asked Bonnie who she was. Bonnie told him that she was a sex worker and Tony's men put her inside the trunk as a joke. She referred to a Romanian ring that she worked for and told Castle about a place that housed girls like her and used them as slaves. Castle told her to give the address, but she insisted on coming. She kept it believable all the time. Both Castle and Bonnie arrived in front of a secluded house where the widows were waiting to kill the Punisher. The attack. Castle became very suspicious as he approached the house. There was no security and Bonnie kept insisting on bringing her with him, but still he approached slowly. Right then, Shauna pulled the trigger. A bullet went through Castle's shoulder. He fell down. Annabella kept screaming at Shauna to finish the job. She tried too, but Bonnie came in the path. She went all hysterical, kicking and screaming at Castle for killing Artie. And right then, the bride, Jenny Cesario, stepped in. She was grim and silent. She inserted a blade into Bonnie's gut and tore her intestines out. Then she covered Castle and started shooting at the widows. She launched a grenade at them and then took Castle and left. Later, the police arrived at the scene. It was Detective Paul. The police were suspicious as they found Bonnie's body and guns in the house. But when they questioned the widows, they came up with nothing except a house-buying deal gone wrong. Jenny took Castle to her house and tended to his wounds. When asked, she said she was his #1 fan. Meanwhile, the captain didn't find anything useful and didn't detain the widows. But they were scared witless when Paul ran the widows' backgrounds to them. They all belonged to crime families. Paul left his superiors stupefied. At Annabella's house, all the widows ditched and burned their clothes. Then Annabella quietly said that it was her sister Jenny that shot at them. Shauna screamed that she'd already killed her, but Annabella was certain. At Jenny's hideout, Castle woke up and asked her why she helped him. Jenny kissed him and told him it was because Castle had killed her husband. The bride. Jenny was born into the notorious Cesari crime family. Growing up, she was shielded from the violence and danger that permeated her world. When she came of age, her sister Annabella and the other mafia wives introduced her to Tim Bucato, who at first seemed charming and kind. They married quickly, but the illusion of Tim's kindness shattered on their wedding night. Tim's true nature was monstrous. He became violently abusive in every conceivable way, physically, sexually, and mentally. He beat Jenny without mercy, raped her repeatedly, and even invited other men, often strangers, to abuse her as well. Despite knowing about Tim's cruelty, Annabella and the other women did nothing to help Jenny. They kept her trapped in this nightmare, ignoring her suffering. Jenny endured this torment until a day of unexpected change. The Punisher killed Tim, a moment that should have marked Jenny's liberation and a chance to reclaim her life. But on that very same day, fate dealt her another cruel blow. She was diagnosed with breast cancer. At Annabella's place, Shauna screamed that she was sure Jenny was dead. She'd hired 2 master assassins to kill her and then made sure it was done. Annabella told her to check with the killers again. Paul talked to his wife Gina about the flack that his captain faced for letting the widows go. They shared a good intimate talk about never leaving each other. At her house, Jenny told Castle that she'd confronted her sister, declaring that she was going to the FBI. She believed that Tim's evil had caused her cancer, and she blamed Annabella for pushing her into the marriage. In response, Shauna knocked Jenny out and had 2 men from her husband's gang dispose of her. Meanwhile, Shauna went to see the man who had taken the hit on Jenny, Curtis. After taking a bribe, the man spilled it all. Their attempt to dispose of her failed. They threw her from a bridge, assuming she'd be hit by a passing train. Instead, Jenny miraculously landed atop the train and survived. When she regained consciousness, she realized she had a chance to start a new life and seek revenge on the women who had betrayed her. She underwent a double mastectomy and spent years learning weapon handling and police skills. When she finally returned to New York City to exact her revenge on her sister and the other women, she discovered they were plotting to kill the Punisher in retaliation for the deaths of their husbands. Determined to save the man who had indirectly saved her by killing Tim, Jenny intervened and rescued the Punisher. Jenny asked Castle if he could relate, and Castle said that he did. The executioners. Paul Budiansky went to Annabella's house and questioned them. He told them his theory that since Castle killed all their husbands, they banded together and tried to kill him. Annabella and the others denied it and asked Paul to leave. Paul said that he was going to work out Bonnie's connection to them and then come back and arrest all of them. All the while, Shauna sat outside in the car with Curtis. At Jenny's apartment, she connected with Castle over the scars that life had given them. She said that they were, in fact, twin souls, to which Castle could say nothing, for it was true. Shauna stormed into Annabella's house and told her that Detective Paul had chalked it all out. In a fit of rage, she called a hit on him. Paul and Gina were sitting outside her hospital when Curtis walked over to them, pulled his gun out, and started shooting. A bullet went through Gina's pelvis and another through her leg. Paul went into a frenzy and emptied his entire gun on Curtis. Later, it was declared by the doctor that Gina would live, but would have trouble walking. Just then, the captain walked in and demanded Paul's firearm. At her house, Annabella screamed at Shauna for taking a shot at Paul. She deduced that their condition didn't look so good, so she suggested all of them leave the country. But Lorraine reminded her of Jenny, who would hunt them till the end of the world. So she asked all of them to reconsider their further action. On the other hand, Paul made out the connection between Curtis and Toomey with the help of a friend. He took his personal gun and decided to handle things on his own. At Jenny's apartment, Castle had just come back to his senses after he fell unconscious. Jenny told him to wait and get better. She wore Castle's Punisher garb and went out hunting. The Punisher. Castle rested at Jenny's place and watched the news on the TV about Detective Paul's wife being shot. He related with him and closed his eyes and dreamt of what Jenny was doing to the widows. Jenny didn't waste any time. She shot Barbie through the stomach, Lorraine in her chest and shoulder. Shauna shot back at her. Some bullets she dodged and some grazed her. Then she put one in Shauna's face. Then she got back to Lorraine and put one in her head. She turned to Annabella, took her at gunpoint, and left. While leaving, her car smashed into Detective Paul's. Paul drove straight to Annabella's place and witnessed Jenny's handiwork. At her apartment, Jenny cuffed Castle so that he couldn't stop her. She had Annabella tied to a chair. She told her that the Punisher had freed her. Annabella pleaded with Jenny, telling her that the men ran the business in the past. They wanted to keep Tim on the leash, so they chose Jenny. Annabella had no say in it. Jenny told her that she was going to show her what the bosses did to earn the money that ran the crime families. She took out a baseball bat and bashed Annabella's brains in, hitting her again and again. Meanwhile, Paul followed the lead and tracked down Jenny's apartment and drove toward it. Jenny's eyes were full of tears, but she wasn't crying. She sat on Castle and told him to make love to her so that she could feel something, anything. After they were done, she told Castle that the hurt was too much to carry for a person. It should only be the Punisher who should carry it forward. Saying that, he blew her own brains out with a gun. She fell on Castle's chest and took her last breath. Castle broke the cuffs and cleaned and covered Jenny's body. Outside, Paul pulled his gun at him. He was mad. He didn't care. He said he'd kill everyone who would try to hurt his family. Castle walked straight to him and asked him one question. You want to be me? Later, Paul went to see Gina at the hospital and assured her that he was nothing like the Punisher. In the end, Punisher watched the police take out Jenny's body and bid a last goodbye to her. Act 9. Long, cold, dark, bad dreams. Barracuda didn't die. He came back, and he came right for Yorkie Mitchell. He invaded Mitchell's house at night and shot his wife. Then he injured him and kept him alive and kept talking to him. He found some serious info on Castle and pocketed it. Then he shot Mitchell and killed him. Castle woke up from a dream where his family wasn't killed and still had a happy family, where he grew old and his kids had grown up. But when his eyes opened, the reality kicked him hard. The sight of his family dying flashed in front of his eyes. To kill that thought, he went target practicing. He used all the high-caliber guns he had and shot the targets frantically. But when the smoke faded, the dream still remained. Barracuda, meanwhile, went into an orphanage and abducted a child. 2 weeks later, Castle waited calmly and observed as Powdered Joe Perona called a meeting with the crime bosses. But it was later revealed that the caller was not Perona. Somebody had set them up. Hearing this, everyone went into panic and drew their guns out. Just then, Barracuda walked in. He was the one who had called them. Barracuda started shooting all the mob bosses. Castle had also set up a timed claymore mine. He jumped down from the AC shaft as the bomb shook the entire floor. war. Castle joined Barracuda in killing the gang members. They left a bloody room after throwing a mob boss directly at a mine. When everything was done, Barracuda shot Castle repeatedly with light shots to put him down. He tied Castle up and told him that he'd received a message in the mailbox with the names of Castle's associates. He tracked down Mitchell and found out about Catherine O'Brien, who died during the Afghan operation. Catherine had a sister in La Jolla whom she'd call. Her sister was taking care of someone. Barracuda went out and brought that someone with him. It was O'Brien's and Castle's little daughter. Bitter truth. During the time Castle was hunting Nikki Cavella and was saved by O'Brien, they became physically intimate. O'Brien became pregnant and kept the baby, but didn't tell Castle. Now Castle had someone to care for in this world, and Barracuda held that someone in front of him and told him how he'd kill her. Castle was reminded about how he failed his family. Castle snapped the handcuffs and attacked Barracuda in a frenzy. He hit him with animalistic rage and bit his face off. Barracuda put a knife in his rib and hit him with a chair, causing him to fall from the building atop a police car. Castle woke up in a hospital with doctors and the police around. He warned them that Barracuda was coming and there would be bloodshed. He proposed to draw him out of the city and kill him, but the police pressed on, throwing Castle in the jail. Barracuda went to a street doctor to fix his wounds. The doctor taunted his wounds. That was when Barracuda went angry and choked the life out of him. At the hospital, the doctor feared that Barracuda would come and kill all his patients, so he gave Castle a shot of adrenaline to get him on his feet. Then he injected himself with a sedative and told Castle to escape. Castle escaped by incapacitating 2 police officers. At his hideout, he read all about La Jolla orphanage and how O'Brien's sister Barbara tried to get the baby back. Castle armed himself and drove to a place where he thought Barracuda might come. Breadcrumbs. On his way to the destination, Castle met a lady who was looking for her lost son. That stirred up all kinds of old memories in him. He remembered how he kept a photo of his family with him during the wars and what happened later. Both Castle and Barracuda were going to meet Barbara O'Brien, Catherine's sister, in a shopping mall. Castle discreetly passed a burner phone to Barbara by creating a panic when he called in a bomb threat. Meanwhile, Barracuda drove there with baby Sarah. His only mission was to draw Castle out and kill him. Then he'd kill the baby. Castle contacted Barbara. He told her to get out of her house and make it as loud as possible. He told her to put up an impression as if she wouldn't return for a few days. Castle would then wait for the night and go in. Castle would also be there, and Barracuda would follow him. Then he'd kill Barracuda and take back Sarah. Next morning, Barbara did what Castle had asked her. At night, Castle broke into Barbara's house. He was watched by Barracuda from afar and followed him in. They stood facing each other when Castle asked Barracuda a question. He asked if Barracuda had contacted the people who gave Barracuda Mitchell's whereabouts. Barracuda denied, and Castle was at peace that those people didn't know about Sarah. When Castle said he was going to kill him, Barracuda seemingly shot Sarah, whom he was holding in her hands. Then he invited Castle to kill him. Blood war. It was just a doll that Barracuda had shot. Castle started to fire at him and brought him down. Then he started raining kicks on Barracuda's face. After rendering him senseless, he drove him out. Then he pulled him out of the car and attached the car's jumper cables to his balls. Castle asked him where his daughter was. Barracuda told him that he'd left her in the parking lot. Castle pulled him in and drove to where Sarah was. Castle found Sarah's car and examined it. He discovered that there was a claymore attached to it. But while he was doing it, Barracuda freed himself and got out, and by God, he was pissed. Barracuda took out the guns from Castle's car one by one and started emptying it on them. Castle took Sarah and hid behind the car. Castle got up and shot back with Barracuda's guns from the car. A never-ending mayhem of bullets went on. Ultimately, Castle got his shot, 2 straight through Barracuda's chest. However, he wasn't dead, and Castle had to leave as police would be coming. He blew his car to bits and left with Sarah. But while crossing the woods, Barracuda attacked again. He behaved like a deranged lunatic, unstoppable. He kept landing punches and kicks on Castle until a wave of fear washed over Castle, because a mad Barracuda was a deadly Barracuda. Bloodbath. Barracuda's punches had already made Castle swallow his 3rd teeth with a mouthful of blood, and he figured that after killing him, Barracuda would just eat Sarah alive. He searched for weapons on the ground and found a pair of pliers. He used them to catch hold of Barracuda's nose and then ripped it off. Barracuda took a machine gun and frantically started shooting. Castle found a window to take Sarah and enter an abandoned elementary school. Upon entering the school, the past days of torments flashed before Barracuda's eyes. Right then, out of nowhere, Castle emerged with an axe. He severed Barracuda's hands, one at the biceps, another at the wrist. Then he put the axe through Barracuda's chest. Then he took the gun and stood over Barracuda's chest. Barracuda was reminded of the time when Mitchell said that Castle was the most dangerous man on earth and he'd kill him. Castle then kept firing until there was nothing left of Barracuda's head. At a distance, Castle disarmed the claymore attached to Sarah's crib. He wanted to take care of baby Sarah forever. But he couldn't, not the world he lived in. He called Barbara and handed over Sarah to her. When Barbara asked what to tell Sarah when she grew up, Castle told her to lie. Barbara also asked how her sister Catherine was in her life. Castle told her that she was strong but sad. But one day in Afghanistan, he saw her smile at the sunrise. With that memory, Castle left and drove into the cold, dark night. Act 10. Valley Forge, Valley Forge. All the King's Horses. A book about the birth of the Punisher, Valley Forge, had just come out. It was written by Michael Goodwin, the brother of Stevie Goodwin. Fury sat in a bar and gave some files to Castle. In those files, there were details of people Castle was after. Meanwhile, at a golf course, 8 old generals had gathered. Kurt Perino, Jake Farmington, Bobby Van Abst, Paul Vatreus, Joe Vracciu, Don Kent, John Archer, and Bradley Landis. They were discussing Castle about what he'd done to Barracuda. They were the ones who had sent the contacts of Yorkie Mitchell to Barracuda and set him on Castle's tail. They were aware of the video of Rawlins that Castle had made about Operation Barbarossa. They knew that Castle was coming for them and they wanted to kill him first. But everything had to be done in secret. They planned to give Castle a target to shoot at and call him out in the open. Then a small Delta unit of 8 men would capture Castle and lock him down at a secret location. The generals knew Castle wouldn't kill a fellow soldier. One of the 8 generals was to be the target. Colonel George Howe was selected to lead the Delta team. He talked to Lieutenant Geller and told him that Castle had to be brought in and put on trial, as he was a fellow soldier. Castle also had to answer for the death of Martin Vanim, whom Castle left to freeze in Russia. Vanim was to be married to Howe's daughter. Saying this, he welcomed Geller to meet the team, while Castle had already put up the photos of the generals on his hit list. All the King's Men. Howe told Geller how he got into Delta Force. In the summer of 1969, his helicopter crashed near the Laos border, and the Viet Cong captured the survivors. Howe saw his comrades killed, with their hands and feet thrown into his bamboo cage. Just when his own fate seemed sealed, a Marine Force recon unit attacked the village and rescued him. Inspired by their skill, Howe joined the Green Berets and was later among the first recruits of Delta Force. He introduced Geller to the team. Lieutenant Woody and Stanaway, Sergeants Mellinger, Giroux, Winburn, McGee, Rents and Corporal McDonough. Wood discussed how to get one of the generals in the open and then capture Castle. Meanwhile, the generals discussed how much they could trust Howe. Woody and Stan investigated one of Castle's massacre sites. Woody witnessed Castle's handiwork and remembered a line from the Alien movie. As the saying went, he really admired Castle's purity. Woody and Stan were keeping watch and talking over the comm, when suddenly Woody turned. Castle was there, and he had Stan at gunpoint. Woody said that they were military. Castle kicked Stan and ran to a nearby building. Stan followed him on the elevator. As the door opened, Castle hit Stan and knocked him unconscious. On the roof, Woody pointed a gun at Castle and almost had him, but the floor under him collapsed. Castle handcuffed him to a pipe and left. Later, Stan and Woody talked to Howe and said that they'd put a tracer on Castle. Sitting on the wall. The Delta team homed in on Castle's location as per their tracer. They had Howe on comm. They threw gas bombs and entered. Castle was ready with a gas mask and a baseball bat. He beat the crap out of the 4 soldiers who had entered. In the chaos, Castle threw a flash grenade in a crate full of flash grenades. There was a huge blast of blinding light. The soldiers survived, but they were seriously injured. Later, they discussed amongst themselves on how to go for Castle, now that he knew he was being chased. The generals met Howe and the Delta team at their base. Learning that Castle escaped, they screamed their hearts out at Howe, calling him incompetent. One of the generals took Howe aside and talked to him calmly. Howe said that he knew Geller was reporting to them. Right then, Woody barged in with the news that the tracer on Castle was active again. Later, Castle sat in a bar and watched the news of his base getting compromised. Castle had the tracer in his hand, and he was fiddling with it. The Delta team homed in on Castle's location, the Holy Cross Cemetery. As they entered and came to the exact location, Woody was startled and told the other soldiers to call Howe. Castle had fed himself with explosives and held a dead man switch in his hands, and he wanted to talk. Mano a mano. Holding the dead man switch, Castle waited till Howe arrived. He directly got to the point. He asked Howe if Delta had no other work than running errands for company executives. Howe was surprised. He never gave him his team details. Castle already knew everything. He said that the generals weren't soldiers, they just worked as a company. Previously, they'd hired Barracuda to kill him, and now the Delta. He said that the generals wanted the tape more than anything. The tape had Rawlins' confession on the flight crash and all the shot callers of Operation Barbarossa. Meanwhile, Geller called up one of the generals and told him that Howe had gone to a covert operation and didn't tell him. The general was angry. Howe was taken aback. He knew about the tape but didn't know about its contents. He asked Castle to turn himself in peacefully and he'd see to it that the guilty were punished. Castle said that if he surrendered, then he'd be dead by dawn. He wasn't afraid of dying, but there were a lot of men who had to be punished. Saying this, he released the dead man switch. Gas bombs burst everywhere. Castle incapacitated many Delta soldiers. It was like fighting an unstoppable freight train, but ultimately he was tased repeatedly and beaten and then taken into custody. Howe called General Perino, who started abusing him racially. Howe kept calm. Perino told Howe to get the tape by any means and kill Castle. Howe solemnly said that he would take care of it. He asked his soldiers to keep Geller out, then entered Castle's room and talked to him alone. Soldier to soldier, Howe asked Castle to trust him. Howe and Woody got the tape of Rawlins' confession from a public locker. Castle had planted a failsafe to destroy the tape if anyone opened the locker. While returning to their base, Howe told Woody that Castle cared so much about innocent life that he didn't even plant a bomb at the locker. That meant he'd planned all of this. Also, Castle's allegations about the generals being working in corporations was true. They'd never been tested in battle. Woody asked why Howe still had Castle. Howe told Woody that he had his reasons. At the base, Howe watched Rawlins' confession about how the generals had hired their own terrorists in, bringing the flight down and killing innocents. He also talked about the general's confession being recorded on a disc. Castle asked the contact for the disc in the video. Howe was stunned. Meanwhile, the generals knew from Geller that Howe had a moral code that was stopping him from killing Castle. They were afraid if Castle went for a public trial, all of their sins would come out in the open. So they decided to kill Castle themselves. Howe told Woody and the others in the team to leave with all the weapons and burn all evidence. He was just left with a .45 and Castle. While watching the second half of Rawlins' video, he came to know of Van Him's role in Operation Barbarossa and also understood that the generals had planned to sell Barbarossa in the private market and retire. Howe made the call to the chairman. He was Rawlins' contact for the confessions of the generals. He told the chairman to delete any evidence that Rawlins had given him. Howe walked into Castle's room and said that the evidence on the tape would bring immense damage to the reputation of the United States military, so he wouldn't work on it. Castle asked him where it had left them. Howe kept the .45 on the table. It had 8 bullets. He sat down and asked Castle why he did what he did. Castle replied so that the sinners couldn't walk away. When asked about conscience and second chances, Castle replied that he didn't believe in redemption. When Howe asked if Castle would ever stop, he replied, no, to which Howe replied, thank you. Meanwhile, on his way back, Geller discovered something in the files of Castle, a certain history that had an untold connection. At the base, Howe told Castle that the end of the Punisher should have been life in prison, but upon seeing the tape, he pondered if the Punisher was really necessary. He stood up with the gun in his hands. The generals gathered outside the base. Howe came out and told them they'd find Castle and the tape upstairs. He washed his hands of everything in the mission, then he walked away in silence. As the generals walked in, Geller called Perino. He said that the guy in command of the team that had saved Howe during the Vietnam War was none other than Castle. Howe had planned it all. He wanted to save Castle, but at the same time wanted him to face the law. Geller said if Howe had watched Rawlins' tape, then his perspective to the entire case may have changed, and Geller had no idea what Howe could do. As Fury read the final excerpts from the book Valley Forge, Castle killed all the generals with the .45 and walked away. It was a war like any other, but there were no words to describe how it affected the life and mind of Castle. Act 11. Girls in White Dresses. In the town of Tierra Rota, Gabriela Nunez's 15th birthday was being celebrated. She turned into a woman. She gave her doll to her sister Angelica while she went and had a dance with her father. As Angelica went outside, Gabriela followed her, but then a van parked near them and masked men came out and kidnapped Gabriela. While leaving, they dumped a dead body of another young girl, with wounds and stitches all over. As Castle walked through the streets of New York and towards a bar, he reflected on how the world kept spinning and he kept killing people. But to his tragedy, this family was still dead. No actions, natural or divine, could bring them back. While drinking at the counter, Castle spotted a man in a hat who had been following him for a long time. He followed the man back to the alley and shoved him and pointed his gun. It turned out to be an elderly man who just wanted to talk. Castle helped him up. He offered Castle a drink. While drinking, the man introduced himself as a resident of Tierra Rota. It was a peaceful town until a cult kept abducting young women from the age of 12 to 30, and later they disposed of their dead bodies in the town itself for the townsfolk to clean up. The police couldn't do anything except for one man who lost his sister, but he was also killed. The old man gave Castle some gold that he and his townsfolk had brought from their hard-earned money. Castle returned it saying that he wasn't a mercenary or a hitman. The man walked away sadly. Back in the town, a few townsfolk hid Angelica as the men in masks arrived in vans. When Angelica's father went to talk to them, they shot him brutally. The old man hid Angelica. Meanwhile, Castle learned about the massacre from the news and looked at his own reflection in his glass. Back in the town, Angelica walked out of the house when suddenly one of the masked men tried to abduct her. But someone blew his brains out. It was Castle, and he'd come to find out what was going on there. Abductors. Castle addressed the townsfolk and told them that he was there to do what needed to be done, but he was no hero. He told the people that the cult was doing this to break the spirit of the townspeople. He also learned about the white powder that was found on the dead bodies. Castle deduced that they could be from latex gloves. He was given a room with a mirror. When he looked at it, he could still see the reflections of his dead family. Meanwhile, someone had dumped a fresh body. Castle went out with the people and visited the dump sites. There, he found cat litter. He went to the morgue to see one of the dead bodies. He himself performed an autopsy on the body and found out that the lungs were removed from the back of the body. So were the eyes. So that was connected. Again, kitty litter was used to absorb toxicity when something was cooked. Castle figured that something was being cooked and the girls were being used as cheap disposable labor. Looking at the number of deaths, it could be the biggest operation in Mexico. One by one, Castle worked his way up the food chain. starting from meth heads to dealers, and took all of them and hung them upside down, ready for interrogation. In a room, Ramon Estrada, Miguel Estrada, and Jefe talked about the shipment and his crew disappearing, when suddenly Skeleton appeared. He said that he gave Punisher Ramon's dealers. Jefe, angered, shot Skeleton down. Jefe went to the lab where the meth was being cooked and called out for Heavy. He told Heavy about the Punisher. Heavy said that he knew the Punisher and he was a dangerous man. Castle beat the information about the entire operation from the dealers. He went straight to a warehouse where they might be. There, he heard a sound and focused his gunfire on a mirror. The mirror broke, and on the other side lay the body of little Angelica, ridden with bullets. He held her arm and was reminded of his son. Killers. While Castle retrieved Angelica's body and came back to the Tierra Rota, another man ran to the town and spread the news that Castle had killed Angelica, as there was no one around. Hearing this, Angelica's mother started screaming and crying. As the townsfolk talked about little Angelica and how she was taken, Castle carried her into the cemetery. The old man walked behind him and asked if it was true that he killed her. Castle could just say sorry to him. Her mother said that her death was on his head. For the next few days, the world went on, but Castle couldn't get one fact out of his head. Little Angelica was dead and could never be brought back. It was as if the bullet-ridden ghost of Angelica pursued him like a curse everywhere. Meanwhile, the Estradas carried on their business as Castle left Tierra Rota. Heavy was about to rape and kill one of the girls who cooked meth for them. Back at his place, Castle contemplated killing himself for the sin he'd committed. He was to be punished. He saw Angelica in front of him, taking out a bullet from her chest wound. The vision left him rattled. He went back to the graveyard and dug Angelica's body out. He took out a bullet from her chest. It was a .22, not a .45. It was not from his gun. Castle went back and met the man who had first spread the rumor of him killing Angelica. He threw him through a glass window. Then he shot him in his leg. He divulged everything about how some people had given him Angelica's body and how they framed Castle. Castle led a long bloody torture on the man until he said everything about the Estradas, Jefe and Heavy, and died. Castle promised to Angelica in his heart that all of them would be dead just as she was. He drove off toward Miguel's location while he parted. Dealers. Miguel was having sex with two girls when they were suddenly startled. Castle was standing right behind them with his gun. The girls panicked and Castle couldn't get a good aim at Miguel, but Miguel was already amped up on meth. He was like an animal. He threw a heavy box at Castle, which he dodged, but then he jumped and headbutted Castle. He bled profusely and wasn't able to see properly. Miguel fled, but then the girls attacked him. Miguel came back with a gun and aimed for Castle's head, but instead gunned down the girl on Castle's back. Castle caught hold of another girl and threw her at Miguel. He pushed her aside through a glass door. Then Miguel stood in front of Castle and started threatening him. However, Castle fired straight into the aquarium and a shark fell out and bit Miguel. Castle couldn't find any evidence in the house. He pulled the shark and dropped it in the swimming pool. Meanwhile, Ramon and Jefe supervised the meth production. They cursed Miguel for not being there, but also called him an artist for chalking out their entire meth business. Heavy informed them about Miguel. Ramon and Jefe were scared and talked about increasing security. Meanwhile, Castle met the old man and brought him Miguel's head. The old man said that he knew Miguel and talked about his brother Ramon. He said he forgave Castle for Angelica's death. Castle told him that he didn't kill Angelica as she was shot with a .22. He said that Angelica told it herself. The old man apologized. Castle said that he didn't come to town for them, he came for himself. Meanwhile, Ramon told Jefe to shoot the shark and kill it. Right then, Castle attacked their mansion, but Ramon managed to flee in a car. Meanwhile, at the lab, Heavy planned to liquidate the operation and kill everyone on base. His men masked up, but one girl ran away and killed a guard. She alerted the other girls that it was time to run. Ramon made it to Heavy's lair. It was revealed that he was the actual boss and the financier. When Heavy said that he would take back his operation and money, Ramon said that it would make them enemies. Heavy got up and punched Ramon in the face. He didn't wear a mask that day. He was none other than William Russo, the Jigsaw. They all fall down. Castle holed up in a motel. He met the old man and told the town to stand for themselves. The old man told him about Heavy, an American who ran the export business. Castle paused. The old man asked if Castle ever met him. Castle said that if the old man ever saw his face, he'd know that they'd met. Meanwhile, the cleanup continued at the lab. All the girls were getting shot or killed. The girl who stood up to the goons fought one of them and saved another little child. They hid as the goons approached. But then, like a blessing from above, Castle came and knifed him. He kept killing the thugs left and right using knives, guns, and grenades. Jigsaw watched Castle from afar. Castle saw him too. He shot at him, but he ran inside the office room. Ramon and Jefe went to the other room, and Jigsaw waited with a gun near the door. But Castle broke through the wall beside him. They engaged in a bloody bare-knuckle fight. They broke through windows and walls. Castle got hold of a container and smashed it on Jigsaw's face. His face fell apart. Jigsaw fell down on one of the trucks and seemingly died. Castle threw the container on a switch and unlocked an iron container, which fell down and smashed Jigsaw's goons. Jefe kicked Ramon and fled in his car. In his desperation, Ramon took the rebellious girl hostage and hung her up by the neck. 3 layers of thick glass stood between Ramon and Castle. Castle ran through the 3 layers of glass like a freight train, killed Ramon and saved the girl. Then he burned down the entire meth lab. The girls returned to their families at Tierra Rota. Jeff A. came back to the town thinking that he still had power over the people, but the rebellious girl and her group of other tormented women from the town gathered up in front of him. Then they killed him, brutally. And somewhere in New York City, the Punisher vowed, never again. Act 12. 6 hours to kill. Time runs out. At 10:05 p.m., Castle killed his way through the attendants and guards in an at-risk juvenile learning center. It was actually a child trafficking ring. These were places that had fallen through the city's radar. The kids wanted out of their cells. Castle called the police after finishing his bloodbath. But he saw it in the eyes of some of the kids that they'd fallen into the abyss already, and there was no bringing them back. At 10:22 p.m., Castle came back to his van and there was a man in a gas mask waiting for him. He subjected Castle to a nerve gas, and Castle started losing his senses slowly. When Castle tried to take out another gun, the masked man hit him in the head and rendered him senseless. Then he drove away with Castle. At 11:45 p.m., the Lizard Kings pondered whether everything went properly. At 12:10 a.m., Castle regained his senses and his abductor stood in front of him. He introduced himself as Louis. He said that he'd injected Castle with a poison that would give him 6 golden hours to live. He had to kill a man for Louis within those 6 hours. Then he'd receive the antidote, or else he would die. At 12:25 a.m., Mayor Don was talking over the phone about the Punisher killings, when suddenly he heard the news of the juvenile center murders. At 12:38 a.m., Louis gave Castle the name of the target, John Lynn Cavalier, the runner of the largest criminal organization in Philadelphia. He was a bog target, possibly untouchable. He couldn't torture Louis for the antidote either. Then Castle just wouldn't get it. Then he got Castle out of his restraints. He said it was a fanboy moment for him to work with Castle, but Castle caught hold of his neck, twisted it, and killed him. Castle wasn't afraid to die. For all he knew, there was no antidote. He calculated that he had 6 hours left, so he armed up and decided to take as many bastards as he could with him. Killing time. At 12:45 a.m., Deirdre called up Louis, but he didn't pick up. Benji assured her that he'd go to meet Louis and would meet them in an hour at the ball. Deirdre said that she'd take Walter instead, else Cavalier would suspect that something was wrong. During the conversation, Walter remembered when he was tortured by the Vietnamese army. At 12:51 a.m., Castle chose his first target as Mikhail Stadnicki, escort service owner, Russian mob captain, and a sadist who hit girls for fun. At 1:11 a.m., he wrote profane comments about Russia on Mikhail's car. When stopped, he broke the fingers of one of Mikhail's men. He called Mikhail out. Castle called from behind and threw a flash grenade at them. Then he came down with his automatic machine gun. At 1:14 a.m., the mayor went to the massacre site and came to know about child slavery. He understood that there would be riots all around the city if people came to know about it. He called in the FBI and asked them for a favor. They had to kill the Punisher by dawn. At 1:40 a.m., Castle visited his next target, Baz LaSalle, who used drug money to buy off lands and burn down homes and conduct evisceration. He lured him out with fire and then put a knife in his hand. Then he put a machete in LaSalle. At 1:45 a.m., Cavalier attended the ball. He could sense that something was going to come down during the night, and he was ready. At 2:02 a.m., Castle hit his third target, Jeffro Carter, with his car. He blew his brains out while Jeffro shouted and then ran over his head. At 2:06 a.m., Deirdre and Walter went to Lewis's base and found him dead. But they didn't find Louis' BlackBerry that could lead back to them. But Walter was already phased out and was remembering his torture days. While Castle drove off for his next target, a thought crossed his mind. He was wasting time getting the small fishes. He thought about going for Cavalier instead. Meanwhile, Cavalier met Benji at the party, and although they were out for each other's blood, they behaved as if nothing happened. At 2:13 a.m., a few cops gathered up to kill Castle, as asked by the mayor. Combat hour. At 3:15 a.m., Castle understood something was off with the cops. They started shooting outright. He dodged their bullets, then got up and started shooting back at them. However, he was getting slow due to the toxin injected in him. He didn't kill cops, but he realized that they were just thugs in cop attire, so he didn't hold back. He stormed through all of them and killed most. He bombed his van to take out the rest. The last 2 cops alive requested immediate backup. All of Castle's weapons and notes were gone. He was down to a machete, 2 handguns and 2 bullets and 1 flash grenade, and Louis' BlackBerry phone. At 3:29 a.m., Deirdre called Benji and informed him that Louis was dead. Benji hoped for Castle to take more than 6 hours to track back to them. He hung up and texted Deirdre that he had an idea. Meanwhile, Cavalier also texted someone to grab Deirdre and start questioning her. At 3:33 a.m., a SWAT team gathered upon Castle. He had no arsenal to fight, so he ran into a subway station. He blinded them with his flash grenade and ran into the dark. At the same time, 2 men met Mayor Joe Corliss at his home. They said they understood that the mayor needed Castle dead for something he knew. They demanded more money to call in another killer gang of killers. At 3:46 a.m., Deirdre and Walter returned to their hotel, only to be ambushed by Cavalier's men. Walter was a soldier who was constantly in a state of mental fugue due to the torture he faced. He locked into his state of frenzy and brutally killed Cavalier's men with his bare hands. Then they went back to their rooms. At 3:48 a.m., Benji called upon someone and learned about the mayor spending a hell of a lot of money in order to kill Castle. Outside, Cavalier also received a call that someone had broken into his office. At 3:49 a.m., Castle went through all of Cavalier's files and found out that Louis and Cavalier had two common friends, Deirdre Guard and Benji Guard. At 3:58 a.m., Deirdre reminisced about her past. She remembered how she made her way up through councilmen and lawyers by throwing drug parties. On the other hand, her brother Benji had his own group created by hiring Merc and Armis. Both of them hooked up with Cavalier for immunity, and as muscle, they brought in Sergeant Walter. Together, they were the Dragon Kings. And then she came to her senses with a crashing sound. Castle had broken in through the window. Walter's fugue state kicked in, and he went straight for Castle. Live today, die tomorrow. At 4:14 a.m., Walter started assaulting Castle brutally. His gun fell down. While going through the savage beating, Castle understood that Walter was tortured by the Viet Cong. But he was weak from the toxin, so all he could do was take the beating. Deirdre stopped Walter and told Castle that she still had the antidote and Castle should hurry up in killing Cavalier. But Castle implied that he still didn't know what Cavalier had done. Deirdre didn't disclose that. Castle refuted her offer, so she told Walter to kill him. At 4:20 a.m., the Broad Street Killers gathered up to kill Castle. They were underage kids who had the need to prove themselves and had no background. At 4:24 a.m., Walter dragged Castle inside to kill him. Right then, Castle abused Walter in Vietnamese. Walter went into the fugue state and pissed himself. Castle hit him in his balls and slowly crawled out. He only had one knife now and no gun. At 4:26 a.m., Deirdre called up Benji and gave him the status. Benji told her to keep Castle's gun. Meanwhile, he called up a reporter and told her that the child slavery ring was run by Cavalier. He also told her to keep her cameraman ready. At 4:37 a.m., the killers attacked Castle on the streets. Castle tried to run, but they gathered up on him. He incapacitated them one by one, hurt them brutally, but didn't kill them, except for the collaterals. Castle punctured one lung of the last gang member and told him to tell the others not to follow him. At 4:45 a.m., Castle walked into a parking lot to hotwire a car, but Mikhail's cousin attacked him. They kept shooting rocket launchers at him. Castle was thrown back into the wall of a building, and he fell inside an old bar. There, he fainted. At 4:49 a.m., Deirdre and Walter went out for a ride. At 4:52 a.m., Castle came back to his senses. He saw that he was surrounded by the FBI. While they helped Castle up to his feet, the killers entered through another entrance, and Mikhail's cousin pointed his rocket launcher straight at Castle. No time to die. At 4:53 a.m., Castle pushed the feds out of the line of the rocket and saved them. He took a gun and killed all of Mikhail's cousin's gang from the window. The feds tried to stop him, but another rocket hit the floor and made it collapse, and all of them fell down. At 4:59 a.m., the killers kept overpowering the feds and killing them. Castle couldn't allow the slaughter of innocent men. He got them behind the bar and told them to throw Molotov cocktails at the killers. They threw them and burned most of the gang members. That gave them the window to escape to the SWAT van. At 5:20 a.m., the feds got Castle into their van and drove toward their headquarters. Castle had given up. He knew he would die on the way. However, Deirdre and Walter hit the SWAT van with theirs and then knocked the police out and took Castle. At 6:12 a.m., Castle regained his senses. Deirdre was sitting in front of him with the antidote. Her offer still stood. Castle could join them or die in the car. Castle closed his eyes and welcomed death. At 6:15 a.m., Deirdre injected the antidote into Castle's heart in spite of Walter shouting not to. Walter pulled out a gun on Deirdre, but Deirdre took out her gun and blew his brains out. At 6:20 a.m., Deirdre welcomed Castle to the land of the living. She told Castle that they'd be just like Punisher and Micro, a power couple. Castle's strength and her guidance will be a deadly combination. Then she tried to get into his pants, but before she could do it, Castle caught her neck between his legs and broke it. He was still in hell, and he had people to punish. At 6:40 a.m., Cavalier went into his office and found Benji waiting. He took out his gun and was about to kill Cavalier when Castle entered the room. He caught Benji's head from behind and broke his neck. At 6:45 a.m., Castle injected Cavalier and told him that it was a fast-acting poison. Cavalier had to hold a press conference and tell everything about the people whom he was protecting. After that, Castle would come back and give him the antidote. At 7:01 a.m., Cavalier did as Castle demanded. He spilled everything and got everyone arrested, including the mayor and his accomplices. Some other criminals at high places were raided and gunned down. At 7:35 a.m., Castle kept watch on Cavalier. He'd injected sugar water into Cavalier as he wanted him to go on trial and get punished for his crimes. Frank made up his mind that if Cavalier didn't die by the book, then he'd return to finish the job. One night in Philadelphia was enough for him. Act 13. Welcome to the Bayou, the Itch. Castle hauled a mysterious cargo in his car and drove from Houston to New Orleans through old shitty towns with little or no population. On the way, he came up with a car driven by spring breakers. They were enjoying themselves on the way. Normally, Castle wouldn't stop while he was running errands, but he had to use the restroom, so he pulled up at a shady gas station. The spring breakers had also stopped there. Entering the shop, Castle got a strong smell, as if something was rotting. Kyle, the other driver, tried to be friendly with Castle. When Castle caught the sight of the man at the counter, Roy, Castle could immediately figure him out as a pervert with the way he looked at the other girls. He saw skeletons of dead animals and eyeballs and rats in a jar. As he paid and got out, Kyle checked the tires. He saw Roy looking at the spring breakers from the window. Castle hit the road. He took a pause. He had some place to be, but he didn't see the spring breakers come his way. He had an itch at the base of his skull. He sat in the car and turned it around. Upon returning to the gas station, he found it closed. There wasn't a soul nearby. He went to the back door where he found a beautiful blonde girl. She was the little sister of the family. She acted as a very welcoming, open, and sexually titillating small-town girl, but Castle saw through her act. He could see that she was completely batshit crazy. Meanwhile, at the other end of the gas station, near the bayou, Roy had the spring breaker girls caged, and another towering man named Big Daddy hung Kyle upside down. When the girls asked why Kyle was strung up, Roy dropped dead rats into the water and summoned General Lee. General Lee jumped up. It was a 12-foot-long crocodile. It took a bite out of Kyle's body and chewed his head and hand up and went underwater. Seeing this, one of the captive girls puked. Big Daddy said that Cousin Ray would be cooking what was left of Kyle's body. Castle waited on the other end of the farm. Someone banged the trunk door from inside his car. He decided it was time to sedate his cargo again, but the itch was still there. The lookout. Castle drove his car out of the station and then he parked it nearby, out of sight. He took his gun and went back to the farm. When he peeked inside, he saw Roy had hung one of the girls from the ceiling by her hands, and the girl was pleading. As Roy touched the girl, he heard a faint noise. As he turned, Castle broke inside and snapped his neck and killed him. He cut down the girl and she told him that they took the other girl to the back porch. Suddenly, out of the blue, little sister attacked with an axe. Castle whacked her and she fell down. She tried to call for Big Daddy, but Castle covered her mouth with his steel grip. But when he peeked outside, he saw a horde of people walking toward him. Little sister told Castle that they were her cousins, brothers, and whole family. They were the Gautreaux, and they were about to kill Castle. Castle told the spring breaker girl to stand still and went out with little sister. He came out and threw her at her father. Then he took out his gun and started taking them out one by one. However, to his surprise, those people didn't run away from gunfire. In spite of dying, they kept moving forward and gathered up on Castle. Castle didn't stay down. He started hitting them and killing them with his bare hands. He killed all of those people and stood before Big Daddy. But just then, Big Daddy called for Earl. He came and hit Castle in the face. Castle fell down and stared at him. Earl was a big, bad man, far more powerful than Castle. Castle charged at him, but Earl punched him down. He beat Castle badly and incapacitated him with a kick. As Castle lay in his own blood, Big Daddy planned to feed him to the gators. But Earl had another plan. He wanted to throw a party with Castle as the main course. Meanwhile, the cargo broke out of Castle's trunk. It was a gangster named Nigel. He untied himself and found a gun in the car. Then he decided to kill the Punisher. The cargo. The Gautreaux strung up Castle while they cooked Kyle. They offered him a piece of Kyle, but Castle denied. Castle and the caged girls watched as the Gautreaux fed on the pieces of Kyle. Meanwhile, Nigel walked on the empty streets of the unknown land. He remembered how Castle kidnapped him, saying that someone in New Orleans wanted to see him. Castle came back to the gas station and drank a beer. But Earl walked up behind him and caught his neck. While making plans to eat him, Earl choked Nigel unconscious. Nigel woke up and found mayhem unleashing in front of his eyes. As their dinner party went on, Earl felt restless, so he jumped into the river and started fighting the crocodiles. He held General Lee by its jaws and broke them open, killing the biggest crocodile with his bare hands. As Nigel watched all of them start to dance around the fire like madmen, Earl untied one of the captive girls and took her to a shack and raped her. Nigel could hear her blood-curdling screams, but couldn't cover his ears as he was tied. When the rave faded, Nigel managed to cut loose his ties. He approached with his knife with the intent of stabbing Castle, but Castle managed to get his legs wrapped around him. Nigel had to cut him loose, or else Castle would have snapped his neck. Just then, out of nowhere, Earl appeared. Castle and Earl started throwing punches at each other. Earl jumped at Castle. Castle took a barbecue rod and held it in Earl's direction. It went straight through Earl's heart, killing him instantly. Nigel and Castle jumped into the swamp as the Gautreaux armed themselves. Big Daddy yelled for Junior and told him to give them hell. As Nigel and Castle moved forward, Junior waited for them on the other side. Jungle night. Castle and Nigel walked through the swamp, full of alligators and snakes. The Gautreaux followed them on boats. Going deeper into the swamp, Castle spotted a broken shack. They slowly went in. Inside, it was worse. It was a dumping ground for the clothes of all the people that the Gautreaux had killed. Bodies of big rats hung from above. Castle found himself a pair of pants and took a meat chopper to be used as a weapon. As Castle reflected that it was a bad idea to come into the shack, Junior looked at them from the outside. Nigel took a child's toy and looked at it when suddenly Junior broke through the window, aiming for him. Castle shouted at him to move and threw a lantern at Junior. Both Junior and his shack were on fire. Castle and Nigel jumped out into the swamp. Hearing the Gautreaux approach, Castle told Nigel to follow his lead or they'd die. Nigel blamed Castle for putting him in that situation. Castle said that Nigel's cousin Benny had some information that he needed, and Nigel owed him money. So that was just business. But now, it was survival. Nigel understood. They threw a poisonous snake at one of the boats. Everyone got scared and jumped out. Castle and Nigel hopped on. While Nigel wanted to leave immediately, Castle didn't. He had plans to kill them all. Meanwhile, Junior went into his burning shack and took out the soft toy and caressed it. Big Daddy and the others got on their boats and started circling the area. They found Castle's boat left in front of the jungle. They went in after them. As soon as they entered the woods, Nigel blew one of their heads off. Castle took out two of them with the chopper. They grabbed their shotguns and moved fast through the woods. Seeing an empty boat, Nigel made a run at it. Castle shouted not to go in the open. The Gautreaux, who were hiding in the woods, started firing. Castle took one of them out, and as Roy tried to flee, Castle threw his chopper at him and killed him instantly. He slapped the scattergun out of Big Daddy's hands, butted him, then shot him in the face and killed him. Nigel told Castle that they formed a good team, but Castle warned him to stay in his limits. And just then, Junior walked up behind Nigel. He grabbed Nigel by the neck. Castle jumped at him, but he whacked Castle away. Nigel kept shooting at Junior, but it didn't hurt him. Then Junior popped one of Nigel's eyes and threw him away like a puppet. Castle came up from behind. He unmasked Junior and slashed his throat. But somehow Junior was unfazed, as if he didn't feel any pain. He started moving toward Castle, but he was choking on his own blood. Before he could get his hands on Castle, he passed out and died. Nigel was still alive. He crawled back to Castle and said that he wanted to go home. Castle didn't stop him. He told him to return home. Castle came back to the shack behind the gas station and rescued the remaining girl. As they were walking out, little sister blocked their way. She jumped at Castle and tried to claw his face. Castle grabbed her by the neck and broke her neck and finished her. Then Castle and the girl walked their way toward freedom. Act 14. Tales of the Punisher. The Cell. From a cell in the heart of Rikers, 5 dangerous old men ran their prison. Most of the guards, honest or dishonest, were on their payroll, or didn't dare cross their path. They never left, as there was no need. They were George Apostolo, the man behind the man of 3 generations of Drago family, Enzo Gauci, soldier and gun runner for Drago, Paulie and Philly, psychotic Germain twins, and Francesco Drago himself, head capo. Castle wanted them together, and he knew where to strike. Castle got himself arrested and was brought to Rikers. As he walked, Chief Guard and a sadist, Leonard told him that his chances were low. Castle would die in there, especially in the hands of Squeaky Pete, who would rape him to death. Castle punched a guard and took his baton. Then he broke the skull of Squeaky Pete and broke the baton on his neck. Then he told the police to send the next most dangerous. Later, Drago ordered the police to keep Castle locked up while they devised a plan to kill him. Later, Leonard met Castle in solitary, but before he could do his usual threatening, Castle punched him through the window and took his badge. Castle had known everything about the prison from Danny Welsh and then killed him. He knew everyone there, and also the power dynamics. At night, the Germain twins came to kill Castle. They stabbed the man in his bed. Castle had already killed his cellmate and exchanged his bed, so they stabbed a dead man. Getting the chance, Castle got out of his cell. He castrated one of the neo-Nazi gang members and killed another. Then he planted Leonard's badge on his body. The other Nazis raped Leonard as revenge. Castle was beaten up again and put in solitary. Meanwhile, the old men had planned to create a prison riot and have Castle kill. Leonard went to Castle's cell to taunt him. However, Castle beat him senseless and then wore his uniform. He killed a guard and took his gun. He directed the crazy inmates toward Leonard. The old men came out to kill Castle, but Castle killed a man in front of them who warned them to return to their cell, and so they did. Inside, they decided on who was to go out and confront the Punisher. They shared each other's sins and guilt to each other, and in the process fell into a quarrel. Finally, Drago shouted at Castle and asked him if it was his vendetta that made him kill. Castle answered that it was honor. Then he shot them in their legs and incapacitated them. Castle revealed how each of them had betrayed Drago and were responsible for the shooting at the park that killed Castle's family, only they couldn't make the connection. He killed Gauci at first, who had shot his daughter and wife. Then he killed the Germain twins, who were Drago's bodyguards that day. Drago killed Apostolo for betraying him, but Apostolo clawed his eyes out. As Drago lay dying at his feet, Castle sat in his chair and waited for the riot to end. The Tiger. As Castle waited on a roof with a gun to kill someone, he thought about his past and the rumors about his origin, and he remembered when he was 10 years old. He saw a burning man outside Brooklyn Navy Yard. Later, his father talked to his mother about how it was an accident. He didn't approve of young Frank attending poetry class, but that gave him some alone time with his wife. Castle had a friend, Lauren Bavoli, who introduced him to his elder brother, Private Sal Bavoli. Sal was very friendly to Castle. He talked to him about guns and then gave him money to buy his sister milkshakes. In his class, Castle was predominantly fond of William Blake's The Tiger. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? To Castle, a tiger was a force made into flesh. It was hard for him to imagine whether the same God who created a tiger had created the sheep. While returning from the poetry class, Lauren's friend Sue committed suicide in front of her. Word was out that she got pregnant with Vincent Rosa, and the Rosas were a highly connected family. Castle once saw Vincent waving and smiling at Lauren too. Then one day, Lauren suddenly started crying in class. She ran back home and Castle followed her, but he didn't reach in time. Lauren had slit her wrists, and she died. Castle later overheard his mum and dad and learned that Vincent had forced himself on all the girls, including Lauren, that made them commit suicide. Castle's father was so scared that he couldn't take any action against the Rosas. Castle took out his father's gun and went to kill Vincent. But while he followed, Sal appeared and broke Vincent's face. Then he dragged Vincent to the cemetery, pushed him into an open grave, and burned him alive. That was the time Castle first saw a human version of the tiger. Later, during the war, he saw Sal for just once. Then he saw his dead body when Sal was killed in action. He later witnessed a tiger in the jungle and knew what he had to become. That night, on the rooftop, he shot and killed all of the Rosa family. He was ready to give the world something they'd never seen before: a tiger. Force of nature. Castle harpooned a man through his ribs and dragged him on a speedboat to the shore. Earlier, Castle had worked his way up to Dwight Carter, a mobbed-up money man, helping Russians in slave trade. Jackie Lutz, a pimp, and Ian Resnick, a drug dealer, to get the man he was dragging. He had to kill a whole lot of people in order to get to them. At first, he put a fire in their ship and sank it, so they had to leave in a lifeboat. Castle had destroyed their GPS so that they couldn't call for help. From the lifeboat, they slowly dumped everything to make space. They took promethazine to control seasickness. Then, at night, they fired the flares, but those didn't fly high. Castle had rigged them too. Jackie kept puking as the others tried to calm him down. At 14 hours, a storm started. At 23 hours, the sun came up. They were still in the lifeboat. Seagulls started circling them. Lutz opened his lunchbox, but it was empty. They started quarreling and blaming each other. At 36 hours, paranoia hit them. They talked about their crimes, and Carter blamed Lutz for selling them out. They started fighting with a roast stick, and Lutz died in the banter. They disposed of his body. At 40 hours, Carter told Resnick which contact to go to if he didn't make it. However, Resnick tried to kill him with a flare gun. When he failed, Carter killed him with a roast stick. In the final hour, Castle harpooned Carter and dragged him to the shore, but his boat crashed into a baby whale. In the water, Carter tried to strangle Castle, but Castle pulled out the harpoon and killed him. At the shore, people gathered to see the whale corpse. While they cursed the whale killer, Castle sat in his van with Carter's head in a box. Naked kill. Castle followed leads to a torture porn ring and killed everyone at a joint. He scared the last one, Dennis Dirtbox Tafoya, into divulging the contacts of the men who made them. Those people worked at Daedalus Tower and had huge ties to the government. He told him on which floor and also the timings the contests are held for showgirls, after which they had to star in sex videos with 11-3, the main star abuser and torturer. Castle took Dirtbox to Daedalus Tower, made him swallow a slow poison, telling him to help Castle enter, or else he wouldn't get the antidote. While they entered, the owner of the tower, Mickey Fane, gave a tour to the guests, telling them that anyone who wasn't cleared by security had to die. They cleared security as janitors and Castle took one of the guards' identity cards. They armed themselves with mopping sticks, as no weapons or metal was allowed in the building. At the office, the head dominatrix, Polly Who, presented a young virgin girl to Mickey. Below, Castle strangled one of the guards and killed another with a glass. As the young girl was presented in front of 11-3 by the dominatrix, Castle left a trail of blood and bodies working his way up to them. He killed the guards with pencils and beat them to death with rolled newspapers. Then he entered the ammunition room and put a shotgun to Dirtbox's mouth and killed him. As the live screening of the torture porn started, Castle entered, guns blazing. After finishing the entire crowd, he shot 11-3 in the knees. The showgirls there beat 11-3 and killed him with their bare hands. Then he shot the dominatrix and killed her. Everyone was dead. Also, firearms were used, so the failsafe was about to arrive in 1 minute. But Castle had a plan. He used handcuffs and made a chain of human bodies hanging out from the 8th floor to the ground. All of the showgirls climbed down. On the way below, one of them found the dominatrix alive and killed her. Below, the girls embraced Castle. Castle took his time to get them to the hospital and promised the nurse that whoever gave pain to the girls was going to die. As Mickey stood in his room mourning Polly, Castle used the coveted identity card to enter the Daedalus building and kill him. Christmas special. On Christmas Eve, a priest walked into a bar. After having a drink, he started cursing everyone around, highlighting the decadence of the society. A person in Santa Claus garb watched. The mob sitting there threw the priest out. They raised a toast in the name of Johnny Castellano, whose wife was about to have a baby. The person dressed as Santa Claus was Castle. He took his guns out and killed all of them. Meanwhile, a group of mercenaries attacked a maternity hospital and killed all the newborn babies there on the orders of Don Maranzano. However, on their way out, they found that Castellano had just entered with his pregnant wife. Right when they were about to shoot, Castle shot them both. As other mercenaries arrived, Castle helped Castellano and his wife escape. Maranzano wasn't happy. He killed one of the hired mercs and then hired 3 new assassins to do the job instead. He also declared a bounty of $1 million to kill Castellano's baby, an offer that attracted other street-level killers too. Castle took them to a stable and told them to hold on. As he left, Castellano called his men and gave them his location, but his men were already killed by the Assassins 3. Castle came back with a medical kit and got ready to deliver the baby. 2 street thugs had arrived there, but one was gunned down by the assassin. Castle hid in the dark as one of the Assassins 3 entered. He stabbed one in the neck and killed him. As the second one entered, a horse kicked him. Castle finished the job with 1 bullet. The last one was about to shoot Castellano's wife, but Castle broke his neck from behind. Castle helped Castellano's wife to deliver the baby. The baby was in the wrong position and Castle tried turning it. The final thug appeared from behind and was about to shoot Castle, but Castellano's wife shot him instead, pleaded with Castle to save the baby. Finally, the baby came. It was a boy. Castellano offered Castle anything he wished for. Castle said he only wished for one thing, and blew Castellano's brains out. Castellano's wife was shocked. She requested Castle to give back her baby. Castle looked at her and said that wasn't the first night she'd killed someone. She'd once killed a boy by cutting off his penis and stuffing it in his mouth. The wife screamed and requested Castle to tell her what her son looked like. Castle answered that he looked like they always do, innocent. Then he shot and killed the wife. Castle left the baby at the doorstep of a church. The disgruntled priest from before opened the door and found the baby and a note asking him to give the child something to believe in. Content, the priest took the baby in, and Castle continued his bloody war on crime. Butterfly. In the beginning, a few killers went into a book printing press and killed the owner, Elliot Gates, in search of a book. Elliot had been the contact person for assassins for hire, especially Butterfly, and he was printing a book in her namesake based on her killings. Butterfly was in love with Celeste, and both of them planned to go on a vacation together. She'd armed herself to the teeth, just in case. She remembered her father, who used to abuse her sexually when she was in her teens. On the train, she thought she saw a large man's shadow. Frightened, she moved with a gun to the other compartment, where she hallucinated the corpse of Elliot speaking to her about chapter 13 of the book. When she came back to her compartment, she found Celeste had been killed with a knife to the heart. She remembered killing her father when he had killed her goldfish. Sitting at her father's funeral, she thought she had a glimpse of the large man, of the Punisher. Fleeing to Mexico, Butterfly took time to finish her book. She hallucinated Elliot's ghost accompanying her in her writing. She was working on chapter 13. It was about the night she was sent to kill Don Massimo and his family, but instead the Punisher killed them all. Right then, 2 assassins put a plastic bag on her face. Butterfly remembered how she was taught to orgasm through choking by his partner Trevor, whom she had to kill as he wouldn't stop strangling her. In the next instant, Butterfly killed those 2 assassins brutally. Butterfly remembered how she'd pleaded with her boss Mort to let her express her thoughts via a book, but Mort had burned it, saying if she disclosed what she did, it had put her and her family in danger. But she completed her book in the end, and when Elliot's ghost suggested, she sent the book out to as many reporters and columnists as she could. Castle walked up behind her while she drank and told her that a lot of people had died because of her. She reached for her gun, but Castle shot her in the eye and killed her. Happy ending. Joseph and his wife Jenny had an argument. Joseph walked out of the house at night. Just for that night, he wished to be unfaithful and went to a massage parlor named Happy Ending. As he entered, a girl named Gigi suddenly jumped on him and told him to kiss her. Seeing that, mob boss Luigi Bassi became angry. He had business with Gigi regarding some disc. Suddenly, Castle appeared out of nowhere and started shooting. A massive gunfight ensued. Joseph and Gigi escaped in a taxi, but Bassi's man followed them. Bassi's man crashed their taxi and went for Gigi, but he collided with an upcoming truck and died. Gigi hotwired a car and took Joseph to her apartment. Then she asked him to bring a disc from the lingerie drawer in her apartment. That disc had incriminating evidence against Bassi. As Joseph entered and went through Gigi's stuff, another one of Bassi's men ambushed him. He hit Joseph and asked him for the disc. Gigi incapacitated the man from behind and then fled with Joseph. Later, Castle arrived at Gigi's apartment. He found Joseph's office address in his wallet and told the henchman to make a call to Bassi and send him to Joseph's office. At Joseph's office, Gigi put Joseph at gunpoint and asked for all his money. She wanted to sell the disc to the highest bidder. She was going to shoot Joseph, but Bassi and his men arrived and they started shooting. Gigi caught a bullet in her hand, but Joseph caught her gun and suddenly started shooting back. He told Gigi to leave and kept shooting at the thug, saying that it was the best thing to ever happen to him. Gigi crossed Castle outside, and he stopped her. Inside, Joseph caught a bullet and was about to be killed when Castle stormed in and killed everyone, including Bessie. He advised Joseph to stick to his own world. Joseph came home, kissed his wife, and left home. He'd finally found his happy ending. Hot Rods of Death. The story began with a death race, Punisher against the Marauders. He killed 2 of them, as he promised to his fellow Marine, Billy. 3 days ago, he'd met Mad Billy Finn, who once served with him. Billy talked about a town where 17 of them lived. It didn't have any connections or Wi-Fi. It was in the desert, out of nowhere. But it was peaceful, like the jungle. The Loong brothers had found uranium on land and wanted to covet it. When the lawyers failed, the Loong sent Pike's road gang named Marauders to evacuate the families. Billy wanted Castle's help to fight them, so they set forth on their journey. They were ambushed by landmines on the way, which killed Billy. Pike had Castle nailed to the ground as he planned for the desert to finish him off. Then he wanted to sell Castle's body to the highest bidder. Castle told Pike to kill himself, or else he was going to give him the most painful death. The Marauders left. The townsfolk retrieved Castle from the desert. He talked to all of them and requested to help him fight off the Marauders. They planned together and armed themselves in all ways possible. Next morning, the Marauders arrived. The first biker to enter their limits was beheaded by a razor wire. All the townsfolk threw Molotov cocktails from roofs and doused most of them on fire. Afraid for his life, Pike retreated with the Marauders. One of the cars was doused on fire inside grass fields, and the other was smashed by a grass cutter. Castle used his own car to butt Pike's car and throw him off the ground. Then he retrieved Pike himself. Later that day, the Loong brothers arrived, but they were shot with uranium pellets and told to leave by the people. The town was theirs. In the end, Pike lay tied at his feet. Castle bid goodbye to Tess and told her that he was going to honor his bond with Billy, even in death, because they fought together. As Castle started his bike and rode to the setting sun, it was revealed that the rope tying Pike's feet had its other end tied to Castle's bike. He literally dragged Pike to his death on the highway. Tiny, ugly wow. Bobby Borstein hauled the bullet-riddled but still breathing Anthony Marano back to his apartment and dumped him in the bathtub after Castle shut off his genitals and left him for dead. Borstein saved Marano's life, but only to question him about why Castle wanted him dead. Marano, in a desperate bid for mercy, revealed the location of a mob meeting he shared with the Punisher. Unfazed, Borstein dissected Marano and stored the pieces in jars. His thoughts drifted to the woman from his DMV job, imagining her in the tub, but he hesitated, realizing she was too healthy and would likely resist. Determined, he drove to the site where Castle planned to ambush the mobsters, hoping Castle would leave one alive for him to practice his butchery. Borstein hid in a dumpster, waiting for Castle to strike. As the massacre unfolded, he feared Castle might not leave anyone alive. Desperate, he confronted the Punisher. Castle, thinking Borstein was a madman, told him to get to a hospital. But when Borstein inadvertently revealed his twisted plans for the girl, Castle made a swift decision. With cold precision, Castle ended Borstein's life with a single shot to the head. Dolls. It was snowing. Castle stood below an apartment and took a careful aim at Maxwell Hawthorne while he celebrated his birthday party with his wife. He was a harbor master and a syndicate bagman, smuggling illegal immigrant sex workers through docks. Many girls had died in the containers during the transport. Maxwell just disposed of their bodies into the sea. Castle was doing a favor to society. Right when he was about to pull the trigger, a little girl walked up behind him and asked him if he could help find her father. Castle immediately shifted his attention to her. He promised to help her, then took her by the hand and went looking. The girl said that her name was Becky, and her father went to buy a cake and she got lost in the crowd. Castle also put her up on his shoulders as she laughed. All the while, he kept looking at Maxwell. If he didn't kill him, he'd go out for 6 weeks on a cruise. When Becky requested, Castle even got her a Sally Stylish doll. Becky kissed Castle on the cheeks and said thanks. As Castle turned to look at Max, Becky's father ran and embraced her. He thanked Castle and said that he just looked away for a second and she was gone. Becky threw away the doll that Castle had got her and instead took the same doll her daddy brought. Castle told Becky's dad to turn around and stand still. He recognized Castle and thought he was going to kill him for cheating taxes, but Castle used his shoulder as support and blew Maxwell's brains out. As her father held Becky tight, Castle told him to never look away, not even for a second. Castle walked away into the breezy night while the doll lay on the road. Gateway. Gateway, the middleman, never got his hands dirty. His work was to take photographs from clients and hand them over to the hitters. He had a beautiful family and a family life. He once delivered a photo from Tommy Drago to Enzo Gauci. He was paid handsomely for his service and then again, no dirty hands. He delivered the photo as told. Then, the park shooting happened and the Castle family were killed. An envelope was found at the scene. Upon doing the prints, they knew it was Gateway who was the middleman. Castle's friend gave it to him. In the lonely rooms, Castle contemplated what to do next. He looked into Gateway's details. Then he went and blew Gateway's head with a shotgun while Gateway was having a peaceful breakfast. It was his first kill. Ghouls. Sergeant Hickey auctioned off the bloodstained shirt of Castle's son to online people known as ghouls. He got a contact that someone was selling the bloodstained basket from that park shooting, so he went to meet him. But it turned out to be Castle himself. But Castle didn't kill him. He knew that Hickey had bagged evidence from the park shooting and he was one of the investigating officers. He cut off one of his fingers and then told him to buy back everything he'd ever sold that was related to the Castle family, and then burn all of them. If Hickey didn't do as he was told, Castle would come back for his arm. Castle gave him a bag full of cash to buy back the items. Later, Hickey sat alone at the auction site and kept buying all the sold-out evidence, afraid that the Punisher might return. Father's Day. A little girl spoke about how her father was caring and strong and took care of her and her family, how he was caring and funny. She talked about how she was going to take care of her father when she grew up. All the while, Castle's past life kept reiterating in front of his eyes. His previous wounds and the adversaries he'd faced, and those events walked their way back right to that day in the park when the shooting happened. As Castle lay blooded amidst his family, a letter flutters in front of him. That letter was written by his little girl, which had her daughter's thoughts. The thoughts spoken by the little girl when the story started. Those were the thoughts of Castle's daughter on Father's Day. Smallest bit of this. As Castle fought a deadly fight, he remembered his old life and the time that he spent with his family at the park. As he killed people with bombs, guns and knives, he remembered how that day had formed a memory, and from a memory it changed into a dream. Whenever Castle closed his eyes, he saw that dream, a dream that would never happen in reality. Castle was the protector of that dream. He had to keep it somewhere safe and wake up and then fight in order to protect it. He had to live for it. He had to die for it without faltering. Jimmy's collision. While Castle killed a handful of henchmen, Jimmy Frisco hid in a corner and smiled as his luck was turning. He remembered what happened 3 days ago. Jimmy had always been a gambler, wasting money on horse races. He'd swamped himself into a big debt. He owed gangster Shelley 12 grand. Shelley's henchmen threatened to kill his family unless he killed a jockey named Eddie Monty by midnight the next day. He came home and even his wife understood what a lowlife he was. He contemplated suicide, but then he decided to go ahead with the kill. He left the next day and kept watch on Monty at the race. He tried hitting him at the exit point, but there were other jockeys. He followed him home and ultimately blew his brains out. But while fleeing, he crashed into another car. Seeing that the other driver was okay, Jimmy got out of there and fixed and recolored his car at his body shop. At home, he made up with his wife and watched news about Eddie Monty's death. But the news said nothing about the other driver seeing his car. So next morning he tracked down the other driver, an old man whose wife was also with him. Then he sneaked behind them and put 4 bullets in their head. Then he threw the gun in the sea. Then on, he led a happy life. He even won money in the racing track. But Shelley's men came back saying Jimmy had killed 2 other people with the same gun, and they had to kill Jimmy to cut that loose end. Castle entered and killed them. He asked Jimmy about Shelley, who was Castle's main target. Jimmy told Castle he'd help. He called up Shelley and told him that he was going for a confession. Shelley stopped him over the phone and said that he'd meet him in person. As Jimmy remembered everything that had transpired before, he watched Castle kill Shelley and his men. Then Castle came back to him and told him that his car was red the other night and there had been an accident near Monty's killing. As Castle connected the dots, Jimmy understood that his luck had run out. He'd reached his gambler's ruin. Castle riddled Jimmy with bullets and walked away slowly. Justice was served. Where the devil don't stay. A family of rednecks had finally caught the feared Punisher when he tried to kill them for running smack and killing people under the orders of their boss, Memphis. They had drugged and hung him upside down in the barn. Their Uncle Carl had died in the process. Gary brought his Uncle Dorsey back to his senses and assured them that they'd got the Punisher. Dorsey screamed at them to kill him outright, but Gary and his 2 other cousins stopped Dorsey. As their business had been hit and suffered a loss, he wanted to cash in by selling the formidable Punisher to Memphis. Randy, another cousin, a frail and weak man, walked in and told them that Punisher should be killed, or else he'd kill them all. Gary beat him bloody and threw him out of the house. Randy went to the barn with a shotgun to kill the Punisher. While inside, Dorsey armed up to kill him too. However, Gary and his cousins teamed up and killed Dorsey. Then they entered the barn only to find that Randy had freed the Punisher. While they quarreled amongst themselves, Gary told his other 2 cousins to tie up the dangerous Punisher. Right then, Castle came back to his senses. He shot and killed both the cousins. Then he fell down again. Gary shouted at Randy to help him take the valuable Punisher to Memphis. As he entered, Randy cocked his gun behind him. They shot each other. As dawn came, Castle regained his senses. Randy was dead, and Gary lay, bleeding. Castle walked toward the door when Randy cocked his gun. He said that he couldn't let Castle leave. All that killing had to mean something. Castle didn't say anything. He blew Randy's brains out and left. It only meant war for him. The ribbon. Mel saw a girl every day while returning from the office. Every evening, she waited for the bus in a white bathing suit. Mel didn't know who she was, but he became obsessed with her. He waited hours on the days that she was late just to see a glimpse of her. He couldn't understand the reason for his obsession. He thought it was the ribbon tying her hair that made him stalk her. One evening, he found courage and boarded the same bus as her. He started talking to her. She smiled and nodded. Then she got down in the middle of nowhere and told Mel that she was older than he thought. Mel thought that as consent from her end and also got down. They walked through the avenue and came to an old lake. Mel remembered how his dad had taught him to fish in that lake 20 years ago. As the girl got down in the lake and welcomed Mel in, Mel remembered what happened when he was 19. Something that he'd made himself forget. Mel had a summer girlfriend, Marla. They were going around and their favorite spot was the lake. Marla had to babysit her little sister while her father worked graveyard shift. 2 days before school resumed, they had their last swim. There, Marla disclosed that she was pregnant. She asked him if he was happy. Mel was scared, but something came over him. He tried to strangle Marla. She hit her head and started bleeding. Then he pushed her into the water and held her there until she died and her body sunk deeper. Everyone thought it was a sex maniac in the woods. Dismissing the memory as a bad dream, Mel opened his dress and went into the water with the girl. Then Castle appeared behind him. He hit Mel and then held him underwater till he ran out of breath. The girl who brought Mel there was Marla's sister, who had grown up and read Marla's diary. She'd brought Castle there to punish Mel. As Mel died, he realized that Marla's sister had brought him back to his redemption, which he'd always waited for. Manhunt. Castle was having a peaceful meal at a Chinese restaurant when suddenly a Chinese man requested to see him. He said his name was Wang. He told Castle that his daughter was taken and sold as a sex slave, then killed. He wanted Castle to punish the men responsible. He thought Castle would understand as he too had a daughter once. He gave Castle the name of Arnold Lewis. At San Diego Marina, Castle entered Arnold's boat. He tortured him with a meat hook and learned that he worked for the Mexican mob, run by Hector Rizzo. Then Castle threw Arnold into the shark-infested waters. At Los Angeles, he sabotaged a car that was going to Hector's house and killed both the men who were there. Then, once he reached Hector's location, he started a gunfight, killing everyone in his way. Rizzo was taken to the safe room, but Castle made his own way there by killing anyone who stood between. Upon reaching the safe room, he entered with a grenade and the Chinese girl's photograph. He told Rizzo's henchman to not shoot, or else he dropped the grenade. He asked Rizzo if he remembered the girl. Rizzo did not. Castle threw the grenade and covered Rizzo up behind a sofa. The blast killed everyone but Castle, and Rizzo survived. Castle started beating Rizzo and telling him about the families he destroyed. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, Wang appeared from behind and shot Castle. It was revealed that Wang was actually Zhang, who had used Castle to get to Rizzo. He'd come from Beijing to kill Rizzo, as he wouldn't give them the South American territories. But before Zhang could pull the trigger, Castle blew his fingers off. Then he killed Rizzo. Zhang called Castle a hypocrite. Castle demanded Zhang to give him the lead to his organization. He said that he didn't go easy on men who used their family to get something done. Then he held a knife to Zhang's throat. Later, when the police arrived, they found Zhang's corpse tied to a chair and his alleged daughter's photograph pinned to his chest. A little about revenge. A boy requested his cop father to teach him how to fight so that he could get revenge on the bully that hit him. The father said he knew his fair share about taking revenge. When he was a kid, his father was killed. That drove his mother to become an alcoholic and him to take on the responsibility of his family into his teens. He could barely manage life. He'd planned to take revenge on the man who had killed his dad. He brought some flowers and a crutch. He went to the cemetery and stood in front of a grave near the Castle family grave. He stood there for a long time until Castle appeared there. While he was leaving, Castle offered him a ride home. He offered Castle macaroni and cheese. When he got down from Castle's van, he fell down. Castle helped him to his room and took his offer of macaroni and cheese. He'd hidden a gun inside the freezer. Castle asked him about the grave and he said that his father was killed. His father was an accountant who worked for Corey Rollins, the drug lord. Even though he was a good man, he had to die because the Punisher had entered their office and killed everyone, including his father. He pointed the gun at Castle and told him that he held Castle responsible for ruining his life. Castle said that the boy's father had helped in keeping the drug business running and was equally a criminal as Corey. The boy pulled the trigger, but there were no bullets. Castle knew that he was being followed by the boy, and while he was at the cemetery, Castle had emptied his gun. Castle said that if the boy had killed him that day, he'd become exactly like Castle, and his thirst for killing will never stop. He had to start living his life. That was revenge enough. Saying this, Castle left, never to be seen again. After he completed his childhood story, the cop said to his son that he wouldn't teach him to fight, or else it would become his nature to keep fighting. He said the same thing that Castle once told him. Go live a life. That's all. Act 15. Kingpin. The myth. Castle was torturing one of Don Rigoletto's men as he questioned him about the recent happenings in the crime families. He told the captive that he would use the gun if he answered quickly, or else he'd use blades and hacksaws. The thug said that Don Rigoletto and his men were trying to do something new. Something about a kingpin. Castle said that Kingpin was a myth. Castle told him to hold on, and then started sawing his leg off. Meanwhile, at Rigoletto's meeting, they discussed the Punisher. Rigoletto said that he'd arranged for a plan to take him down. However, it would take time. It was Operation Kingpin. Just then, a younger boss, Joe D'Amico, said to Don's face that he didn't like the plan. He started disrespecting the Don and implied that the Punisher would eat them up. The Don introduced him to his towering bodyguard, Wilson Fisk from Hell's Kitchen. Joey tried to punch Fisk, but he banged his head on the wall and then pressed his head with such strength that Joey's eyes popped out. Joey was taken out while the other bosses discussed the Kingpin. Joey's associates were going to finish him, but Castle finished them off. Earlier, Castle had learned of the meeting's location from the man he tortured before he put a bullet in one of his eyes. Joey managed to take his eyes and push them back in their sockets, but all he could see was the gun barrel that Castle pointed right at him. Castle killed him and then attacked the others. Fisk made a way out by crashing through the back wall and got all the bosses out while Castle took out their men. Fisk had the chance to shoot Castle from behind, but he didn't. Fisk then got home and spent some good time with his wife and son, Richard. His wife reminded him that he was not just brawn. The whole Kingpin idea was his, and he should have got the credit. Right then, Rigoletto called and gave Fisk's Operation Kingpin a go green. The legend. As Fisk made love to his wife, he remembered how his dad killed his dog when he was just 8. He threw it out of the window, from where his mother jumped and killed herself. Then he'd beaten Fisk up. That was the last day Fisk knew fear. Fisk got out of his house with the best wishes of his family. He was out there to make Kingpin a reality. As he remembered how he drugged his father and left him to be eaten by rats, he bought an office space. Then he went ahead and paid sex workers to be the personal escorts of the Kingpin. Castle learned from the sex workers that someone big was coming to town. Fisk hired men and paid them to keep their mouths shut. They went ahead spreading the word that Kingpin was coming. Fisk remembered how inside Jail Cell C, people used to call him the Kingpin, and that pissed Big Lucky off. Lucky and his men raped Fisk in the jail. When Fisk got out, he had Lucky's wife repeatedly raped by homeless people and then killed her. He took photos and sent them to Lucky. Lucky broke out of prison to come home and find Fisk waiting. The things that Fisk did to him that night were still spoken of in whispers. Fisk killed the sex workers. They'd done their job spreading the word about Kingpin. Fisk remembered how he killed his own co-workers and got into Rigoletto's payroll. He was the cleanup person, but he intended to use Rigoletto as a tool. He went to an underground hacker, threatened him about his family, and had him create an entire identity and footprint of Kingpin, the richest crime lord in the whole world. Meanwhile, Castle interrogated another boss in a bar and learned of how Kingpin owned all the men who Castle had killed till date, and he was coming to town to consolidate the power among the 5 remaining crime families and deal with the Punisher. Fisk shot the hacker, Castle shot the boss. Fisk came back to his happy family. Castle drew the name of Kingpin high up in his kill board. The expansion. The Mennonite grappled with his life as his wife Mary suffered from an illness that rendered her unresponsive. He didn't have the money to take her to the doctors. Meanwhile, his 2 sons discovered his hidden stash that he once used to assassinate people. He scolded them away and reburied his stash. Fisk went to a Russian mob boss and handed him his sister's rapist. He said it was a gift from the Kingpin to make sure they didn't disturb his operations anyhow. There, Vanessa called him up and told him that Mama Cesare might have figured out Fisk's agenda, so Fisk might have to kill her. Castle worked his way up the food chain and went to interrogate Mama Cesare. However, Fisk was already there. Mama told Fisk that she knew that Fisk was using Rigoletto. She asked Fisk to let her put a garb on and then kill her. Fisk permitted, but then she came out of the closet with a shotgun and fired at him. Meanwhile, Castle also made his entry. Mama fired at him too. But before Castle could finish her, Fisk shot her from behind and killed her. Then Fisk shifted his focus on Castle. They kept shooting at each other until Fisk ran out of bullets. Fisk then tore through the wall separating them and bulldozed Castle and took him down a flight of stairs. He threw Castle out of a door where Mama's men found him. Castle had to kill his way out of there while Fisk escaped. That night, Rigoletto called up Fisk. He wasn't happy about what had happened. Everyone thought that Castle killed Mama Cesare. The crime fund was drying up, but Fisk was calm. Instead of getting rattled, he made love to Vanessa. The Mennonite received a call from Rigoletto as he prayed beside his wife. Then he dug up his weapons. He had to go kill the Punisher. The assassin. The Mennonite arrived at New York in a cart and met Rigoletto. Rigoletto gave him guns to kill the Punisher, but the Mennonite said that his religion didn't allow the use of guns, so he'd use his own tools. After Mennonite left, Don Marzano called Rigoletto to know about the Kingpin situation. Fisk was sending his wife and kid away, as Rigoletto was going to be looking for him, but Castle called him from outside. He told Fisk that he knew about his family, so he should come out and settle it with Castle. However, Fisk knew what waited for Castle outside. Suddenly, Mennonite attacked. He put a hammer into Castle's chest while Castle shot him in the leg. He then shattered Castle's fingers with the hammer. Then he broke Castle's hand. Castle switched out his shoe knife and hit Mennonite in the leg and then between his legs. He started bleeding profusely. He then hit him in the face and tasered him, but Mennonite was unstoppable. He hammered Castle's face and tried to leave. Castle gathered a chain and wrapped it around his wrist and punched Mennonite. In that window, Fisk helped Vanessa and Richard leave. and then Fisk called his associates and ordered them to carry out the action as planned. His associates killed all the crime family heads: Don Alfano, Don Garofano, Don Labruzzo, and Don Tartamea. Meanwhile, Rigoletto got a call from his associate Jackie, who informed him that all the money that was given to Fisk for the operation was wired to the account of Kingpin. Whoever the Kingpin was, he was the richest boss now. Meanwhile, Fisk had turned up on his doorstep. In the alley, Mennonite whistled, and his horses rode over Castle, seriously injuring him. He had no strength to run. Mennonite walked toward him with an axe. Meanwhile, Fisk's men killed Jackie. Fisk himself finished all of Rigoletto's men and entered Rigoletto's office with a smile and a blood-soaked knife. The Kingpin. Rigoletto had escaped before Fisk could get him. He got back to the motel where Vanessa and Richard were holed up. However, Rigoletto and his men had already been there. They cuffed Vanessa, and Rigoletto himself held a knife to Richard's throat. Rigoletto told Fisk to drop the gun, but Fisk kept looking at him with cold, dead eyes. Meanwhile, Mennonite followed Castle on his haut cart to one of his safe houses. He stealthily got inside. Suddenly, there was a blast. The horses took most of it, and the Mennonite was injured too, but he still stood up. He screamed at Castle and took him down a flight of stairs. He kept choking Castle, and Castle couldn't loosen his grip. Meanwhile, at the motel, Fisk stood in front of Rigoletto. He thought in his mind that he would do anything to protect his child. But then, he did the unthinkable. He told Richard to look at him and said that he was sorry. Then he shot Rigoletto's henchman. Rigoletto, angered, slashed Richard's throat. At the safe house, Mennonite and Castle fought. Mennonite had already overpowered Castle and went to take a gun from his shelves in order to finish him off. But as he touched a gun, 20,000 volts of electricity passed through him. Castle got up slowly, in pain. He moved toward the safe where he kept all his family belongings. Mennonite whispered to his wife that he was sorry. Castle pushed the safe off the table and dropped it on Mennonite's head, bashing his head in. At the motel, Fisk killed off Rigoletto as Vanessa screamed for Richard. Richard's lifeless body lay at their feet. Fisk held Vanessa and assured her that they'll have another child. Mennonite's kids assured their mother that their father won't let them down. Punisher passed out beside Mennonite's lifeless body. Later, Fisk rose to power as the unchallenged Kingpin of New York. Vanessa became an alcoholic as she couldn't cope with Richard's death. Fisk realized that he'd been lying to himself. All that he did till date was not for Richard, but for himself. He cancelled all meetings that day, but someone arrived at his doorstep. He was supposed to be the miracle worker that Rigoletto had hired to kill the Punisher. When asked, he disclosed his name as Bullseye. At 16, Bullseye, miracle worker. 2 months ago, Bullseye was hired to kill a man named Mr. Lawrence. Lawrence holed himself up in his penthouse and didn't come out for a year. That's when Bullseye appeared at his doorstep. The bodyguard strip-searched him and brought him in. Bullseye offered Lawrence a deal. If Lawrence paid Bullseye a lot of money, then he dropped the contract. The Bullseye said he wanted to use the men's room. The guard stood before him while he went. Then, while cleaning himself up, he took out a small pistol, which he'd hid inside himself. He killed all the guards, then met Lawrence and told him that once he took a contract, he made sure that he completed it. Then he killed Lawrence and severed his head to take back as evidence. That was when he received the hit for Castle. Then Bullseye met Fisk and asked him to pick up the contract for Castle. He described himself as a madman who once tracked an Eskimo 200 miles over the Arctic tundra and killed him with an icicle, just for fun. He said that he was tracking Fisk and he was ready to pick up the job. Fisk hired him immediately and told him to kill Castle. Castle went to Dr. Bayer to be treated for the wounds inflicted on him by the Mennonite. The doctor told Castle that he was not young anymore and his health was failing him. With years of wounds that have badly healed and mental trauma, Castle wouldn't be able to sustain himself longer. The doctor brought up old memories but left when Castle threatened him. Castle made an attempt on Fisk's life, but the bulletproof glass saved him. But what he didn't know was Bullseye was behind him. Bullseye shot, but Castle saw the flash. He moved, but the bullet hit an artery in his neck. He ordered Fisk's men to kill him. Then he caught the elevator and went up Fisk Tower. However, on reaching the roof, he found that Castle had fled, killing all of Fisk's men. Bullseye smiled, as it was gonna be fun. Just to be frank, Bullseye got one of Castle's arms dealer and tortured him inside Fisk's basement. He just demanded only one piece of info from the dealer. What was Castle like? What kind of man was he? During the interrogation, Sergeant Dolohary briefed Fisk on Bullseye. His name was Shelton Pendergrass, but he only answered to Bullseye. His military record was redacted. The only information that was available was that Pendergrass was a military lawyer and never saw combat. However, in 2005, he suddenly started working as an assassin. He hit oil barons, sultans, priests, dictators, and never missed. In 2008, some kids witnessed a gangland slaying while being on a field trip. Bullseye burned the entire school. When there was a funeral held, Bullseye rigged all the coffins and bombed the entire community sky high. Dolohary was skeptical, but Fisk said he'd take responsibility for Bullseye. Castle met Dr. Bayer as he popped his stitch while killing a rapist. Bayer said that he was sorry about their last conversation. Castle told him that he couldn't remember what his wife, Mary, sounded like. Bayer lied to him, telling him that his wife was a very happy woman, content to have Castle at home. But deep inside, Bayer knew that Castle never came back from the war. That evening, Bullseye demanded that Delohary take him to all locations where Punisher has ever killed anyone. They reached Castle's safe house where he'd killed Mennonite. Bullseye immediately told Delohary to move all his belongings there. It was his safe house from then on. When Delohary left, he opened his dress and lay in Castle's mattress, whispering that he could hear Castle dream. Meanwhile, Castle flushed all the meds that Bayer had given him. He wanted to stay in his senses. Bullseye followed every bit of Castle's life that he could, starting from the way he dressed to the books he read, right to sleeping beside the Castle family grave. Then he tracked down Dr. Bayer and tortured him gruesomely to death. Watching the news of Bayer's death, Castle went out and found Delohary, who was having sex in an alley, and asked him everything about Fisk. Meanwhile, with the intent of feeling what Castle had felt when he lost his family, Bullseye tracked down a happy family exactly like Castle. He murdered the man of the house and then welcomed him inside. Target practice. While he made breakfast, Bullseye talked about the life of Frank Castle and how he became the Punisher after the shootout at the park. He was ready to take the family that had abducted to a walk in the park. Meanwhile, Fisk had breakfast alone as Vanessa was too drunk in her sorrow and passed out on alcohol. At his base, Castle cut off a finger of Delohary and pinned it to the wall. He demanded to know everything about Fisk and Bullseye. Meanwhile, Bullseye tied up the family and put them in the trunk of his car and drove out. At his tower, Fisk's men told him about the hiccups that many gangs were posing in the business. Fisk told his men to finish them off. Suddenly, Vanessa stormed in and started accusing Fisk for killing his son. One of Fisk's men tried to stop her. Fisk told him to never touch his wife and told him to get out. Then Fisk told Vanessa that he missed Richard too. And then Vanessa coerced him into making love to forget what had happened. Castle had already taken 3 fingers of Delohary and an ear. He demanded to know how to get to Fisk. When Castle planned on cutting his penis off, Delohary told him that Fisk changed bodyguards every day and he never left his tower. Castle left him alive as he didn't want to kill a cop. Meanwhile, at the park, Bullseye slept on the carpet with the abducted family and hired goons to come and shoot them dead. At his tower, Vanessa and Fisk made love while she reached for something under the pillow. At his base, Castle heard that the corrupted police under Fisk's payroll had written off Bayer's murder as suicide. While the hired gunman killed the entire family in the park, Vanessa took out a gun and shot Fisk, and Castle went back and put a bullet in Delohary's head. At the park, Bullseye said that he didn't feel anything, and they'd have to do the entire play act again. Fisk survived the shot to his shoulder and told Vanessa to aim for his head next. Vanessa told him that Fisk had won nothing and lost everything, while Castle walked out leaving Delohary's body behind. Meeting the hero, Fisk called up Bullseye. He wasn't happy. Bullseye had killed 4 families in a week in order to feel the same as Castle. Fisk ordered Bullseye to not indulge in more bloodshed. As Bullseye and his men entered the safe house, Castle attacked. He killed everyone. But Bullseye had done some of his own modifications in the safe house. He went to the men's room and locked himself up behind a bulletproof glass door. When Castle entered, he smiled and waved at him and asked him through a note about his favorite color. Castle blew up in the door, but Bullseye had escaped. Outside, Castle faced 2 cops. This was all because Castle had killed Delohary and threw his body at the police station. The cops called him a cop killer and advanced at him, but Castle shot them in the leg and left. After the attempt on his life, Fisk had Vanessa evacuate the premise of his tower. There, Bullseye escorted her out and told her to forget everything. He even gave her a peek to a side of him that actually felt and was in sorrow. But then he quickly locked his emotions down. Bullseye went up and met Fisk. He gave Fisk a map pointing to 37 safe houses of Castle. He told Fisk to send police so they can take out Castle's firepower. As the police stormed his safe houses, Castle too turned desperate. He went to an illegal arms dealer and asked them for guns. When the dealer wouldn't sell, Castle shot him through the eye in his frustration. Meanwhile, Bullseye taped pictures of Castle's family in his safe house. He wanted to see what Castle did next. The one who knocks. The police held a press conference with the arsenal that was recovered from Castle's safe houses. 800 pounds of explosives, 872 automatic weapons, 20 tons of ammo, and $8 million in cash. It was enough to equip an army. They declared that the murderous reign of Castle was over. The police were coming for him. At the tower, Fisk knocked on the door and asked Bullseye to come out. It had been a week since Bullseye had locked himself up in a room and obsessed over the origin of the Punisher. He had 2 perspectives. Castle became Punisher in Vietnam, and Castle became Punisher when his family was killed. But he couldn't point at one, and that was making him go mad. Outside, Fisk couldn't handle Bullseye anymore and told his men to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Castle planned to attack the Fisk Tower. He booby-trapped a car and tricked the police into thinking there was an imminent terrorist attack. At the tower, Fisk's men broke through the door and attacked Bullseye. But he just kept talking to Castle in a trance. He wanted Castle to show him who he really was. However, while doing that, he incapacitated all of Fisk's men and killed them brutally. Bullseye deduced that Castle had turned to the Punisher in soul long before his family was killed. The death of his family just freed him. But Castle, being a soldier, he should have sensed the danger that their family was in. How could he miss it? This was the question which was bothering Bullseye. Meanwhile, Castle ditched his own car and left in another car toward the Fisk Tower. Fisk attacked Bullseye, but he was still talking to Castle in his mind. He just couldn't believe that Castle took his family to the park. He was never a family man of that sort. Below the tower, Castle tased a security guard and threw tear gas and entered. Up in the tower, Bullseye stopped Fisk and broke his fingers, when suddenly a revelation dawned upon him. He understood exactly who Castle was in soul, and he knew how to kill him. And while all that transpired, Castle entered the tower with a gun. Face off. Whatever mayhem that was about to unfold in the next few minutes, Bullseye prayed to God to make it last. Bullseye and Castle stood on either side of a wall, and then the fight started. Fisk called the police commissioner. On the other side, Bullseye attacked Castle with an axe and broke off his gas shield. Both of them went at each other with a full frenzy. Fisk went up and ordered his men to kill both Castle and Bullseye. Meanwhile, Bullseye and Castle also fought in the elevator and went up. Castle would have stabbed him, but suddenly Bullseye puked into Castle's mouth. Castle couldn't breathe. He somehow pushed Bullseye and got up. Just then, the elevator stopped at a floor that was under construction. Both of them looked at the tools splayed in front of them. Bullseye realized that there was indeed a god looking over him. Meanwhile, one of Fisk's henchmen came to the under construction floor, where he found a grisly scene. Bullseye sent him into a room to shoot and kill an unconscious Castle. But as the henchman entered, Castle brought a sledgehammer down on his face. Castle took his gun and kept shooting at Bullseye, but Bullseye kept telling Castle that he wanted to reveal how he was born. Castle kept following the blood trails, and he met the other two henchmen. He shot them without wasting time. He went to the top of the tower and met Fisk. Fisk told Castle to finish it, but before Castle pulled the trigger, Bullseye attacked. They fell on the glass ceiling of the penthouse. Castle pinned Bullseye with such strength that the glass cracked. Then Bullseye said that he knew what Castle told his wife that fateful day at the park before the shooting started. He whispered something into Castle's ears, and he froze. It was as if the world of bewilderment had crashed down on him. Right then, Fisk shot the glass, and both Bullseye and Frank fell down while the police approached them with guns. Act 17. Frank. The land of the living dead. Castle lay inside the jail infirmary at Rikers Island, all battered and broken. He knew that the word had already spread about him being brought here. He knew that all the criminals locked up would take the chance to put him down. Castle wanted to get up and finish them, but he was in no shape. Instead, he thought he'd accept death that night, given what Bullseye had told him. He lucidly dreamt of Da Nang in 1972. He'd just come back from Firebase Valley Forge. Next day, he had to return home. At the hospital, he met a crazy man in restraints. He said that Castle was scared to return to his family. He could never caress a baby with his hands. They were made for holding guns. Castle wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of living. Even if Castle went back, he'd be desperate for a war. Either he'd come back or commit suicide. That night in the jail infirmary, as Castle lay motionless, an African-American gang gathered outside. They were there to kill him, but they were too scared to go inside. They talked about earlier times when Castle had taken down entire gangs and they were scared shitless. Just then, a neo-Nazi skinhead gang came, but they were too scared and kept asking the other gang to enter first. Castle remembered the night in Da Nang just before his flight home. The crazy man somehow got out and killed the doctors. He woke Castle up and told him to come with him to whatever that was left of the war. The soldiers came in and shot down the crazy man, but Castle wondered, would he have said yes? The inmates kept shouting and threatening Castle from outside, but no one had the courage to enter. Castle lifted his hand, but then brought it down. He'd made up his mind to give up, to die. He remembered how his family was constantly afraid of him because of his PTSD. He decided it was the end. He shouted at the inmates and told them to come in. But the inmates were scared. They decided to come back when Castle wasn't ready, and they crawled back to their cells. Castle remembered the day when he came back and embraced his family. He realized that it wasn't death that scared him. For him, living was like hell. Dissolving parallels. As the police walked through 5 tiers to move him to his jail cell, all the criminals woke up to see him. They were all searching for a sign of weakness, and they got it. Just before entering his cell, Castle broke down. The inmates smiled. As Castle was moved inside jail cell 17, he remembered the day when his wife welcomed him home. Standing in front of his house, he had the same feeling of being caged and not belonging. Lying in the jail cell, he remembered the time with his family. He always phased out and couldn't communicate with his wife or children. Even when his daughter cried and said that he'd return to war, he couldn't pacify her. His mind was elsewhere when his wife made love to him. He kept looking at the photos of his wartime. His father's friend got him a job in a meatpacking company where he had to pack 1,000 cattle heads in a day. It was easy for him, as he was reminded of his war days. He found the owner's son bullying other workers, but he turned his head. He locked up his war box and tried to mingle with the living. In the jail, a criminal named Big Jesus wanted to get his hands on Castle in the solitary, so he went ahead and attacked a guard. Meanwhile, Castle reminisced on his earlier days, when he went straight and pretended to be a family man. One day at the slaughterhouse, his boss's son was trying to force himself upon a girl named Teresa. Teresa pushed the man and his hand went right into the shredder. Castle had the chance to switch the shredder off, but he didn't. In his mind, he loved the violence. As Big Jesus was brought into jail cell 18, Nick Fury came to meet him. Once upon a time, Big Jesus talked to Castle and kept threatening him, trying to weaken him in spirit. Then an old Nick Fury got into his cell and told Castle whatever he did till date amounted to nothing. Castle should have taken up the offer that Fury had given a long time back. As Fury left, Big Jesus kept shouting from the adjacent cell. Castle dreamt of the time when he lay beside his wife, but his mind was far away. His wife tried to talk to him, but he said he was tired. When she started crying, Castle tried to pacify her by telling her that he'd take her to the park. He promised never to leave again. Then one morning they found Teresa's body hanging from a meat hook. Castle knew that the boss's son had done it. He took a meat chopper and ambushed the boss's son from behind, but he remembered his new life and didn't do anything, just scared him and left. At the jail, all of Big Jesus' men armed themselves to the teeth. Big Jesus took out the blade that he'd hidden inside his fingernails and created a knife out of it. In the past, Frank had left the slaughterhouse and joined Fat Sal's bar, where he washed dishes. Sometimes a few crime bosses also visited the place. One evening, while Castle was taking the trash out, he saw 3 hitmen entering to finish off a crime boss. He broke the nose of one hitman and incapacitated the other 2 with a broken bottle. The mob boss was impressed and asked Castle to join them, but Castle denied. The boss paid him anyway and left. On his way out, Castle threw away the money, and Nick Fury was waiting there for him. Fury offered Castle to join him, as Castle was not a family man, and it wouldn't end well for him. In the prison, some guards went to take Big Jesus out, but he killed all of them. Finding their cue, the other gangs also made themselves ready, while Frank sat sadly and reminisced about the time when the mob boss he saved tried to coerce him at gunpoint into joining him. A family man, Fisk had a prison guard on his payroll set up to kill Castle. He completed his breakfast and set forth to complete his assignment. Meanwhile, the riot in the prison had escalated. Castle was in an entirely different world. He was thinking of past times when Don Margello had offered him to kill Francesco Drago. Castle denied and also broke the nose of one of his henchmen. He returned home with blood on him and went to the washroom. His wife, Maria, talked to him from outside. She wished that Castle would talk to him. However, Castle answered that everything was okay. He could hear Maria crying from outside. When Castle came outside, his son asked him if his mother was crying. Castle lied to him. His son further asked if he'd killed anyone. Castle said that there was a war going on. His son asked if he'd kill again. Castle said not if he could help it. He then called up Margello and told him that he'd killed Drago for him. Margello's man had given Castle a sniper rifle, but he pointed that toward Margello and was going to shoot him. He then controlled himself and Fury arrived at the scene. Fury told him that Castle was running away from who he actually was, but he did Castle and his family a favor. He had his men kill Margello's entire gang and then told Castle to go home. The next morning, Castle called up Fury and told him he'd work for him. Castle's wife asked him if he didn't come home the previous night. Castle cut her question and asked if she'd like to go for a family outing, like a park. Meanwhile, the policeman on Fisk's payroll threw something inside his cell. It was a hand grenade. Home is where the hurt is. In the past, Castle had gone to the park that fateful day with his family, like everything was okay, but he was quiet and drifted away the entire time. He gathered some courage in him and told his wife that he couldn't do it anymore. Maria could have the kids and Castle would file for a divorce if she wanted that, but he was leaving. Maria was disgusted and was about to say something to Castle, but the shootout had already started. Castle's entire family was shot and killed one by one, and Castle thought of the moments that he'd lost with his family. So, at Rikers, when the guard threw the grenade, a part of Castle wanted to die. It was enough for him. But then something inside him growled, "It will never be enough." The grenade detonated, but Castle covered himself with the mattress. He lived, but he was seriously hurt. He attacked the guard who was sent to kill him and crushed his windpipe. But Big Jesus and his men had already surrounded him. After the death of his family, Fury had come to meet Castle. Castle told him to leave, or else he'd shoot him. Fury left a note which had all the contacts of the people responsible for the shootout. Castle packed everything from his home and left. At Rikers, Castle started shooting Big Jesus' men, but Big Jesus stopped him, saying that they weren't there to kill him. Jesus was actually Big Lucky's brother, who was brutally killed by Fisk, and Castle was the only man who had ever laid hands on Fisk. He told Frank that he and his men will help him escape. In the past, Castle had already killed all the people who were responsible for his family's death. He also tracked the slaughterhouse boss's son and put his head into the shredder. That was when he realized that he was never going to stop. It was a stormy night, and Castle walked a lonely street, avoiding being seen by cop cars. Big Jesus had already helped him escape via a tunnel, smuggling him out. In return, Castle broke his neck and killed him, as Castle believed that dying was easy. Castle wandered for hours, and then ended up near his own house in his trance. He had finally come home. Act 18. Homeless. Starting from scratch. A few drug dealers were selling on the street, calling their drug the Punisher. One of them warned the seller not to do so, as Punisher had recently broken out of Rikers. The seller said that Punisher was old and dead. Right then, Castle approached them dressed in a hoodie. He asked them for a gun. When they disrespected him and told him to go away, Castle injured them severely. He took the seller's gun and while leaving, he shot and killed the seller. A store was selling faux Punisher t-shirts. He broke the glass and took one. While training in his dojo, Fisk talked to a facilitator from the criminal organization known as the Hand. Fisk asked him to have someone kill the Punisher, but the facilitator said that Frank Castle belonged to an endangered species and the organization didn't kill endangered ones, so he'd make sure that Fisk didn't get killed. So he introduced a bodyguard for Fisk, Elektra. Elektra proved herself by brutally finishing off 4 of Fisk's men without spilling even one drop of blood. Fisk hired her outright. Castle kept watch on Fisk Tower from afar. He had to build his arsenal, so he jumped one of Fisk's men, killed them, and took his gun. At night, Fisk had a chat with Elektra. Her presence was so grim that it made even Fisk sweat. The Hand facilitator talked to someone at the restaurant and assured her that Elektra was in place and she would ascertain Fisk's downfall. Meanwhile, Castle got hold of a trash cart and roamed the streets like a hobo. At the restaurant, it was revealed that the person who hired the Hand and got Elektra designated into Fisk's tower was none other than Vanessa, Fisk's ex-wife. That night, Castle broke into his old family home and lit a fire and had his dinner. Old age, new ways. Castle put a nurse at gunpoint and went to the hospital where Bullseye was kept. He was in a coma, but he was still smiling, as if he'd already done what he was supposed to do. Without further delay, Castle put a bullet in Bullseye's head and blew his brains out. Meanwhile, Fisk had started to feel like he was imprisoned in his tower. Elektra did her job in eliminating the human contact that Fisk had by sending his escorts out. At his home, Castle kept thinking about his old life with his wife. During the day, he slept, and at night, he went out and did what he did best, kill a lot of people. He'd learned that from the street thugs to the cops to the elite crime bosses, everyone was on Fisk's payroll. So he killed them without discrimination and kept adding to his arsenal. He had only one target in life, Fisk. Fisk called a meeting with all the remaining mob bosses and talked about the Punisher, but all of them surprised him by challenging him. They said that soon the city would forget about the Kingpin. Fisk called Elektra in. Both of them maniacally killed off all of the mob bosses. Then they had sex on the table, in a mad frenzy. Later, Elektra met Vanessa and told her all about Fisk. Elektra and Vanessa were secretly lovers, and Elektra had promised to protect Vanessa. She told Vanessa to let Castle do whatever he wanted to draw Fisk out. Meanwhile, Castle dug up Fisk's son Richard's body from the grave, pinning the king. Castle carried the coffin of Richard toward his base. On the way, he vomited from the stress and smell. Vanessa frantically called up Fisk and told what Castle did. Fisk was mad with anger. Vanessa told him that Richard had died in order to make him the Kingpin, and now it was his turn to be the Kingpin. Fisk left his tower, telling Elektra not to follow him. While going toward his base, Castle reflected on how his aura of fear had faded with his age. The thugs were not afraid of him anymore. They waited to pounce on him. He remembered how his body ached every time, how he almost got killed by an old soldier. He remembered that he was surrounded by a gang and their Rottweilers. However, he killed the dogs and used one of them to kill the other gang members. While thinking about all these, he waited. Elektra abducted a drug dealer who worked for Fisk. He said that he stole from Fisk because the Punisher stole Fisk's kid's body and Fisk couldn't do anything, which gave them courage to steal from Fisk. Elektra brought the man's family in and told Fisk to become the man he really was. Fisk told all of them to leave, but asked Elektra to let the man's little boy stay. At his base, Castle apologized to the body of Richard that he was born in this filthy world. At the tower, Fisk killed the man with his bare hands while his son watched. While at his base, Castle took Richard's body out and took it elsewhere. Fisk was suspicious of Elektra talking to someone over the phone, so he ditched everyone and left alone in plain clothes. Elektra was actually on call with Vanessa when Vanessa turned and saw the shadow of death looming over her. Elektra ran toward Vanessa to save her. Castle stood behind Vanessa, telling her that she was never a very good mother. Death at the doorstep. Castle remembered the time when he had first killed a man. The man was in a bush taking a dump and didn't even raise his gun. Later, he killed a lady convict who had drowned her 3 kids and didn't get the death penalty. He always did what was required to get the job done. At Vanessa's house, Castle put her at gunpoint and made her call Fisk. She said that Fisk wouldn't come for her. He only cared about himself. Right then, the lights went off. Elektra stabbed Castle from behind and then jabbed and broke his nose. Then she inserted a dagger into Castle's gut. At the graveyard, Fisk shouted for Castle, but no one came. He saw the missed calls from Vanessa. At Vanessa's house, Elektra kept beating Castle into a bloody pulp, but Castle bit the flesh off her hand. She inserted the dagger into Castle's arm. Castle spat blood into her eyes and punched her and broke her nose. Fisk walked on the streets, wondering where a man could go when he'd lost everything. He came by his old house. While he looked, he was instigated by a few thugs. He beat them both down. At Vanessa's house, Castle shot at Elektra, but she dodged the shots. Her shurikens caught Castle in the hands and forehead. Then she shot him in the chest. Castle fell down bleeding profusely. Elektra popped a smoke bomb. A series of memories flashed in front of Castle's eyes suddenly. The day when Mary gave birth. The day he had sex with a sex worker. The day when he had shot a gun for the first time with his dad. The day when he took his son fishing and denied teaching him how to shoot. Finally, the day when his family lay dead at the park. Elektra attacked from behind. He pulled her dagger out and was going to stab Castle, but Castle took a shot through his shoulder and hit Elektra's chest. Then he shot and blew Elektra's fingers off. As Elektra lay bleeding, Castle told her to call Fisk and call him there. Fisk received Elektra's call, but he deduced that it was Castle forcing her. He asked Castle to be put on the line, and then he said that Castle would never get him. Castle shot Elektra in the eye on his way out. Fisk told his men to fan out, standing in front of Castle's old house as Castle was coming home. Coming home. His past life kept flashing before Castle's eyes. He remembered standing in front of the Castle house with Mary and their kid and promising her to work more so that he could take care of them. While thinking, Castle walked slowly in front of his old house. Fisk stood there and welcomed him. Fisk's men started shooting. Castle caught bullets in the hands, shoulders, back, and his gut. He shot one thug in the eye, but a bullet grazed his good eye. He ran into the line of fire and kept taking bullets from another thug until he pushed him down and blew his brains out. Both of Castle's eyes were swollen and shut from wounds. His mind was elsewhere. Memories kept flashing. He remembered the day in Vietnam when he received the news of his mother's death and refused to return home. He remembered when Mary said she was pregnant. He remembered being operated on after the shootout at the park. Castle shot the last of Fisk's men in the head. Fisk, enraged, threw the dead man at Castle. In that window, Castle managed to shoot him in the stomach. Fisk pushed Castle's head through a cab window, but Castle took a handful of glass and shoved them inside Fisk's face, banged Fisk's head into the car, and kept punching him. Castle phased out again. The memory flashes were quicker. He remembered his dad's death. He remembered choosing his son's coffin. He remembered saying no to Fury's offer. Fisk punched Castle back and pushed up. He put Castle's head into a hydrant. All the while, memories of his wartime, his family, Barracuda, Bullseye kept flashing in front of his eyes. Fisk held Castle and screamed that he was better than him. Castle turned and kicked him. Then he choked Fisk and bit his tongue out. Fisk threw Castle on the back of his van with the tool. He picked up a rod and Castle picked a hammer, and they both went at each other. Later, Fisk appeared at his tower, a hammer stuck in his head. He'd lost the fight to Castle. The security denied him entry. Vanessa stood right at the window and smiled. Seeing this, Fisk broke down. Right then, Castle walked behind him and blew his face off. He put another in his head just to be sure. Castle said that it was Fisk's city, but it was his world. As Castle walked back to his home, he fell down and puked blood all the way. He remembered Maria bidding him goodbye for the war and telling him that they'd always be in the home waiting for him. As Castle thought about his fight for the next day, he fell down and bled to death right outside the door of his house. At 19, R.I.P. Nick Fury stood in front of Castle's dead body. The media and the commoners had already got the whiff that the Punisher was dead. The internet was going mad over it. When Fury asked the coroner about the cause of death, the coroner smiled back and replied that there were 8 pages of injuries. He wasn't sure. Fury reflected that it was the only way Frank Castle's story could come to an end. A young officer came in and gave Fury the details about Fisk and his men being found dead. He said that Fisk was a respected businessman. When another officer came and took him outside, warning him not to get into an altercation with Fury. Another officer looked at Castle and said that he was very old. Fury told him that Castle had become old. It pained him to wake up each morning with all the injuries, but he still managed to go out there and kill scumbags, while the other cops harassed immigrants and college students and called it police work. They went inside Castle's old house where one of the cops found Punisher's war journal. It was where Castle scribbled down his thoughts. Fury shouted at them to give it back, and then burned it. While going through the other rooms, Fury found a note written on a wall with blood. "I'm sorry." Fury apologized to Castle's soul, telling him that he wasn't there to stop the madness in time. He believed that no one should ever set foot in that house. It was Castle's darkest corner of the mind. So he burned Castle's home down with a flamethrower. Meanwhile, Vanessa received Fisk's ashes and flushed them down the toilet. Then she asked one of her men to take her home. Meanwhile, lying on her deathbed, Elektra pleaded with the facilitator to let her talk to Vanessa, but he denied. He told her to move her legs, but she couldn't. Then he had one of the other ninjas finish off Elektra. At night, Fury and 2 police officers buried Castle's body. Fury just said that Frank was a hell of a soldier. Then he dismissed the news channels by telling them to go to hell. As he walked the streets, Fury talked to Castle in his mind. He said that Castle didn't change anything in all these years. Whatever he decimated would be back in no time. Then he had his team cut the power to the Upper West Side. He went right up the Fisk Tower and killed Vanessa. Later, while Fury sat in a bar and drank, he heard on the news about a riot in Queens. Some people put a building of a community gang on fire and were killing the gang members with bats when they tried to escape. In other news, a dozen assailants shot and killed Ponzi mastermind Lincoln Bernard. There were vigilante uprisings all through the city, with the mark of the Punisher on them. Fury smiled and said Castle had got his eulogy after all. As all these happened, Castle rested in peace with his family in the same grave where they were buried. Act 20. The What If End. What if Frank Castle hadn't died like he did? What if he lived long enough to see the Earth fall before him? And then he kept doing what he did best. This upcoming story makes us really wonder, what if? In the wake of a global apocalypse, the third and final World War had scarred the Earth. The conflict had spread from Iraq to North Korea, Pakistan, and eventually China. Humanity had been all but erased by the detonation of numerous hydrogen bombs. Yet, in the rubble of New York City, one man remained, Frank Castle, the Punisher. Emerging from the city's ashes, Castle, now in his mid to late 70s, found not even a rat or a bug had survived. For 4 decades, he'd waged war on crime until he was finally captured and imprisoned in the maximum security facility of Sing Sing. But even behind bars, Castle's fight continued as he slaughtered dozens of inmates. His lethal reputation led a judge to declare that sending Castle to Sing Sing was like feeding a tiger meat. A year after the war's end, Castle and fellow inmate Paris Peters crawled out from the prison's bomb shelter. The air was thick with nuclear radiation, destined to linger for 1,000 years. Together, they journeyed through the remnants of New York City. Castle's mission was clear. He sought the architects of the world's devastation, a shadowy cabal known as the Coven. This group, reminiscent of conspiracy theories about the New World Order, wielded immense power and wealth. Composed of generals, senators, oil magnates, and tech billionaires, the Coven controlled the world's fate, even holding sway over the president. Their influence had perpetuated wars and suffering for profit. With their money, they could have ended world hunger, but instead, they craved for more. One day, they did something that pushed the planet's luck too far, and a nuclear war happened. Castle eventually confronted the Coven. They attempted to persuade him that they could save what remained of the world. Together, they could save the human race. Castle, unconvinced and seeing through their lies, executed all of them. When Paris questioned why, Castle replied that the main problem was with the human race. They all have seen where the human race led to. Castle then turned on Paris, killing him upon discovering that Paris had been imprisoned for burning down houses, including a kindergarten with children inside. Exiting the Coven's bunker, Castle was on the brink of death from radiation poisoning. With little time left, he headed towards Central Park, where his wife and children had been murdered by mobsters in 1976. As fire consumed him, he kept walking, always an unstoppable force, burning and taking the world with him. Marvelous verdict? Well, that's all for today, folks. This was how the Punisher was born, lived, breathed, died, and left a legacy in the pages of the PunisherMAX series. Let all these stories serve as a personal warning for all the criminals out there. If anyone wishes to commit a crime, just know this: somewhere in the shadows, the Punisher has a bullet with your name written on it. Enough with the scaring. Our channel will be back with more complete laws. Please let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Keep sharing, liking, and subscribing.